And at the beginning of it all, one morning at the military camp, our buddy is woken up, and then a friend next to him asks if there is something in his boot, noticing that it is a cockroach, and he asks everyone to shut up. And he says that his name is Cry, and after causing a lot of confusion, he was demoted from squad leader of those idiots, and everyone is living peacefully until a war breaks out, and he orders everyone to attack. And he says that he does not have any special powers or anything like that. And while the war breaks out in full, he says that he managed to get there with tireless training and continues fighting on the front with his sword and shield. And so he kills people along the way and takes a lot of beatings too, but he makes it very clear that this is his end, while a man almost punches him in the face. But in that moment, a soldier from his team manages to cut off that man's head, but he is still without his sword, which he dropped while thinking. He has no talent, and he knows that his dream is out of reach, and so he grabs his sword again and starts running, until an arrow hits the guy who defended him, and he gets more and more scared, as he thinks that he expected that even if everyone laughed at him and said that his dream would never come true, he thought that as long as he held a sword he would become a knight. But while he is more lost than a blind man in a shootout and all that confusion, he ends up getting sword stabbed right in the middle of his chest, and with that he realizes that that was a very innocent dream, as he dies on the battlefield. And so as he bleeds and falls to his knees, he feels his life is over and thinks that he didn't even know that his death would be so pathetic. But then a blue flame appears before his eyes, and he wakes up in a totally different place in a pool of water that seems to be suspended in the middle of that ocean of stars. And in that he hears metal knocks and wakes up once again. Then he wonders if that was a dream, but the man next to him is once again scared by that cockroach. So he wonders if that is deja vu and goes back to that same battle once again, and the result ends up being the same, with him being killed for the second, third, fourth, and so on and so forth. And every time he wakes up scared, with the feeling of the enemy's sword piercing his throat, with him feeling that burning pain, the blood, the vomit, and all that euphoria, the battlefield. And he says that this day kept repeating itself over and over again, and he always died to the same enemy. I dropped Subaru's work so I could watch a Manhwa about Subaru. Just kidding. So while that knight comes at him with that perfect thrust, he gets totally scared, saying that the tip of the blade he saw for the 17th time killed him again, and he dies in agony once again. And he says that if he had handled the sword with a little more effort, he wouldn't be dying like that. And so that knight just takes the sword out of the protagonist's neck and goes on his way, while he thinks that if he had tried a little harder, things would be different and he wouldn't be in that bloodbath there, and he wonders if maybe he wouldn't have died in that place, and returns once again to that place where his soul goes every time he dies. Then that light appears again, and someone questions if the protagonist really thinks that. Then he wakes up, standing up, and that boatman who should be the chariot appears behind the protagonist, telling him to fight, and tells him to feel properly and give up, feeling despair in the face of a line he can't cross. But then instead of getting more sulky, he feels more and more hatred, and wakes up again that same day, and he's not even surprised anymore. So when he gets up, he talks to Ren this time, saying that there's a bug in his boot. So when he notices, he picks up the cockroach and ends up stepping on it and wonders who put it there, asking what kind of nonsense this is. But Cendric tells him to shut up because he's seen it crawling earlier. So he thinks that this is the 18th time he's come across the corpse of that damn bug, and wonders if he sees it a few more times, he'll be able to finish the day. And he says that since he was young, he's wielded a sword, and since he was little, he's trained, and says that he learned fencing from a retired mercenary who coincidentally came to his village. So the guy tells him that he's amazing, saying that if he's already this good, in the future he might even become a knight. And so with these words, he started to dream, and as time went by, thought about being a knight, one of those who can kill 1,000 people alone and change the dynamics of a battlefield. So he thinks of this invincible hero in his mind, imagining becoming the knight who could end a war, already dreaming of being called the Knight of the End, and he thought he was the protagonist of the song that a wandering troubadour sang. And so he decided to leave, leaving the village and becoming a knight. But when he faced reality, already in a tavern, people started to laugh at him, the newbie, who fell pathetically. They laugh at him for being a coward who was afraid of a simple stray dog, and they wonder if this person dreams of becoming a knight, and they say that he is not even good enough to be a wandering mercenary, and in that the boy, all bruised, feels the pressure of reality, and says that he who left the village and joined a group of mercenaries learned that his talent might not be anything special, but it was too early for him to give up after one failure, and he begins to convince himself that hard work will never attract him. Rockley knows, and he thinks to himself that if he doesn't, he had talent. He believed that with time and effort, things could change on the battlefield, and he gradually improved, while convincing himself that he could overcome everything with that alone. And he killed beasts along the way, gaining experience, and he says that he gained strength and endurance to be recognized by those around him, and he thought more and more that he was becoming strong, thinking that he could become a knight. But this strong hope began to crumble one day when he was fighting a battle, at the exact moment that he lost his sword and was knocked out by someone much younger. And he says that this hope began to crumble, and there was a child in the village where he was who asked for a duel, and so the child simply looked at him with a tedious look, saying that that old man is weak. And so he says that he was 12 years old, had only started learning fencing 6 months ago, and the imbecile who spent more than a decade wielding a sword to the point of having his palms destroyed, it was infinitely more pathetic than the 6 months of a genius. And with that, he began to feel as if all his effort had been in vain, questioning himself if there really was no way for him to make it a reality. And so as time went by, he kept thinking that he wanted to become a knight, and even with everyone belittling him and saying that his dream was impossible, he thought that by spending much less time eating and sleeping than others, swinging and swinging his sword, one day he would be able to get where no one has. But while he trains, he looks at that tree that was his companion, opinion. Then he thinks that even if he can't become a knight, he can at least be an experienced soldier. And so he continued training full of hatred, almost becoming guts. And 3 years later, in the present, in the divine Cipros, for companies, for platoons, and below that, for squadrons. And he became the commander of a squadron called Second Category. And he says that this was the best position he could have. He managed to achieve it after his tireless training, but still being a regular soldier of the kingdom is better than being a wandering mercenary. So he talks to Jackson, who was behind him, and the boy questions what happened, and he tells him to do the morning rotation that day. And Jackson looks at him with a lot of disdain in his eyes, telling him to pay him later. And so Ren calls the boy an evil bastard, saying that he looks like a wildcat, especially with the way he looks at him. So Sandrick talks to Ren, asking if he will also try to push something, but in this he talks about the heart of the beast, saying that he wants to try to learn it again. And then Ren questions if he did not give up trying to learn it last time, asking if he thinks he will be able to do it now. But in this they go to training, while Prota thinks that the hand-to-hand battle between Nalo and Aspen that started again is this battle in which he died made him come back to life and start reliving the same day over and over. And in the middle of the training he thinks that although he learns the heart of the beast from Ren every time he comes back to life, he still can't see the tip of the sword that stabs him every time, and he thinks that on that day he will definitely succeed. And so he goes with his squad to the middle of that battlefield, and that is already his 21st time on that battlefield. And while he gives his all in this return, he thinks that he has completely memorized that repetitive situation, and stretching his neck as if he were Luffy, he manages to evade several of the attacks that he already knows will happen. And he says that he dodged the spear that comes from behind him, and the next attack is from a guy who is behind him, and in that he continues to evade everyone. And he also remembers a member of another squad, saying that he will die soon, but then he takes action to protect that man, saying that he died last time, but in that death continues to chase him, and another soldier tries to kill him from behind. But the protagonist takes another action, killing this man too, who was threatening his ally. And he thinks it worked, because even though he blocked the first arrow, he died immediately. He completed his first objective of that day, and he thinks that the rest now is to kill that man that he always kills. So while that guy finishes off another ally of his, he looks at the protagonist, who thinks that he always ends up facing that guy without fail, and he walks towards Sendrick. Then he says that that man pierced his neck and killed him 20 times, but this time he will be able to survive. So while the guy goes after him, he remembers Heinel warning him about something, saying that he always closes his eyes in a dangerous situation. And so he grabs the axe that he is throwing up and aims at Prota's neck with the intention of killing, and it really doesn't work out. That idiot closes his eyes once again, but Heinel tells him to look, saying that if he does that on the battlefield he will die immediately, and tells him that he needs to be brave and not let himself be agitated or intimidated easily. And he tells him to become a bastard who knows nothing about death, like a beast. And he looks at Sendrick with a totally psychopathic look, the same as that man who kills him every time, his eyes tense. But this time the protagonist keeps his eyes on the tip of his sword, and he thinks that a beast does not know death, and begins to wonder if he is afraid of it. And he thinks not, because death makes him stronger. And this time he manages to pull his neck towards that sword, running away from it and not letting himself be killed. And so in that adrenaline his heart beats faster and faster, and he thinks that for the first time, in that 20th attempt, he managed to dodge his blow for the first time. But then when he turns in the euphoria to try to hit his opponent, that opponent has already turned around, changes his grip, and throws his sword at the protagonist's neck. So in that 21st attempt in which he managed to dodge the first attack, he was unable to dodge the second. So he returns to Karen once again, who he says that in that endless day he was trapped, feeling pain and desperate, telling the protagonist to give up and enter the boat, telling him to recognize his weakness and be at peace. But even with him prostrate, he refuses to do so, waking up once more that day, thinking that on his 22nd day he will defy death again. Man, but then the guy he's facing is also a big shot. The guy missed, changed his grip, and a second time he came back, hit the protagonist's throat, and took the sword away before he fell to the ground. So back to the war. On the 33rd time, he thinks he can clearly see that man's sword, and he says he's going to dodge it before his sword reaches it. But on the return attack, he ends up being killed once again, and he barely manages to dodge it and gets grazed on the side of his neck, and once again he dies. And as he falls, that pendant on his neck falls to the ground. Then he remembers that in his days as a mercenary, he accepted some requests to subdue monsters, and it wasn't like he was obligated to do it. He simply found a random village where they asked him for help, and the reason he decided to help them was because his dream was to become a knight, and protecting the weak is a knight's duty. And so the village leader tells him that his village is poor, so that's all he has to do. They can give it to him, and when he looks at his reward, he notices that it is an amulet, and he says that it was a ridiculous reward for the price of risking his life. But at that moment, the gentleman told him that that amulet considers him what he desperately desires. So he wonders if it could be because of that, wondering if that amulet is making that day repeat itself, just so he can become a knight. But this time, while the protagonist agonizes in pain on the ground, that knight approaches him, saying that he must be in pain, saying that there goes a little of his mercy, about to plunge the sword into the protagonist's back, and he thinks that mercy is shit, looking into the eyes of that bloodthirsty killer, smiling as he kills him, saying that he is just a pervert who gets pleasure from piercing people. So once again he wakes up that same day, talking to Ren this time that he put a bug in that boot. So he wonders what the hell is this, saying that he is doing tricks right at the beginning of the day, asking if he has finally gone crazy. So Sendrick tells him to stop grumbling and come to him, telling him to teach him the heart of the beast. And so he goes back to training once more, and this time he manages to keep his eyes open, escaping Rena's attack. So he asks what he's been doing, questioning how the skin on his heart got thicker so suddenly. And so Sendrick says that he trained, but he says that this isn't something that can happen so quickly, but then he thinks that this has happened more than 10 times, and he says that it's not with a secret technique from his family being taught to someone else. But Cendric says that it really is like he said, it's a feeling that he learned from death, but he disguises it by asking what's so important about it, saying that maybe it got there by chance, trying to disguise, and this time he calls Ren to have a sword fight. He finds it strange, but thinks it's great, and even though he learned the heart of the beast, he thinks that he'll be killed if he can't land a thrust, and he tries to fight Ren this time more accelerated, dodging his axe and dodging with everything. Then Ren questions how long he will dodge, trying to hit Proto with all his momentum, and Cendric thinks that the only sword technique he is now is the sword technique of the mercenary Valen, which is an anomalous technique made by a mercenary known as Valen, and some people speak ill of it, and others call it a petty trick. So Ren goes all out on him, saying that Cendric's lower body strength is quite weak, but Proto thinks that even so, among the ones he has, this is certainly the most decent technique. So as he gets into battle stance, Ren feels something, and Proto remembers that stab he has experienced dozens of times, attacking Ren this time, and by a hair's breadth he manages to take the sword out of the protagonist's hand and throw it far away. Then he notices that for a moment he imitated that perverse stab, and he thinks that he has already died from his stab more than 10 times, and his body remembers. And Ren he starts saying that this should have had some blood, saying that among what he showed him so far, that thrust was the most decent, showing him how it should be done, saying that it should be with some impact, and says that his hand should have bled. And he starts to notice that Cendric doubts himself a lot, and says that this attack cannot fail, but Cendric questions that if it is blocked, what should he do next? And Ren says that he should say that he cannot dodge it, and say that his opponent is dead now, and that will make him not lose his grip on his sword. Then he starts to look at his hand, thinking that even if he explained it badly, he understood what he meant, and the difference between his thrust and that guy's thrust is that he has no confidence in his sword, and once again on that battlefield, the man who always kills him gives him his mercy again, which is certainly the last thing on his mind, and he says that he should thrust with the intention of killing, and he goes on training death after death with Ren, dying at that guy's hands, taking one step at a time, but then he thinks he won't, saying he'll move forward even if it's just a quarter of a step, and he keeps dying over and over, and so on the 111th day, once again he's about to die, and on day 123 he keeps dying, and finally on day 124 he attacks Ren with the most hatred possible, and manages to throw his axe away, but at that Ren finds him strange, asking if he's crazy, besides the fact that his hands are finished and gushing blood, and he questions why he's always laughing like a madman, and this time he finally managed to see the madness of a berserker, noticing that he's mastered that perverted bastard's thrust. My friend, this is getting good. It's okay that he's playing with death. He's dying as if there were a morning every time. I want to see this shit, but it's getting good, and now I want to see him face that guy. And now on the battlefield, he thinks he has to go a little faster, with pure murderous intent, going after that man. Then he finally manages to hit him, but the attack hits his helmet, while the man manages to hit him in the throat, and he reports that his first attempt to stab was a failure, and he thinks he won't blink and won't let go of his sword. He says that everything that happened from each time their swords clashed to the stab now, he says that it's all in his head, while that guy steps on his chest, saying that it looks like he's suffering, saying that he'll give him mercy by killing him, but before he dies, Cendric looks straight into that pervert's eye, saying that tomorrow he'll die, but then that guy smiles sadistically, telling Proto that the dead have no tomorrow, and with that the amulet starts working again. Proto wakes up that same day, and this time takes the cockroach out of Ren's shoe, killing it himself, and says that he saw it coming in a while ago, and so Ren just does it, thanks him, and he says that if Ren is grateful, that he should take on his guard duty. Then he asks why he is giving him orders so casually, and he says that this is the mark of the 125th day. Then he calls Zoyota, a boy from his company, and asks him to get him some armor for his shin, a shield and a dagger, saying that he will pay him for them later, and he thinks about this later, telling Cendric that he will do this because he is the boss. Normally he does not do favors for anyone, asking if he knows about this. Then Ren questions if the squad commander has ever been so insistent with his orders, and Jackson starts to say that they always push their tasks onto him, calling them lazy. Then Ren questions what he said, asking if he wants to taste his axe, and everyone there starts to find it strange, while Ren thinks that this guy is really acting strange, saying that he is not usually so intense. My friend, after the third death, Yadahini is like a joker, like a crazy person. Only God do you know what goes on in the clown's mind. And so while the protagonist trains with his friend the tree, he thinks that he feels an incredible amount of pain every time he dies, and the possibility of never winning, even after thousands and tens of thousands of times, crosses his mind, because that guy scares him a lot, and he wonders if it would be possible to find a way to escape and survive, wondering if he would sleep and wake up tomorrow, or if he would wake up that day, and he accepts that he is stronger now than before, wondering if everything is okay and being satisfied with that, but he thinks no, saying that this is not an option for him, thinking that he has to overcome that wall and learn to stock up. So he keeps attacking the tree with everything, and he thinks that he will not abandon this blessing. So he finally splits the tree in half and prepares to go into battle, thinking that he has to keep advancing, and already on the battlefield, while all the troops organize themselves, he takes the lead, and so when the battle explodes, he thinks that he, a person without skills, managed to survive this battle because of three things, thinking that the first is preparation, the second is luck, the third is a slow head, and on his day 46, his left shoulder was shattered by a spiked mass, and on day 47 he rolled to dodge the mass, but someone crushed his head, and he added a spin to cut it first. Then on day 71 the soldier below cut his foot, so he couldn't do anything against the pervert of the stab, but this time he has a hard armor right on his shin, and with that he manages to defend himself and kill that man. Then he thinks that on day 89 his head was cracked by someone who threw his axe, so he thinks that if he lets lets him live. He stops his fight with the pervert of the stab, so letting him live is not an option, and he trained to throw weapons throughout his countless training, so it's not difficult, and so he manages to kill that man. And after all this, one of his allies starts screaming behind him. He thinks that guy always ends there, so he almost gets hit by an arrow, but the protagonist manages to defend his friend, thinking that a sniper called Hawklaw is coming, but he doesn't have time to kill him because someone else focuses on his ally again. But the protagonist manages to cut his head off easily, so he thinks that now it's time for him to face the wall. So the pervert starts going towards the protagonist, aiming at him with the usual murderous look, but this time they to look at each other with a psychopathic look, because the protagonist is no longer the same. They stand face to face, and when the man tries to attack him, the protagonist manages to defend with his shield, so he thinks that dodging and stabbing alone doesn't give him any chance of winning, and he thinks that this serves him better, so he goes all out against the soldier, thinking that he is just an ordinary, but strong, almost at the level of a prodigy. And the enemy notices that the protagonist seemed to be attacking him, but in fact he was blocking him, and he is surprised by this. In turn, he thinks that he lacks experience, real combat, so he is easily surprised, and headbutts his enemy, and says that Valam's mercenary sword technique with its many variations is effective against him. Then he sticks the tip of his foot into the ground and throws sand in his enemy's eye, raising his sword and almost hitting him, but then his enemy acts quickly, looking with only 2 eyes, still full of sand, and tries to stab the protagonist, but he manages to dodge by putting his head to the side, and he goes straight through. But the soldier quickly turns around trying to strike again, but the protagonist now already knows this, while he tries to strike again, in which he thinks he already knows everything there is to know about that blow, and stabs his sword into the tip of the pervert's sword, breaking it completely. But in that, an archer from afar shoots his arrow in the direction of the two. While that guy loses his arrow, the protagonist prepares to hit him, thinking he won. But then the arrow that was going in their direction ends up finding a hammer in the middle of the path, which breaks it in half, making it unable to reach the protagonist, and he finally kills the pervert. Meanwhile, Ren says he's going to kill that bastard with the hawk's claw, but in that, Jackson says it's too late, telling him not to waste his energy. So the protagonist finally kills his nemesis with a stab. While he's on the ground bleeding, the protagonist stops in the middle of the battlefield, totally satisfied with that result. While he's kneeling, he moves his sword, looking into the eyes of the man he killed hundreds of times, saying that that's mercy, and finally rips off his head, and he smiles while doing it, thinking he's finally broken the wall. But then he forgets he's in the middle of a war being kicked away. He falls to the ground feeling pain, huge screaming, and so everyone notices that something is happening, and they notice that that is Frog, and apparently that thing there is not human. And in that, while the protagonist is on the ground groaning in pain, Frog says that he invested a lot in creating that, saying that he cannot believe that someone like him defeated him. And when he looks at that thing gushing blood from where his head should be, the protagonist begins to pant, and Frog prepares to kill him, lowering his axe towards him. But then Ren steps in front defending the protagonist, but while he lowers Frog's axe, he tries to hit him, but Frog also stops his attack, and Ren goes all out in a totally insane fight against Frog. Meanwhile, while the protagonist is panting on the ground, he almost dies to another soldier, but then Jackson arrives there and rips his head off, and Frog and Ren continue fighting that battle face to face, and Ren thinks that if he wants to decapitate his squad commander, he needs his permission first. But Frog questions if that weakling there is their commander, asking if it isn't Ren, but Ren doesn't even answer him and thinks about the Frog warrior race, born to fight, saying that he'll have to burn that damn Frog with magic or pierce his heart with a single blow, thinking that this is a huge nuisance. And Frog in turn wonders why someone like him is on a trivial battlefield like that, and thinks that to kill him he'll have to risk his life, since Ren is apparently absurdly strong. So Frog starts walking sideways, thinking that this battle isn't worth it, and prepares to turn his back and leave, and he actually does so, turning his back on his enemy, and Ren thinks that he's a huge coward. Frog guy looks a lot like an evolved gray ninja with dreadlocks. Yeah, it's pretty weird, but he's a gray ninja. And then Jackson starts running across the entire battlefield while carrying the protagonist on his back, so Ren defends him by ripping off the heads of everyone who tries to attack him, and the other member of the protagonist's platoon also helps, clearing the way while everyone tries to stop him as he returns to camp. But then they form a front defending both Jackson and the protagonist, and so they retreat, and the protagonist is calmer because that day is finally over, and so a drop falls into that ocean where he always returns after death, and he apparently goes back there once more, and Karen tells him that he managed to survive for a day, but says that's all because he won't be able to handle the walls that will keep appearing in his path, saying that his destiny is to despair and give up. But then the protagonist thinks about this destiny, getting up and looking at the ghost of the one he decapitated when he broke the wall. Then he talks to Karen, saying that for him the walls exist so that they can be overcome, and Karen says he's looking forward to the moment when those eyes full of greed and ambition will completely lose their shine. And so he wakes up in the camp all bandaged up, noticing that that place is the infirmary, and Ren talks to him, saying that he had no problem sleeping for 2 days in a row. Then he says that he saved him from that damn frog, asking if the protagonist remembers, and he thinks about this frog remembering the pain he's feeling, and he notices that in the end it was a frog, saying that it's incredible that he survived. And Ren says that his bones they were broken, however they said that his head was badly affected, asking if he remembers him, his best friend forever, and he says that he never said they were friends, calling him a noble hunter. But Ren tells him to shut up because there are other people there. He questions himself just because it is the secret of someone he has nothing to do with, and means that he can simply reveal it. But then the protagonist says that he is someone he has nothing to do with, or his best friend, telling him to choose one. And so a new day besides today begins because he survived, and the dreamer orders his commander to pay 3 times more, asking if he knows knows how much it costs for him to get in there. And here he is crazy. Then the protagonist says that he was wondering why a regular soldier like him who would be left to fend for himself managed to get into the infirmary. But then he remembers that the boy was nowhere to be found during the battle, as always, so he has nothing to say, saying that he will give a special discount to the protagonist, saying that he will only pay twice more. And in the afternoon, Jackson goes to the protagonist, and he asks what happened, because if he has something to say, he should say it right away. And so he throws something at the protagonist and simply turns around, telling him to use it tomorrow and night, using it twice a day, and not to ask where he got it from. And he thinks that this is the ointment that Jackson used to use, and wonders if he didn't hate sharing personal items. Meanwhile, Aldine also goes there and uses it for the protagonist, and he tells him to just go away because he's not dead. And so he questions what their agreement is in taking shifts, even more so after all this time when they were busy doing what they wanted, asking if they were worried about him, or could it be that they were waiting for him to sleep. But at that moment, Ragnar enters the infirmary, finding it strange, asking why the commander is there. But then he simply turns around and leaves, and thinks that there's no way Ragnar could be worried, saying that that scoundrel doesn't care at all. He thinks that besides him, there are two soldiers in the infirmary, and one is the platoon commander of another company who used to fight with, and the other is a soldier whose name he doesn't know, who just spends his time staring into space. And he notices that he looks like a low-ranking soldier, wondering how he got there. But while he is sweeping everyone in the room, someone arrives, and he finds it strange, noticing that that person is not a normal human. And apparently, that woman is a noble elf with a lot of status in that army. So she asks who is the commander of the 444th Squad, and the protagonist is in eternal doubt while he sees that woman ask that question. And in that commander, who doesn't like the protagonist, asks if she is a fairy, and she asks which group he belongs to, and he says he is Vengeance, the commander of the 3rd platoon of the 2nd company. And in that she asks if his company teaches you to say your race when you meet your superior. So he apologizes, and the protagonist realizes that she is the superior, noticing that she is the new commander of the 4th company. And Ingrid introduces herself to him, claiming to be the commander of the 4th squad of the 4th company and 4th platoon. Then she says she heard he is leading his troubled squad members well, saying she looks forward to his contributions. Then he wonders if she came there just to say that, but then she stops and asks what the name of the last one there is. And the kid makes a totally random mistake and says it is Krang. But then the protagonist wonders if he just made that up, because his attitude in front of the company commander is also pretty bad, asking if he is a noble. And the girl just looks at him and leaves, and the protagonist doesn't quite understand this. And at night he notices that he is getting better, and says that most of the pain is gone and now he can put strength in his body, thinking he should start training. And Vengeance asks where he is going, and he says he is going to the training area, but he says that guy is an idiot because he is acting all tough when he is a lower ranking soldier. And Krang just watches him leaving, and so he raises his sword again, thinking that he needs to remember the past battle. And he says that it is one of the new useful methods that he spent a lot of money to learn when he was young. And he also thinks about the thrust he made at the last moment, wondering what would have happened if that last desperate attack had failed. And he begins to realize that it is not a good idea to put all his eggs in one basket, and if that attack fails, he will surely die. And he thinks that if the king's axe attacks are all lethal, then after thrusting with all his strength, he would have to make a next move. But at that, someone comes saying that he is working on pain, and he gets a fright. And Krang appears sitting next to him, saying that he does not know what he is doing, but his hands kept twitching in the tents. And now he is there looking at nothing, and he thinks that he was doing this to train his grip strength. So he says that he is replicating the battle. But at that, Krang asks why he is doing that, and he says that it is so as not to screw himself up. But he questions what if he doesn't get screwed, questioning if he wants to become something while preserving his life. And the protagonist understands that boy very well and thinks that what he wants to become is his dream. But when he says it out loud, people laugh at him. So he looks up and says that a dream he has already achieved with his humble talent, but a dream that he never stopped wanting to achieve. And so he raises his sword, thinking that he wants to become a knight, and Krang is surprised by this. Then he thinks that it is the first time he has seen something like this, someone who did not laugh at him. And Krang thinks to himself that he forgot to laugh, saying that he suddenly remembered something and understood what he needed to do after observing. So he simply gets up and leaves, while the protagonist thinks that this is news to him. And Krang turns around saying that if he becomes a knight, he must remember your name, calling you friend. And he thinks it's the first time that he is supported, and so everyone is singing there on his equipment, thinking he was the hero of the battlefield, and they say it is Cypros. And already in the infirmary tent, the protagonist, he can't stand being around that guy complaining all the time anymore. And he thinks that after waking up because of the wandering wanderer and waiting for the late breakfast, he took a short, leisurely walk instead of going to the training area, and he passes by Jackson asking how his injuries are, and he says that the medicine had worked well, thanking it. But then he says that if he is grateful, he should hurry up and come back soon. And in the infirmary at night, Krang says good night to Anchorage. He also wishes good night to his friend. He thinks that sleeping early is all he do. Meanwhile, that guy who is not happy with life tells them to shut up mouths, saying that they are talking shit. And so the protagonist thinks that that was a day without doing anything. But then in the morning, he is woken up by that wanderer, and he notices that the wanderer came again, wondering why he came back if he is a wanderer. But so that annoying commander starts complaining again that the food is late. So the protagonist thinks he is so loud and is saying the same thing as last day. But then he realizes that something is wrong. So he gets up and goes for a walk again, and Jackson talks to him asking again how his injuries are. Then he says that the medicine worked, doing the same script as the previous day. Then he thinks there is something very wrong going on, and he is sure saying that this is the same day as yesterday. And so Karen says that another wall wall will stop him, and he must try survive. And so he realizes that while he was sleeping he died without realizing. He realizes who died in a more desperate way than when he was stabbed. Although he feels a piece of trash, it makes you more determined, thinking that this is another challenge. And so at bedtime he wonders how and who he killed, because the enemy needs to go through all the defenses to get there, and that is possible for knights. But he thinks this is unlikely. Then it must be a hidden killer, and it is highly likely that the killer is among them. And he thinks he knows the location of the 10 doctors and hides in his presence someone skilled in murder. And he remembers of that woman who looked directly at him and is frightened by it, because the feet of fairies, silent and agile ways, are perfect for assassination. And the reason why she saw that day was to find out the location beforehand. And he starts to imagine everything, what she might be doing, and he thinks he needs to come and confirm it. And just there is an entrance to the medical tent, and he can end it by screaming and waking up the other soldiers the moment they see her, and he just needs to wait for the assassin. But then he dies without even knowing where he came from, because of a needle stuck right in his neck. He notices that it is a poisonous needle, and he didn't even see the killer enter. Then he begins to agonize, falling to the ground, thinking he can't move, his body doesn't even speak, and it's a potent paralyzing poison. So he realizes that's why he died without knowing the reason. And note that the others, the commander of the Vengeance platoon and Krang, are also dying. And he realizes that that bastard is the killer, and in that he kills Krang, sticking a sword in the boy's chest, and he dies without having a chance. And so the protagonist becomes totally possessed with hatred, and a sword cuts through that tent, and he notices that there is another killer, but this time the person who enters is that same woman that appeared in the morning. And so the next morning, this is the third time he is living that day, and he thinks he was alert, but he couldn't detect their presence, thinking that this won't be easy. And besides, that company commander, even if he manages to stop the assassin, he will still have to face that commander soon after. So he starts to feel imposing, and thinks that he felt the same way a few days ago too, when he was facing that knight. But he says that despite this, he was the winner, so he thinks that he will surely find a way as long as he doesn't give up. And so he goes to that annoying captain, lifting his blanket, and he questions what's wrong with the guy, asking if he is going crazy. And Ingrid says that she was wrong, assuming that the assassins would have already infiltrated the base by now. So he thinks that he should stay alert outside and takes his sword. But in this Vengeance still continues to think he is crazy, asking if the training that day is to catch cockroaches with a sword, saying that he thinks this is appropriate for low-level soldiers. But Ingrid doesn't comply with his cheap provocation, saying that she didn't know he behaved so much with it. But then he says he was being sarcastic and starts to curse him. So Ingrid thinks he was also being sarcastic, and the guy starts telling him to screw off, saying he doesn't even want to see his face anymore. And then Krang arrives, noticing that the two are arguing again, and asks if he should come back later. But then the protagonist says that it's okay, telling him to go inside. But then he continues to observe that guy, saying that considering how the assassins were so attentive to him, he's sure that that kid is their target, thinking that he's suspicious. But he wonders who exactly he is, but thinks that he won't investigate something that he's not willing to tell him without asking, like those crazy people. So he goes to his company, saying that thanks to him, he was involved in the assassination attempt, so he thinks there's no other way. Talking to Krang, saying who will ask, questioning who he is, and Krang doesn't quite understand the question, while protagonist wonders if he did something wrong, or maybe his communication skills are on the same level as Ren's. And Krang thinks a little about this question, saying that this is not something he can tell him. And protagonist asks why not, and Krang says that it is a long story, and so he just accepts it. But that guy back there starts to annoy him again, saying that if he is going to accept that kind of answer, he shouldn't even ask in the first place, saying that Krang, or Crab, or whatever his name is, he is definitely not from that country considering his damn ways. And he tells Krang to be honest, asking which country he is a spy for. Then Krang looks at him with a rather frightening look in his eye, and the annoying fear starts to get a little more awkward, and Krang walks up to him, being very close to Vengeance, saying that he did not betray and will not betray the kingdom. And so on, the protagonist thinks he can see those eyes of his in his movements, thinking that he is most certainly has the aura of a knight. And Vengeance asks if that's how he talks to his superior, but at that Krang quickly changes his manner, while the protagonist thinks that Krang is not a knight. After all, he was also powerless in the face of the assassin. However, he thinks that definitely that boy is hiding something, and so at night they wish each other good night again. And the protagonist wonders if Vengeance is afraid of Krang because of what happened before, saying that he is strangely calm. But then he observes the entrance of the tent, saying that if the assassins invaded there, they would all die. And so he gets up, and Vengeance asks what he is doing instead of sleeping, and he says that assassins will invade that tent soon, telling him to cooperate if he wants to live. But Vengeance does not take his words seriously, saying that he must have lost his mind. And Krang also seems to be very calm, and the protagonist says that he expected that reaction. But then he hears someone asking how he realized, and he ends up being killed with a sword blow from outside to inside the tent. So he wonders when this happened, since he didn't even have a chance to put his hand on the sword. And Vengeance also gets a big cut on the neck. And lastly, Krang is killed too, and as he falls, he tries to see what's going on, but wakes up the fourth time, saying that since there is no evidence that the assassins are coming, he won't be able to help Vengeance or Krang, and thinks he should inform his superiors to get reinforcements. But when he goes to his superior, he questions if he's gone crazy, tells him to get lost before he makes him shut up forever. So he thinks that maybe he can lie in wait and predict the moment when the assassins will appear, and scream well before they do. So he wonders if it's now or not, and he gets nervous waiting for their attack. But when the attack comes, it pierces his throat without being able to do absolutely anything to him, and he thinks that they are too fast, thinking that there is no way to get the weapon, help from others, and he needs to ambush them and defeat them before they can do anything. But he keeps dying every single time, and he wonders how he's going to fight an enemy enemy he can't see. And while he can't see them, they can see everything. And he keeps dying time after time. And he thinks that as long as he can't avoid their poison needle, he'll die without being able to do anything. And so another morning, he says it's the 20th of them, and he hasn't been able to do anything in any of them for the 20th time in a row. And he gets more and more desperate. But then a smile hangs over his mouth, saying he's only died 20 times. My friend, this crazy guy's brain has already turned to puree. Only 20 times. Imagine dying 20 times feeling pain. Because he says he wakes up with a lot of pain, and every time he doesn't even know what's happening. And he says he needs to think of a way to avoid the poison needle first, and he'll think of how to deal with them later. And he says that a way to avoid their attacks more faster than they can see, it would be with Jackson. And he goes there, then remembers a conversation he had with the king, asking why Jackson would be a wildcat. And the king doesn't quite understand, and Anchorage remembers that's what he calls him. So he says because he's a dirty, damn pervert, saying that he never tries to fight his enemies head on, saying that he likes to stab them in the back and run away, and asked if that doesn't remind him of a wildcat, cunning and perverted. But then, when he gets close to Jackson, he finds it strange and questions if his wounds are okay now. And Anchorage thinks to himself that he would easily defeat the assassin, but he can't just take him with him, since he doesn't have the authority to do so, and says that even if he could, this is a wall that he must overcome alone. And he thinks that all he needs to do is become Jackson. So he talks to the boy, giving a hypothetical situation, asking what he would have to do if someone tried to stab him in the back, questioning how he could stop him. So Jackson thinks for a bit, saying he's not sure, saying that no one has ever survived his ambush. But as he says that, the protagonist has a bad feeling and widens his eyes, and as he stares at Jackson, he also looks back at him until he lowers his head, saying that the person would need to have eyes in the back of their head. And the protagonist wonders about this, asking Jackson what that means, and tells him that it would be perfect time, asking if he saw that wagon. But Anchorage didn't even know there was a wagon there, and he says that it's behind the tents. And looking at it, he wonders how Jackson noticed something so far away, wondering if he really has eyes in the back of his head. And at that, Jackson says that this is going to go bad. Then the wagon ends up falling, and he was completely right. And the protagonist is shocked by this, asking if Jackson is a prophet. And he says that Anchorage must have spent too much time with that barbarian, so he tells him not to provoke him, asking how he knew. So he says it's about the sound, saying he heard a creaking in the wagon's axle. And he tells the protagonist that if he can hear what's happening around him, he can predict what's going to happen next. So he wonders if he heard something so silent, because for his part, he doesn't think he even heard the wagon getting closer. And Jackson says that basically he doesn't need to see to perceive what's around him, and he can keep trying to hear what's around him to practice and tune his senses, and thus isolate the sounds. And he says that that was a good explanation, and he even seemed too lazy to answer him before. But in that, Jackson says he's lazy, but it's better for him to do that than to have him following him closely all the time. After all, for some time now, the squad leader doesn't seem to give up, and so day and night, he thinks he's coming up against his second wall. And this one is even worse, because it comes in the form of a merciless death, and he thinks he can survive if he can feel them. And so he thinks about irregular spaces, noticing that it's the patrol and the sound of the torches. But as the killer approaches, he keeps trying to look for them and wondering where he is, and he keeps trying to feel the sound of that bastard. But then, when he hears the noise outside of someone jumping, that needle already sticks in his neck again. And he says that of course he failed. And so the next day, he says that he didn't take a single step forward, but his body clearly remembers everything. The experience of learning, the heart of the beast and the staff. And he goes to Jackson to ask questions again. And he says that he can get a lot of information just from the sound. And you can tell the location of something by the intensity and direction of the sound. And once he can hear faint and distant sounds, at that point his ears practically become his second pair of eyes. And then he makes a noise that gets the protagonist's attention and says that sound is a wave. And this wave resonates in all directions, no matter how quiet it is. And in the case of thousands of sound waves mixed together, he needs to isolate a single wave, and he starts to hear the sound of everyone around him. And the protagonist observes everything and tries to identify each sound, thinks that there are many sounds mixed together, thinking that he has to catch a sound wave intertwined in the middle of all that. And he starts to meditate, saying that he needs to listen, categorize, and isolate them. And he thinks of all the flags waving next to him, noticing that they still seem like the one big flag sound to him. But then they wonder how many waves there were, trying to remember if there were 7 or 10. And from right to left, the soldiers marching close to him and to away, thinking he is beginning to feel the waves and the familiar sounds and the unfamiliar ones too. But then Krang goes to him, calling him, asking what kind of training is that. So he asks about that name. Krang says that Encrid is his name, so once must be fine. But he says that it is not. But let him call him that if that is what he wants. And he just says that he is standing there looking like an idiot, asking if this seems like training to him. And Encrid says that he is not an idiot who wastes time. And so he realizes that he knows something. And that night, he dies once more by that poison and continues to see Krang die too. And after another death, he says that this is the 33rd time, another failure. And on the 34th, he has not heard anything new. And he keeps having failure after failure. But he continues training in the half time he has it. The morning, and says that he does not need more experience to overcome this wall. Neither divine intervention nor sudden realization. He just needs to repeatedly do what he needs to do. And so he begins to hear the hawk landing on the flagpole. And he can feel the most distinct things, even seeing Krang approach, opening his eye before he could say anything. And he says that this surprised him because he approached him stealthily. But he questions how he knew he was there, saying that the protagonist kept his eyes closed for a while, asking if he is training his perception. Then he says that he is not really an idiot who wastes time. And so he becomes sharper and sharper. And this time he manages to dodge that needle. In doing so, he quickly draws his sword, attacking the assassin. Then the assassin finally falls back and begins to despair because this is not something he was expecting, and Encrid thinks to himself that that assassin is no longer the faceless death. Dude, it's not for nothing, but the guy is becoming truly absurd. They're noticing that now he can face death head on. Now he can also understand everything that's going on around him. And apparently, his troop is also a bunch of absurd guys because the king is very strong. And now he learned from Jackson how to create the second eye. And with that, the killer becomes more and more desperate and goes after the protagonist again, calling him a damned rat, trying to hit him. And Encrid thinks that this guy is definitely not as good in combat as that perverted stabber and thinks he can handle it. But then he notices that Vengeance has already died. But Krang is still alive, but he can't take his eyes off the assassin who tries to kill him at all costs. And he thinks he shouldn't let his guard down because this guy is still an experienced assassin, and he manages to dodge the first attack, but the second knife thrown cuts his chest. And so the assassin continues going up, but then a sword cuts the tent, and the protagonist is surprised to see that because it is the fairy commander of the company who is entering, and he thinks that if he doesn't stab her first, it will definitely be the one who dies. But when he goes up to her, the assassin asks if he had a guard throwing several of those spikes at the protagonist, and some of them also go up to Krang, who tries to defend himself. But while he looks at that, he tries to continue going up to the fairy, but she jumps over Encroach and takes off her cape, defending Krang from all those thorns, and he claims to have thought she was with the assassin and is surprised that she came to protect him and thinks that whatever the case, now is his chance. And so he goes all out for the assassin, trying to kill him, and actually manages to hit him with a knife. But the assassin stops the attack, and without having much to do, he simply retreats, leaving there, and he becomes calmer, noticing that he ran away. And so Krang notices that the guy was probably after him, and the protagonist says he knows, but he questions how. And the protagonist questions who is going to pay the assassin to kill someone insignificant like him or Vengeance. And so the fairy says that it is exactly that, saying that he knows how to reason, but she puts her hand on her sword, and he notices that she was an ally until now, asking if she can't let this be known, and he thinks that she won't leave witnesses while she takes her sword. He also prepares for the fight, but Krang walks in the middle, saying he has a favor to ask her, saying he doesn't want anyone to die that day. So the protagonist simply understands, and she lowers her head, saying she will do as he wishes. But Krang says that this also includes that platoon commander there, saying he is not dead yet, and she says they have an antidote, so he should be fine. And so the protagonist notices that she must have knowledge about antidotes, and Krang says that now they need to clean up this mess because it will be a nuisance if people find out that the killer was there. But then the protagonist asks if it would be okay if there is no trace, saying there is a way, looking at the flame over there. And so he sets fire to the tent, and everyone gets up preparing to put out that fire quickly while he takes revenge from inside. And so they notice that there are just survivors, and the protagonist thinks that with this the killer's traces have been erased and they will take care of the consequences. And now further away in the middle of the forest, Krang continues walking with the fairy, and she says that if that squad leader hadn't been late, he would have died, and asks if he changed his mind because of him. And Krang says yes, asking if he isn't interested, and the fairy doesn't answer, while he thinks that he has been trying to avoid this. So the next day, the protagonist returns to his training while Krang leaves, saying that Encrid must have influenced him, and says that they will definitely meet again in their respective roles. Ever since I laid eyes on this guy, I knew that this guy isn't a commoner. He must be the king, and the protagonist will become his knight. Right what I am saying, right what I am saying. And so once again with Karen and his side, he doesn't like it at all. He puts the side down and falls apart. Then the protagonist appears in front of him, and Karen says that he will see him again, and he says that at any moment he will accept him coming. And so he says that he was confronted again by the repetitive today. He survived against that silent death and woke up the next morning, and he thinks he can feel the presence of most things, but he couldn't feel that fairy, and he thinks he has a lot to do when he gets back. And fortunately he wasn't hurt, so he can return immediately. And so Vengeance asks if he saved him from the fire, and then him and why. And Encrid wonders if he's scolding him for saving him, and he wonders asking why he doesn't like him, and he says it's because they're comrades, asking if he needs another reason. And Vengeance doesn't know what to say, saying that after all the shit he did to him, he's a very selfless bastard, and asks if he's returning to his squad. He says yes, but then Vengeance says he's out of luck because the weather is going to be terrible outside. Then Encrid asks if anything happened, and he says that there's a rumor going around that the entire base is cursive, and already at his base, Ragnar tells Ren not to get on his nerves, calling him an underdeveloped monkey and giving him a big push on Ren, who gets excited to start fighting. And so everyone starts running, saying that some crazy guy's squad is fighting again, and Ren simply picks Ragnar up, wanting to throw him to the ground, and he wonders where the leader of that squad is because they're like this because he's not there, and throws Ragnar on top of a tent, which completely breaks it. Then they tell him not to get close to the two because they will get screwed too, and Ragnar goes all out on Ren, breaking a crate on top of him, and so they start to exchange punches. The fight starts to start. Then Ren, seeing that business is getting serious, takes his weapon, saying that he will decorate his skull with his axe. And so they notice that he is armed, telling everyone to leave, and Ragnar says that he will cut that barbarian in half. Then he wonders where the other crazy people are, telling them to stop. Then the protagonist arrives, saying that he does not know about the base being cursed, but those two bastards could indeed be its curse, and so he arrives telling them to stop, revealing that the squad leader has returned. And Ragnar asks if he is still alive and if he did not die, because he thought he had died, but he says that he did not die, but he may go crazy because of those two. And so on a new morning, the protagonist says that for days have passed since he returned to his team, and as he wakes up, Ragnar notices Jackson by his side, and he says that he was trying to leave calmly, asking if he woke up, but he says no, saying that he was going to wake up. gonna work out anyway. And Jackson says that he started recently, but it's really good for me to listen. And he says that he's been practicing, and Jackson tells him to keep it up because it will help him someday. And so the protagonist says that battles are few and far between, especially with winter approaching. So he takes the opportunity to get fully armored, doing the pull-up with just one hand. And he says that he's been taking advantage of all this extra time to use it to train. And so they go to him saying good morning, and he finds this completely, noticing Aldine training, doing push-ups under a rock that size. Man, he's nothing. It looks pretty cool in the Manhwa and all. But how did he put that rock on his back? I wonder if he asked someone, put this rock this big on my back so I can do a push-up. And Aldine simply, while doing that absurd push-up, asks if he is coming back from his morning workout, saying that he is keeping busy. And so he puts the rock on the ground and says that this is good. However, he says that a well-trained body is a weapon in itself, saying that he should be able to withstand the kick of a frog. Crazy, this guy must have a tremendous one, because the protagonist is not small. But look at the size of this thing. And he simply calls the protagonist a chicken to his face, saying that he is still too skinny, so he has to keep training. But then the protagonist says that he is the one who is excessively big, says that he will try. And so Aldine says that the training technique he spoke about before is very effective, but at that they hear Ren screaming again and kicking Ragnar out of bed, saying that it is his turn on duty, but he is still sleeping, calling him lazy. And Ragnar simply crawls and he grabs his sword, preparing to attack, but Ren doesn't give it. And then the protagonist appears asking if they're fighting again. He simply asks for a rest, while Aldine says that unbridled violence doesn't solve anything. But Ren says that Ragnar is the one who will starve him to death, and the protagonist says that if it's his turn to work, then he should start cooking, and he just agrees. While Ren says that in the need for all this, he should do what must be done anyway. But Ren keeps provoking him, but he doesn't listen. So the protagonist asks him to stop, asking if he's bored. And so Ren questions if he noticed, saying that the lack of battle is giving him an itch. But Ankrit tells him not to take it out on anyone, telling him to go fight him, calling him to a match. And so, while they have that fight, he starts to regret it a little. And Ren says that he needs to take the blows better. So he tries to hit him with the axe, throwing his weapon up. He almost misses his sword, and he thinks he has to keep calm with the heart of the beast. And so as Ren's axe comes, he calmly defends himself and thinks about using the thing he practiced while dying hundreds of times, using the thrust, and almost hits Ren with that. And he manages to dodge very beautifully, grabbing protagonist by the collar and putting him on the ground. And Ren says he expected more since he has improved a lot recently, and questions what made him so boring all of a sudden, saying that that stab already bored him, asking if he doesn't have anything new. But then protagonist notices that now he knows, because he is different from before, and now he can repeat all the hundreds and thousands of times and move on. So he tells him to come to him again, saying that he will destroy him properly this time. But Ren keeps thinking that his skills are completely deficient, but he doesn't get tired of it, seeing those eyes. And so Ren thinks he can say that after leaving a mark on him. But then the rain starts falling, and they call off their battle, and he says that the rain starts and stops suddenly, and Ren gets pissed off because mushrooms are growing on his feet at that rate. And so everyone hides, while the bulging one arrives, questioning how many times he will have to cancel his duels because of the rain. And he says that he would even believe if someone said that they cursed it. But the protagonist questions what curse that is, so he asks if he hasn't heard the rumors, and Encroach now remembers, saying that when Vengeance was talking about something, he said that his camp was cursed. And so the bulging one says that the weather is strange, the number of victims increases, and they were set on fire, and especially in the escort squad, Jack, Boo, and Rolton, everyone is hurt, and people say that they are cursed because of all this. But he says he is sure that they are not really cursed, and the temperamental weather only fueled the fire of the rumors even more. But the protagonist thinks that the superiors will not let something like that happen to go unnoticed. So the big-eyed guy questions why he's standing at the entrance anyway, and he says he's training his senses, but he questions if in this torrential rain it'll work, and Encroach says it's because of the torrential rain. And so Ren questions what he's doing, asking if he's trying to be a street cat. He asked what's the point of this, but Jackson says that this isn't a bad way to train, saying he's doing well. But then Ren asks what he taught him, questioning since when does he care about his squad leader. And so the protagonist thinks it's too noisy there that he can't even grab the rein, and Ren keeps yelling, while Jin says that if he's looking for a way to train in the tent, there are some things he can do even lying down. And at this Ragnar asks if he wants him to check his posture again, and Ren looks at everyone's attitude, realizing that they noticed too, and looking at all of them, he's really sure that they noticed what he noticed, looking at Proto. And meanwhile, in the superior's tent, they tell the company commanders to keep their soldiers under control, and they should send a scouting party before winter again, asking if anyone has suggestions to fill the gaps. And the fairy just watches and asks about the 44th squad leader, so he wonders about the useless guy, saying he's a bit dumb, asking if it wouldn't be good for him to hold back the scouts. But the fairy says he could bring unexpected results. But the superior asks the reason for her thinking that, and she says it's just a fairy's instinct. This fairy is tough, okay? I can feel that she's no small thing. And so he goes to her, finding out that he is being sent to the scouts, and she just looks at his face, and Zoido questions if he did something to piss off the company commander, and he questions what he could have done to make that happen. And Zoido questions why else she would have specifically picked him. Then he remembers that time she almost pulled her sword on him, and wonders if she won't kill him because Krang left. And Hank questions if he really will, saying that he can help him get out of there, and he knows that, holding his axe. But the protagonist says that it's not like he can use his axe on a superior like him, but he says that he wouldn't tell him to do something like that. But Hank tells him that it's better if he doesn't do that either, since he already has a history of doing such things. And Odin starts praying for the captain, asking why he tests his poor servants, telling him not to take their precious little squad leader from them. Then he wonders what's got into these guys, and Rania also stands up, saying that can go in his place. But Zankard says that the others might, but not him, and everyone says that Rania is a little dangerous, and he might get lost. And Jackson questions if they told him he should explore the tall grass fields, telling him to pay attention to the changes in sound in the grass, because noticing disturbances is the first step to overcoming the ambush. And Ren gets pissed, asking if that sneaky bastard thinks he can teach him again, and says he already told him to stop teaching him those weird things. But at that, Proto says that no one will stop them from fighting after he leaves, and asks if it's right to leave them here, and he thinks he even agrees that there's no one better than him to do it, because after enlisting, because of his weak skills, he was constantly moved around, replacing other people, and the only place he ended up being useful was among those crazy people who never stop fighting each other and almost kill each other all the time. And he actually stops the two, saying it was as a sober squad leader, and he asks them to call a truce, and with him in the middle of the two's night, Ren questions if he is brave or stupid, and Jackson says that he should be thanking him, because otherwise he would have another hole in his heart. But Ren says that his head would have fallen off before, and the protagonist thinks to himself that those bastards really are skilled, so they can't lose them, and compared to them, he is not a big loss in combat power, and thinks that there is no need for this sudden contemplation, because he knows where he is in terms of skill, and he says that he just needs to improve. So while he goes with the scouts, he says that the scouts are going to the front line, so he can spend his time training his senses. And in that, one of them notices Anchored walking with his eyes closed, calling him the leader of the leftover squad, telling him to focus, and he doesn't quite understand. And he says that they both may have the same rank of squad leader, but he is the leader of that scout squad, and if he has any problems, then they will solve it. And that is Andrew Gardner, who his friends start to tease the protagonist, asking if he thinks he has the balls to fight him, because he is in that squad of exiles, who even questions if the protagonist knows how to hold a sword properly, and Andrew says that if he goes to him, of course he will try not to hurt him, calling the protagonist useless, saying that the squad only works because of the members that are in it, and with that he starts yelling, saying that if they found an enemy, they should crush their skulls, and everyone agrees, and the protagonist thinks that they are yelling, asking if they do not understand what reconnaissance means, thinking that that squad leader is a complete rookie, and wonders if this reconnaissance mission will end well. But then one of them finds tracks there, and he notices that those are GN tracks, and they say that they will follow that track because they will have a barbecue that night. But the protagonist knows very well that in his travel, groups of at least 20, and he wonders if he is really going to fight against that, wondering what Andrew has in hand. And so a guy from No starts laughing, thinking that that is definitely not No but a gazelle. But then he notices that Proto is next to him and says that that squad leader is kind of unpleasant, and Henry tries to be nice to him. And Proto says that he used to be a hunter in a mountain town, and Henry didn't seem to mind the squad leader, and he started a conversation with him, and they soon became close. And Henry talked about the basics of being a hunter, which he found quite useful, and he says that there is usually a separate path for animals in those fields, but he will talk about that tomorrow. And so already at night, they talk about how they spent the whole day looking for No that didn't exist, and the day of the scouting squads was wasted, and in that Andrew still wanted to keep hunting No, thinking that he needs results and anything would do, and the protagonist just watches him lying down. And the next day, as they continue on their way, they arrive where they should be, talking about that place they should scout, the Green Pearl, also known as Akka, the useless field of grass, and he has a huge field in front of him, which covers their heads, and Andrew says that they crossed that grassy field, found the enemy scout group, and they will bring them back as prisoners and be rewarded, and so all the idiots who follow him start to scream. But in that, Henry wonders if they are really going to go in there, asking if they were not supposed to explore only there. But then the protagonist says that that is the squad leader's command, and follows all of them. But he says that going through those tall leaves is not easy, so he thought he would give up soon. But Andrew continued, which is unexpected, and he says that he is not complaining, he is taking it seriously. And in that, Henry thinks that there is not much animal droppings around there, so he questions if it is a problem. And Henry says that this means that there are no animals in the place where food is abundant for them. But as they continue walking, the protagonist hears a paw, which is definitely not human, and that scares him a lot. And when he looks to the side, that beast is already in front of him, running past, and just as it looks at them, he looks at it and tells everyone to duck. And Andrew has the brilliant idea of shouting that that is the enemy, telling everyone to run. But the enemy has crossbows in their hands, attacking in groups, so several of them are caught, and the protagonist tries to run away last, but then he starts to be surrounded. But even running away, the enemy has crossbows that can hit him from afar, so the protagonist hears the noise of it being pulled, and thinks that the listening technique he learned from Jackson is certainly useful, and so he manages to escape from that arrow. But he thinks that with all that noise, he can't tell what is what, and he thinks that it is only useful, while he is overpowered in every way, and is pierced hard dying there, and he thinks that when you know you are going to be ambushed, what makes the most sense is try to avoid it. But in that, while they make another mistake on that lawn, he warns Andrew, but he questions what he said, asking if he wants him to cut his head off. Then he thinks that there was no way they could have heard what he said, so he goes to look for a way to do it alone. But then they notice that it is an ambush, and the protagonist says he tried to run using a different path, but the enemy stopped him once again, and he ended up being pierced anyway. And he says that it is okay, because he can always find another way, and he says that he has the daily repetition by his side, but he keeps dying over and over. Then he says that he was caught by about 20 crossbowmen from the east, and died after being pierced by arrows, so he kept getting killed. And he went north to avoid the crossbowmen, but he came across a squad of spearmen, and ended up being killed again. And so during the night, he was still alive, slowly dying, while dying of hatred. So he says that even if somehow he managed to avoid it all, they didn't stop chasing him, and little by little, he sees sees people approaching, and he says that their uniforms are painted green, as if they were preparing for an ambush. And he wonders what they have to protect in this field for them to be so prepared. And he continues tracking until the middle of the camp, and there he sees something that leaves him totally amazing. But then before he could make it worse in his mind, someone comes and stabs his sword in his neck, and he thinks that those Icebane bastards, what are they hiding there? And in that once again he continues following Andrew even though he knows what will happen. He says that they have tried this dozens of times, and as soon as they enter there is no way to get out of there alive. But he says that those Icebane are hiding something there, and he has to find out what it is. But if he gives up on this objective, he will not have to die in that home. Renota is coding behind, and he thinks that this might be the end of that day. But the protagonist thinks that by not saying that he won't escape from that wall, and ends up going in front of them. But Andrew keeps talking shit, asking what the useless one is waiting for. And so another guy says that he knows that he's becoming a burden, but tells him to get used to it because the leader of his squad also has his own difficulties. But Zencruz asks why he should do that, saying that there is a limit to how much bullshit he can tolerate from an idiot, and asks if that guy isn't also getting tired of licking the boots of that childish squad leader. He questions what the protagonist said, but he just takes him out of the way, saying that he won't play this game anymore. And so Andrew asks if he's saying that he's going to disobey orders, and he says that he needs to rethink the situation better. And he says that disobedience is intolerable. He thinks that he simply won't be able to survive alone, and tells Andrew that he'll deal with the orders from now on. So he says that if he uses everyone's strength so that they can get out alive, it might work. But Andrew doesn't like that at all, and he thinks that Andrew is the one who survives the longest along with that other one soldier and Henry. And he thinks that especially that soldier with the mark on his eyes fights as well as he looks, he is the most skilled in the squad, but he is on that kid's tail. So he must be some kind of bodyguard, and Andrew says that he can try to take control. But that is of course if he defeats him by ordering the protagonist to draw his sword, and he thinks that a normal soldier would not have a bodyguard. So he is obviously well trained playing by his posture, and he notices that Andrew is little experienced given his skill level. He must be the son of some rich lord or something. But he thinks that if that were the case, he wouldn't be so desperate to get results, and thinks he must be a disgraced nobleman or something. And so Andrew says he's playing by his pathetic skills, and yet extremely high-ranking. He must be some loser who never trained but still expects to be paid, and the protagonist thinks that whatever he is, he can't continue following his orders. And so Andrew says he's different from him and has a mission to fulfill. But the protagonist simply says he talks too much, tells him to go for it because he won't even need to draw his sword, and usually loses his head going all out. And the protagonist thinks that normally he would have difficulty against someone as skilled as him, but he is obviously underestimating him, and his impulsive actions lead him to recklessness. And so he goes all out, stretching his sword out in front, and the protagonist simply deflects his sword by giving a light slap to the side, making him completely lose his posture, then hits him with a punch in the middle of the boy's chest, making him fall completely out of breath on the ground. They notice that he was defeated with just one blow, and Andrew almost doesn't believe it because he was rock bottom. And everyone looks at Andrew as he says that from now on that squad is under his command, asking if anyone has a problem with that. And Henry almost doesn't believe that other mercenary also stays quiet while Andrew has nothing to say, and so everyone agrees, and he thinks that this is the first step. As they enter, they wonder what that bastard is thinking. But then he asks Henry what his dream is, and he questions the reason for the question, then says that he wants to marry a beautiful woman and work in a flower shop. Then the protagonist, he says that to do this he will need to survive that day, and he also questions the other soldier. He says that his beloved recently had a baby, and the protagonist says that if he doesn't want his son to live without a father, he will need to get out of there alive that day. And he questions the other last two, and one of them says that he wants to save money to open his own business, and the other says that he wants to return home. He also asks Andrew, he says that he will fulfill his mother's last wish, and says that his dream, his mission is to revive the gardener house, and he says that all the answers are the same, and to be able to fulfill them all, he must do it. They needed to get out of there alive. So he turns his back on them, saying that everyone there will get out alive, and the protagonist thinks that from now on he needs those people to be proactive, and obviously has no motivation greater than life itself. He says that the enemy would appear soon. He was planning to get through this, and he talks to Henry and tells him to shoot an arrow in that direction at head height, but Henry says that there is nothing there. However, the protagonist says he will not repeat telling him to shoot, and Henry actually does it, hitting an enemy soldier, killing him. Like that, the enemy realizes that it is an ambush, that the protagonist's team is surprised that they are enemies, so he calls Andrew to go after him. He really does, and the protagonist says that filling with the advantage can change everything by killing one more of those enemies. He thinks that they need to find them first, ambush them, then seriously, if Subaru had that level of wisdom, the business would be very different there in Rosario. While protagonist is following all the enemies closely, they wonder what happened, asking to kill them all. But then Andrew manages to kill that guy who was talking too much, and protagonist thinks that they need to take advantage of the confusion and reduce their numbers as much as possible. But then the enemy appears behind Andrew, almost killing him, and protagonist thinks that if he brings Andrew to his team, his bodyguard will follow him without hesitation. And so the man who almost kills Andrew has his head cut off because his bodyguard can easily kill him, and the protagonist thinks that with this, his chances of success are much greater with that bodyguard on his side. So he continues decimating the enemies, and he thinks that the enemy, which originally had 12 people, is now only 8 people, and everyone else keeps shouting that it's an ambush, asking for help, and he wonders how many there are while they're all in a mess. And the protagonist protagonist thinks that the rest will die little by little, that they'll realign themselves, and the protagonist orders them all to completely kill the enemy army, and they go on a rampage. And the protagonist says that in a field with tall grass like that, the enemies also have difficulty finding the location. But he says that they were discovered first because of that puma that is running around. But this time, even an enemy soldier gets scared by that and tries to kill the puma, already pissed off with the animal. But then, the protagonist takes advantage of this and kills the soldier who was behind that animal. And he remembers the first time he saw that animal, and he notices that they were chasing the beast that he had seen. They were chasing it, and coincidentally, they discovered it. So this time, they didn't notice their ambush because they were focused on the hunt, and things are going well because of it. And so, he won't die easily. And so, Henry shouts to him, saying that they finally finished everyone off. And the protagonist says that they can't waste time, calling them to get going. But then, that cat of the mother and family keeps walking behind the protagonist, watching him. And he says that after a random event, they only have 6 left in their unit. And even after multiple cycles, it is impossible to save them all. He says that even so, this time, most of them survive, and he calls them to continue. But then, a soldier appears, and the protagonist, hearing them from afar, manages to rip his head off calmly. And he says that because of the repetitions of that day, he knows the locations and numbers of the enemy soldiers, and if they continue on that path, they will be annihilated by 30 crossbowmen. But then, he calls for them to turn in the other direction. He says he needs to turn right to avoid them, and the spearmen who persistently pursued him every time he returned must be eliminated quickly, otherwise they will hinder his movement. And he quickly kills them one by one, and he says that he wants to avoid difficult fights and use ambush and lightning to gradually escape the enemy circus. And so, even Andrew manages to do a good job killing the enemy. However, his guard thinks that Andrew is starting to overdo it, because when night falls, it will be difficult to find the way out, and he says that they need to escape while the sun is still in the sky, and the protagonist calls them to go ahead. But then the guard asks what he's doing, because this is even deeper. But he says he knows about this, saying that this is the right direction, saying that he will not accept any disagreement. He asks the guard to follow him. But then, both Henry and Andrew get a fright, and the guard puts a sword to the protagonist's neck, telling him that he should think straight, saying that he does not intend to follow you to your death, and he will find a way to get out alive, even if he has to kill you. However, the protagonist says that soon he, of all people, should know that there is no turning back, and after the noise they made, his way back must be full of enemies. So he asks if he's saying he should keep following, and the protagonist says he'll make that very clear, saying that he also wants to survive. And Andrew begins to notice that the protagonist might be different, because he thought he would be a useless piece of trash, like his father, who gave up everything and spent all his family's fortune. But he thinks he was wrong, and in fact, he reminds him of someone else, and he remembers his mother, speaking her last words on her deathbed, telling her that his family may be finished. But even so, he hopes that he will become someone who leads people, just being there and gaining the trust of others, becoming a leader and rebuilding your family. And he thinks that this is the kind of person he always wanted to be. And the protagonist looks directly into the bodyguard's eye, telling him to trust him, because they will get out of there alive. And Andrew thinks to himself that he is truly a man who paves the way, looking into the protagonist's eyes, calling him Captain Anchorage, and saying that he trusts him. My friends, I am getting goosebumps. This thing is getting too good. And the bodyguard even tries to talk to Andrew, but he says that the captain is now Anchorage, and the squad follows the former order of their captain. Then the bodyguard notices that he has really changed, and then the protagonist notices that everything is fine, and he says that until he gives the signal, they must follow him crouched down, without making a sound. And he thinks that the first step in the method of escaping that day is to take the initiative and seek out the enemy and break the siege. But the second step is a little more complicated. As they walk completely crouched down, they look to the side, and several spears are there. And he says that this is the critical point, which he found after dozens of repetitions, and everyone is scared, but still silent. And the protagonist says that it was only at that time and in that place that he felt the terror. But he thinks, while they are walking around there, that they can let the enemy pass without a direct confrontation, and everyone is looking for them. But he remains completely crouched down, fleeing from confrontation with so many enemies, so everyone is sweating, while the protagonist continues to watch, only with his ears. And he remains crouched down with everyone there, an unbelievable tension. And he says that everything is going according to his plan, and now it's the last step, for the sun sets and darkness falls. And he tells us that's why they always fail to escape this camp, of course, and so he says they've arrived. Then Henry can't believe it, and the other one who's there think that after everything they've been through, could they be in the enemy camp? And so he says that Aspen is soldiers. They are killing everyone who enters the camp to silence them, and that is because they are hiding something that no one can know about. And in the middle of that camp, there is a totally bizarre monument with several bones underneath a completely shredded flag. And the protagonist wonders what will happen when something more important than them captures. It happens, and he calls everyone to go, and he thinks that a way for them to escape will surely appear while they sneak behind some tents. The protagonist is asked if he is going to burn down the enemy camp, and the bodyguard asks if he has gone crazy because they are in the middle of the camp, and they're most likely going to end up waxed and dead. But then he asks what that bodyguard's name is, and he says he can call him Mac. Then the protagonist says he won't tolerate disobedience, and he even tries to complain, but Andrew tells Mac to shut up. And so the protagonist follows closely, and Mac remains pissed, saying that he doesn't need Andrew to tell him that they won't be able to get out of there, with the moon behind the clouds, saying that in a situation like that, they can't trust anyone else besides their squad leader. And so he cuts through one of the tents, but Mac wonders what the hell he's doing, wondering if he's ripping the tent to get through. But then he notices that the tent is empty, and Mac continues continues to find it very strange, wondering how he knows these things. And so the protagonist continues calmly, following his path at full speed. The Mac thinks he is very reckless, passing through the enemy camp. But he thinks strangely, even he does that, they didn't see any of their soldiers. And he says that when he stops to think about it, there's no doubt that they're in the enemy's camp. Then he wonders how this is possible. And then the protagonist tells them to stop, asking them to wait there. And he thinks he's infiltrated that camp dozens of times. And the first time he noticed that flag and he attacked, it got the attention of the entire base. He returned to him and ended up being killed very peacefully. And he says that what Aspen's soldiers wanted to hide in that thicket, it's that flag, and their main goal is to protect it. And he wonders what's going to happen if it catches fire. And Mac then wonders if he already knew that flag was there. But how? Then Mac assumes that the company commander, she told him, remembering that she was the one who indicated that they were nobodies. And she thinks that there must be a reason for this. Aspen's soldiers will be too busy protecting the flag. So Mac continues thinking that's why he took control of the squad out of nowhere and infiltrated that enemy camp. It was all to complete a secret mission. But this is still just a guess. And the protagonist says that they will escape while this happens. And he says that they will separate into two groups. One group will be the bait, drawing the attention of the enemy, and the other will start a fire. And so Max says he's going with this group. Then he's in doubt about it, thinking he was complaining the whole time. But he suddenly became cooperative. But he thinks this is better for him. And he says he's dragged the squad to Camp Aspen several times. But this is the first time that he has so many people with him. And this is the best today he has had so far. He thinks he has a good feeling, thinking he's going to make it. And the battle starts first with an arrow. Then Mac takes the lead, running, drawing the attention of the enemy, and they all aim at him as the protagonist walks towards a candelabra, taking a flame, saying that he is heading towards tomorrow. But as he catches that flame, a man appears beside him, descending with a sword at the protagonist. But it doesn't just hit him, it cuts the candlestick and takes the fire out of his hand. So he thinks he didn't hear it come, and that man stands face to face with the protagonist as he prepares to draw his sword, and he notices that this is an enemy combatant, which he hasn't seen in any of his others today. And the man seems to be quite benevolent as he stands in front of the protagonist, and he asks where someone as strong as him came from. Then the man calls the protagonist a worm, but then he says that they arrived late. And that guy finally notices that the tent next to him is on fire, and everyone screams, saying that the tents are on fire, while they notice that there are intruders. And the protagonist group runs with a barrel in their arm. And that man who was in front of the protagonist, he orders everyone to put out the fire first. And Anchorage thinks that Mech attracted most of the enemies, and he got the attention of the rest. In that time, Andrew set the tents on fire, and he thinks he just needs to escape from that place now. But then he goes against his mind, taking a step forward, thinking that all attacks start in the foot, preparing a lunge, aiming at the man in front of him, thinking that he should kick the ground to propel his body forward, saying that he can see the attack he will be able to give that man. But as the sword gets close to him, he manages to quickly turn his eyes and escape that attack. And the protagonist doesn't hit him, passing right through him. Then Anchorage is shocked, for he has reached in the meantime what adorns the side of his body. It makes him start to limp, while the man is calm after having hit him. And Anchorage thinks that this was the most perfect thrust he could make, looking at the man behind him, as he says that the protagonist is weak. So he thinks he can't defeat him, and he won't be able to defeat him with his current level of skill. So he thinks he barely made it there, through countless deaths ambushed in the field, and everything he went through until then. He says he thought he had finally defeated the challenges that this today had to offer him, but he realizes that the real wall he has to break is that guy, and with that pain in the side of his abdomen, he says he's going to end up dying, just like that if he defies him. So he'll need to take control of the squad again, escape across the countryside, and repeat today countless times in the process, and then die all those meaningless deaths. Then the man in front of him looks at the protagonist who is all hurt, but then he gets angry, asking if he's laughing, and Anchorage really is, thinking that he will still finish him off. And that man says he will cut him up and feed him to the dogs. And the protagonist keeps thinking that he will overcome that wall. While the protagonist is with the knife, he stops the attack and the protagonist notices that he parried his attack and is about to launch another one. However, Anchorage gets out of the way in time, but the knight has such good mastery that he continues a sequence of attacks, putting a lot of pressure on the protagonist, and he is surprised that he attacked from above in that position, and he almost takes another sword strike. However, he manages to stop the sword in front of your eyes, and notice that his movements are fast and precise, and the man has blood in his eyes, and Anchorage thinks he won't be able to find any opening to counterattack, noting that that is a very big difference in skill, and so he is thrown away again. But while he is falling backwards, he takes a dagger to his chest, and he throws it at that guy. However, the knight manages to stop the sand using his glove easily. He notices that he stopped with the back of his hand, and the knight, with quite a lot of hatred, he prepares to attack the protagonist again, and this time he uses the mixed one. Meanwhile, they scream that the fire is spreading, and the protagonist manages to dodge that attack by a hair's breadth. Meanwhile, enemy soldiers are putting out that fire halfway there, and they notice that someone is throwing oil over there. So the fire goes up to that flag, and to that flagpole that they were defending, and they shout at the platoon commander, who was attacking the protagonist, asking if he doesn't understand what's at stake here. But he looks at Incrit, noting by the look on his face that he's not going to give up without a fight, and he is ready to attack once more. Then the commander speaks to him, telling him that he will wait for the next one. And so Incrit finds himself retreating so easily. He wonders if he was the real wall, but then he thinks he wasn't, saying that if he is not the wall, that he will need to overcome today. Still, he needs to improve. And with that, Incrit runs to the protagonist, saying that they need to go now. However, Incrit continues to look at that squad commander as he walks over to the fire, and he looks back at the protagonist, eye to eye. Then he puts away his sword and tells everyone to retreat, and so they all run away after finishing what they came to do. While running, the protagonist looks to the side and notices that one of the guys who went that way has disappeared. They notice that there are only 5 members of the squad left now. Then Mac asks if that's asking if they're not going to send a chase party on a large scale after that. But the protagonist says that it's probably not. However, as they run, he notices Henry falling behind because his arm is apparently hurt, and some soldiers go after them, telling them not to let them escape. And Henry is behind, slowing down the group. He keeps getting slower and slower, and without having to say a single word, both Incrid, Mac, and Andrew return to stay and battle against those who are chasing them, and that all begin the widespread killing. Then he tells them not to stop and to keep running, carrying Henry in his arms, and he says that they won't be able to chase him if they continue through the habitat of the field of the fox and the snake. But his friend says that this also means it will be harder for them to escape there too. However, Henry says he knows a safe route, a hunter's path, and so Incrid says that he will trust him, telling him to guide them. And some time later he says that he can no longer hear the footsteps from the group he was chasing, so they keep running until a fox watches them. As they continue to despair, the protagonist says that thanks to Andrew and Mac's efforts, they managed to easily lose them, and if it weren't for Henry's path, they wouldn't have been able to lose them that quick. And he says that it was thanks to the efforts of the entire squadron that they got this far. Then he notices the sky breaking again, and so he realizes that this day finally came to an end. And after running through a long field, they finally arrive at their camp. Then they wonder what happened to them, but they just want to pass out. And the protagonist feels that wind, thinking that another today has passed and a new day begins. Meanwhile, at the enemy camp, all those flags are completely burned, and the commander asked about them, and that guy who looks like a wizard says they need to prepare again, because who would have thought that the famous gray dog wouldn't be able to stop the few strays. And he thinks he really doesn't understand, for the soldiers camped in the fields of tall grass. They were the best of the gray dog, but a few enemy soldiers they attacked head on. They started a fire, they escaped, and he talks about the gray dog, which is an independent company with independent operational control, and the name of the company is derived from the gray dog, which resides in the Principality of Aspen and is said to have a persistent temperament. He has the need to connect with whatever target he decides, whether it's love or war. Also, this company with the name of Gray Dog, they are also called persistent lovers. And so he talks to the guy who fought the protagonist, asking if the person he faced was strong, talking to the platoon commander, and he says that if it weren't for the fire, he would have finished him off on the spot. And so the Gray Dog then thinks he was lucky, saying that this is already a skill in itself. But Myth says that this won't happen again. However, in the meantime, the protagonist thinks that what bothers him is that he faced that wall, but he couldn't overcome it, thinking I wanted to keep fighting him. Soon, eventually, they will have to face each other again. And Myth says he will kill him with his own hands, while the protagonist, you think you'll get over him too. And so it is said that persistent lovers have chosen their next target. Meanwhile, Renna in the tent, literally throwing his axe in the air, thinking he's bored, thinking the squad leader must be returning from his recon mission, wondering why there's no news from him. And so he picks up the axe, wondering if he's dead, thinking that he's actually gotten a lot better recently, but he's still a rookie, so it wouldn't be surprising if he died. Speaking of which, it doesn't happen often, but he really liked him and thinks what he could do if he was dead, thinking there's nothing interesting. Then Rania wakes up and bumps into Ren, who is looking at him with a look on his face that he found something to play with. And Rania asked what he's looking. He just gives him the finger, and Rania gives him the finger back using his foot. My friend, I need to learn how to do this. And Ren finds something that will take away his boredom, telling Rania that he really wants to kill him. And Rania calls him crazy while pulling out his sword. Meanwhile, the company commander questions him. Did he happen to discover that there was an enemy ambush? Did he infiltrate an enemy base while he was there? And also by chance, he ended up setting the whole place on fire. And he says he continued to make the best decisions possible in that situation, and she was lucky. Then she thinks about that luck, looking into his eyes, and she ends up just accepting, telling him to rest and recover. And she thinks she kind of hoped that this would achieve something, but she didn't expect something so big, wondering who that guy is after all. And the protagonist thinks to himself that really, he can't understand what she's thinking. And so Andrew goes to him, saying that he's sorry for having acted badly in the beginning, saying that he is alive thanks to him, asking if he will meet him again. And the protagonist says he will, if their paths cross once more, leaving. And then that the boy just pays respect to Andrew as he leaves. However, the protagonist tells himself that he is alive, and he managed to bring back those 4. But he wonders if this is really his best, because he ended up losing to members of his squad. What if he was a little stronger? He could have saved him too. And with the repetition of that today, he is able to overcome his limits, and eventually he will end his desperate struggle and strive to achieve his goal to become a knight. And he will use his todays as stepping stones to that purpose. And to avoid repeating the same day over and over again, he needs to become stronger. As he walks back to his company, he hears people screaming that those crazy people are at it again, and Ren and Rania are fighting once again. And Ren is quite excited about it, and so is Rania. So the protagonist thinks he's never seen these expressions, saying he's trained with them countless times, but he's never seen them like this. Then one of them says that they are not even human, saying that they are more like animals, and they continue to fight each other with everything. And the protagonist realizes that they never had to try their hardest against him, and he starts to think that he needs to establish his priorities, and first he needs to do them, making those expressions in front of you two. While fighting, Rania ends up looking to the side, noticing that the squad leader is there, and Ren says that he has to inform them if he's back, because he's hiding like a cat again. Then he asks what they are looking at, saying that if they are not going to fight, they should get out. And Rania also notices that he is hurt, but he says it's just a scratch. And besides, he talks to Ren, saying that when he blocked Rania's attack just now, but while he was going to speak, Ren says that he is already starting his annex again, telling him to just wash up and rest a little. And he tries to talk to Rania about his attack too, but he plays dumb and just walks away. Then protagonist wonders why, but Rania doesn't say anything and just leaves. Then protagonist notices that it seems he had something to say, but he thinks he can say it if he wants. And some time later, the protagonist says that the battalion commander, after learning of the ambush by the enemy forces, he moved the entire battalion closer to the tall grass field, and his wounds healed significantly during the journey, and he constantly gets injured. The commander reflected on his fights and train, and even at night he prepares to train more. And Zoido is surprised, saying that they will go out again tomorrow. Then he asks why he doesn't rest a little, and the protagonist says he's going to leave for a moment, and Ren says he's doing that without being fully healed, and if he continues like this he will die soon. And Rania also notices that there is something wrong with Prota, and when he wakes up in the morning, he notices that the squad leader is training again, waking up early. As he grabs his weapon, he thinks he's good with the sword, thinking that getting stronger wasn't hard, and he had a chance to become a knight, but he thinks it's boring, saying there's nothing he wants to do as a knight. So why would he spend time and energy on it? He says he doesn't find any meaning, and so he lost his purpose and stood still. But then as he watches the protagonist train, that's when he ends up feeling his wound, and that's why he stops, dropping his sword. And Rania looks at him. He thinks he learned the fundamentals all wrong, and he needs to learn the fundamentals correctly when he starts. And he thinks with all the shortcuts the protagonist uses to compensate for his poor fundamentals, it will be impossible for him to get stronger, even with training. But then he wonders, why does he put his whole body and effort so much? And looking at the protagonist, he questions why he does all this. So he says it's because he wants to get stronger. And Rania questions what he's going to do when he gets stronger. And the protagonist says he will become a knight. But Rania says that a knight is just someone who fights well, asking if this really has that much meaning to him. But Incrid says that the knight he hopes to be is someone who decides for himself what is right, and he raises his sword for honor, for the sick and the poor, and for those he loves. Then Rania looking at that, think about honor and merit, questioning whether it really is, saying that strength is just a tool, wondering if a knight is even a sword, and he thinks what he wants. So he takes his sword, and he starts walking towards the protagonist, saying that he won't know until he walks the path himself. Then he calls Incrid, asking if he wants to learn how to use the sword. Man, I really like it. Everyone there at the protagonist camp, they don't seem to care much about him, but everyone cares about the guy. Besides, it's a camp of absurdly strong people, and Incrid, with that invitation of his, says that he definitely wants to learn. And so Rania thinks that he shouldn't have said that, because he was already getting lazy. But even so, he thinks that that look might mean this is going to be interesting. And Rania says that the barbarian taught him about the beast instinct or something. Then he says it's the heart of the beast. And Rania says he also has the staff, saying he needs to forget everything, minus those two things. And he questions whether he has to forget even Valina's mercenary sword technique. And Rania says he needs to forget that especially, because if he doesn't let go of her, even if he learns a new technique, he will end up going back to his old habits. And if that happens, he can give up and tell him to choose whether he will forget everything or stay the same. But Incrid doesn't even let him finish the sentence, saying he will start from scratch. Then Rania is surprised about this, asking if it is serious. Then he questions where to start, and Rania says that this guy is definitely not normal. Then he says that he has a good physique, so there is no need for a light weapon, and a long sword would suit him well, telling him to change. And the protagonist asks if it's okay. He gives you his sword, yes, and he says it doesn't matter, saying there's nothing special about it, ordering him to hold it with his right hand above his left. But when protagonist holds the sword, Rania questions why he is squeezing it so tightly, and he says it's so he doesn't lose the sword. But then Rania asked who taught him that, and he says it was the king. Rania calls him completely useless, telling him to just stay in position, teaching him to go at the protagonist with his sword. And Crid's hand begins to tremble. He asks what that was, because it hurt, and Rania says it should have, saying that if it becomes rigid, it will only end up breaking, and it is practically like a branch or a column, something like that. But Incrid wonders why all the members of his squad are so bad at talking, wondering what the hell he means by that comparison, wondering if he means he's to stick, because he's holding the sword too tightly, realizing he must mean that he must be flexible to keep his sword from breaking, and his movements need to be more malleable. And so he begins to hold the sword a little more calmly. Then Rania goes for him, telling him not to lose his balance, and also questions when he comes back, where is he pointing his feet, saying that he is stiff again, wondering if he's trying to break his hip, or if he's fighting or dancing. And so they go on, and he ends up on the ground with Rania winning. Then he thinks he had no idea it was this bad, because he doesn't even know the basics right, saying that this is not something that can be taught. But then the protagonist, even though tired, takes his sword and stands up, looking into Rania's eyes, calling him to train again, and he goes for it, saying that they will take it more calmly. And then Ren comes and saying he was wondering where they were all day, asking if they were having a picnic with snacks and everything. And he asks the protagonist if the useless guy is giving him trouble, questioning if he wants him to fix him. And Rania starts saying that he's going to rip his hands off, but then he asks if something happened and why he's dressed like that. And Ren says it's because they were called, and they say that enemy forces are gathering on the horizon. And a few moments later, Prota's group is gathered. So Ren wonders if teaching him sword art was a mistake, saying that he is new to this technique, so he probably won't be able to fight as well, and because of that he'll probably die that day. So he raises his sword, thinking that the protagonist will need a babysitter. Meanwhile, Incrid thinks that he would continue learning more of that technique. Then they wonder why everyone is standing still, thinking that the formation is strange, and that flag is all frayed. It continues to be erected on the opposing side, and they say that formation is strange, and so that wizard on his side. He simply raises his hand, telling them to witness the end. Then it starts to snow, and the fairy realizes that it is magic, and that snow goes over the protagonist army. And he realizes that the fog appeared out of nowhere, and he can't see the fog. He can't even see who's next to him. And in the middle of all that fog, they wonder what is going on, and the protagonist becomes increasingly more aware of their ears. Then they start to hear some strange noises, and they wonder what that noise is, noticing that something is happening up there. Then the protagonist shouts to them, which are flashes, but too late, because several of them are killed by them. Meanwhile, the fairy starts to use her wind powers, or whatever she's using, and he says that this is not a normal fog, saying that there was no way to predict it, that they would use a tactic like that. Then she tells everyone to take cover, raising their shields, and she notices that they lost. And the wizard starts laughing, saying that it was very complicated to do this magic correctly, and he had to offer the blood of several animals, collect the cleanest water from the lakes, and use rain magic constantly. And the moment the magic is activated, it obscures all vision, unless the person is below the one at which the magic was cast on the flask. And that battle is over, and he calls it the fog of annihilation. Then Mithy comes after him, saying that he seems quite happy, and he says of course, because he barely managed to make it work, especially with the flag practically burned, and if it weren't for that, it would have been a piece of cake to do that. And Mithy is still totally pissed off, realizing that that guy must be on the other side. While Ragnar returns to train you, he finds something strange, saying that it is not possible that the squad is so good, asking if he has been fighting like a fool on purpose until now. But he says that it is not quite like that. Then Ragnar says that he has a very good base, and if it seems that he needs something, it is experience, and so he starts going again to that battlefield. And he says that he has repeated that today more than 200 times until now. He continues going towards the arrows, leaving in the middle of all the enemies. Then he says that he will see how far the techniques he learned will take him, and he goes on a path of death, tearing off heads. And he says that he knows where the enemies will appear behind the fog, and ends up killing them quite easily, even throwing Kine, saying that he can finish off some of them even if he cannot see them. Then they wonder who that is, while Prota continues through the fog, knowing exactly where they are, but they cannot see him. Then one of them questions if there is someone there, but ends up losing his leg without even knowing where from the attack came. And while the protagonist finishes that guy off, the enemy army starts to get all worked up, wondering what's going on there, asking everyone to be careful with the ground. And one of them even points the crossbow down. And he remembers Ragnar telling him to remember his eyes, feet, and hands, telling him to observe with his eyes, anticipate, move with his feet, and then act with his hands. And the protagonist becomes more and more psychopathic, transforming in the middle of the field, and he thinks it's different, saying that the feeling is completely different compared to when he had no idea of the principles. So he wants more and more, asking everyone to come to him. Then he gets to a certain point where several crossbows are pointing at his body. Then the soldier says that he did well by filtering himself there, but questions if he really thinks he'll get out alive. But the protagonist simply looks at them, saying that what he wants is to fight with swords, and calls them to fight like that, saying that he wants to fight like men. So he continues wanting to continue testing themselves, but they obviously don't fall for this cheap provocation, taking it out with their beast, and piercing the protagonist completely. And so in the astral plane, Karani says that he walked into his own grave, and must have lost his own mind. And so the protagonist wakes up again, wondering what happened, because that appeared out of nowhere to offend him. He thinks that he really just went there to offend him and left, but then they question what he's doing in the moon world, and Ren looks at him, and he remembers the moment that Race said that it was a spell, and thinks about the enemy formation completely broken from a tactical point of view, and he says that it seemed like they were guarding the flag, like on the battlefield, but he wonders why. Then he questions Ren, asking if he knows anything about spells, and he questions why this question out of nowhere. And the protagonist says that it's just that he thought it would be interesting, asking him to say what he knows, but then Ren questions if he knows how to tell the difference between magic and spells. So he says that magic is more common, but Ren says that this is not wrong. However, a spell needs a medium, and not only does it need a medium, but the medium is much more important, and spells cannot exist without a medium, and the protagonist thinks that's it, saying that the fog is a spell from the enemies, and that flag was the medium. That is, if you break the flag, the fog will dissipate. Then he questions whether his tribe uses spells, saying that spells originate from the east, and Ren is from the western border, and Ren says he's seen it before, asking if he didn't know that there are many real sorcerers, saying that most of them are actually wizards. And so the protagonist simply leaves the tent, and Ren asks where he's going, and the protagonist says he's going to train, and once again he goes back to Rania, and he says that luckily it seems that they both have the same basic training, and he talks about the Anic sword technique, asking if he knows anything. And so the Prota says that about 500 years ago, there was a prodigy in a million. The child, born on a sword farm, killed 12 bandits who attacked the farm, and with nothing but a fire poker, and because he lost his parents early, He learned the art of the sword from a very young age, and a nobleman who had heard about the rumors adopted him, and that prodigy was called Leonis Anyak. But as much as he was blessed, he was cursed, and he began to lose his strength at the age of 10, and was completely paralyzed at the age of 12, and thus the prodigy of the innovated runes was lost to history. But Rania says that at the age of 20, Leonis, completely paralyzed, immortalized himself in the history of sword art. And he compiled all the sword techniques on Earth and categorized them into 5 categories, being the art of the fair and elaborate sword, the art of the strong and heavy sword, the art of the fluid and disoriented sword, the art of the fast and inconsistent sword, and the art of the gentle and deflective sword. And the protagonist thinks about Anyak's technique. And he says that Leonis rewrote the history of the sword, and with that, the Anyak family became the greatest house in the empire. And the effects of this technique can still be felt in the foundations of sword techniques today. And Rania talks about all the sword arts, and additionally the art of the Oriental sword, and he says that among these, the technique he developed has roots in the art of the Northern heavy sword. So he asks about the beast consciousness, and the prota corrects him again, saying that it is the heart. And he says that that should be more useful, and with that, he tells him to concentrate on a single point, forgetting everything around him and focusing only on his own sword and its enemies. Then he says that he will show him what it is like. So he simply raises his sword and attacks the protagonist without him even seeing that the sword is so fast that it passes, makes a mark on the protagonist's neck, and he only notices later, noticing that that is a faster blow than Ranya's axe, saying that he almost died. Then Ranya asks if he felt anything, but Ranya appears there cursing Ranya, questioning if he is trying to kill the squad leader. But he says that people concentrate better on the verge of death, saying that he is only helping him. But Ren says that he will not be able to learn anything if he were without his head, asking if he knows how long it took him to learn the heart of the beast. But Ranya says that this is expected since he has a stupid barbarian teaching him, and so they start arguing again, and the protagonist thinks that they both are horrible at teaching. And Ren says that he is from the far north, and questions if Ranya's people are not more barbaric than everyone else. But then Ranya says that he is from the barbarian tribes of the south, and Ren already starts wanting to buy a shelter. But the protagonist says that he has had enough, questioning if Ren is not there because of the order to retreat. And Ranya tells him to remember how alert he is in the moments before death. Because if he is successful with concentrating on a single point, everything around him disappears, and he will feel his sword doing its part. So on the battlefield, he thinks it is similar to the heart of the beast, yet completely different. And he thinks that the heart of the beast will make you lose yourself in the face of death, but concentrating on a point makes you more alert. And he says he needs more experience to recalibrate you. And he keeps thinking about the flag that is the medium of the spell, so he starts to aim, saying he needs to get rid of that flag to escape that carnage. And so with that fog, everyone goes blind again, and the protagonist says he will set a new goal above gaining experience, saying he will destroy the flag. So he keeps going forward, saying it will be easy to get there with the king and Ranya, and he keeps killing his opponents. But he starts to think that first he will try until he can't anymore. The crazy guy is completely unafraid of death. He is trusting too much. I want to see the power fail. You don't come back, play around too much. And he thinks that concentrating on a single point is quite useful, as he died several times while unprepared. And to survive the assassin, he trained his ears. And to survive the battlefield, he learned the heart of the beast. But concentrating on a single point was another thing. So Ranya took his sword to the tip of the protagonist's nose and asked if he understood, saying that if he succeeds, he should be able to feel the tip of the blade slowing down or something. But the protagonist thinks he doesn't understand, questioning if it's the boldness of the beast heart interfering with that. But he doesn't think it is. And Ranya says that he should feel everything around him disappear, except for the opponent's sword, and be able to predict the path of the sword, asking if he hasn't felt anything like that yet. And the protagonist starts to think that analyzing his fear of death isn't the right thing to do. But the protagonist asks how he learned that. And Ranya asks how to learn what. After all, he's always been able to do that. So the protagonist questions if it's serious, and he says it's in the name, because he only needs to focus on a single point. But the protagonist says he won't get any useful answer from Ranya, saying he'll have to find out on his own, telling him not to get impatient. And so he says he'll keep practicing, or focus on a single point. His priority is to take down the flag and minimize the damage to his allies, besides penetrating the enemy lines. And at a moment when the fog reaches all of them, the protagonist yells for everyone to get on the ground, telling them to raise their shields, and that way they can stop most of the arrows that are coming. So he thinks he's repeated that day 300 times, and knows where the attacks will come from with his eyes closed. And as he passes, he kills enemy after enemy, making a line of corpses. Then everyone goes after him trying to get him. But the protagonist is being absurd, destroying everyone, and really focusing on a single point, and so they order him to maintain his positions, telling them to stop that crazy piece of shit. But the protagonist keeps smiling and advancing forward, killing a lot, and becoming more and more like both Ren and Rania in his berserker way of being. As he continues forward, the soldiers disappear, and he tells himself that it took him 10 days to get to the flag. But when he knocks it down, he notices something strange, saying that he is sure he destroyed it, but he wonders why the fog is still there. And so he ends up dying. So the soldiers think he seems to know a little about spells, but he says he was mistaken, and the protagonist thinks that's it, saying that there's only one true flag, and the others are just distractions, saying that he needs to find the true one among them. And so while he does this, he continues trying to advance alone through all of them, and he thinks he has 5 chances to get it right on the next try, and he tells everyone to get down on the ground and use their shields, and he ends up defending himself, but many die, and he wonders why they didn't listen to him like last time, wondering if it's time, because maybe he needs to give them time to recover, and he manages to take down the second flag after passing 3 today, and the other was the copy. There are 4 left, and so he spends another 5 days to be able to take down the 3rd flag, and it was another copy, and for the 4th flag, it took him 7 days to get there, but it was the same also, being a copy, and he thinks he only has 2 more, but when he looks at them, he feels that the one that has a burned part is the real flag. Besides, it is the one that is furthest away, and also close to the one he calls, and so the protagonist, as soon as the snow comes, orders them to get down to the ground and use their shields. And everyone hears him protecting himself from the arrows, and so Rania questions if he has gone crazy, and the protagonist thinks that she is positioned far away from him, so he cannot get tired until he reaches the barrier, and he leaves taking Ren with him, saying that he will let him draw the attention of the enemies and take the opportunity to get past them. And Ren in turn grabs one of the enemies, questioning who it was that cast the spell, but he thinks that he will not speak, saying that he waits for the next one to speak, and the protagonist continues forward, saying that the equivalent of a year has passed repeating that day, and he finally reaches the flag, thinking that it will be the end. But then as he throws his sword is stopped by Mithy, who throws his hand away. Then he says that this seems like a dream, because God answered his prayers. And Mithy says that he really wanted him to kill him with his own hands, but the protagonist simply acts like Thanos, saying that he doesn't even know who he is, and that the poor guy is in disbelief that the prota forgot about him in the few days that passed. But the protagonist still doesn't remember at all, so the guy says that he will remember when he cuts him, and goes after him. But the prota manages to get out of the way and counterattack quickly, so Mithy is surprised, wondering if this is the same guy he saw before, saying that he has become incomparably better, asking if he is trying to reach him with just 1 step. And so the protagonist goes after him again, and Mithy thinks that he is loyal to use the basics and is using the righteous sword technique. Then he says he's mixing it with the fluid sword technique, to which Deflate attacks, and Mithy throws him back once more, but Prota attacks him again. So Mithy thinks he needs to focus all his senses in front of him, because if he gets distracted for even a moment his balance will collapse. He thinks he needs to throw everything he has in front of him, and the protagonist thinks he should forget the flag. The result in the sword techniques, everything around him should disappear, leaving only the sword, and he manages to deflect Mithy's attack face to face. But as he begins to notice what he just did, Mithy manages to pierce him, killing him. Then the protagonist speaks well, remembers him, saying that he was protecting the maestro there in the field, and he says he is Mithy, saying that he is the commander of the pilot of the Grey Dog Squadron of the Principality of Iceban. Then he says that he is the commander of the squadron of the Kingdom of Nalilia and Krust. And so one of Mithy's soldiers asks if he is an enemy, and he says yes, saying that he is that expert at hiding, but in that they say that he seems harmless. But then Mithy looks at him, asking what happened to him, asking why he is smiling. Then the protagonist thinks that Ragnar, that crazy bastard, was not the concentration that came before the fear of death that he needed. What he needed was a good rival, an opponent who would risk and give everything to fight and encourage him. And Mithy wonders if he was just a crazy piece of shit, and takes the sword out of his chest. And so the protagonist goes back to Ragnar, and he continues talking about concentrating on an only point, saying that it is similar to the feeling of nervousness when you are dying, and the protagonist begins to understand. But then Ragnar questions why he feels like he is not listening, asking if he is already giving up. And so Ren says that they were called, and the protagonist simply calls Ragnar, and he thinks that in fact he seems even more excited, saying that he really is someone strange, and wondering if today he should take it a little harder with the warm-up. And so after their fight, they return to that fog, and the protagonist gives him the order to get down on the ground and put in these efforts. And so they defend themselves, and in that Ren tries to talk to him, but the protagonist simply calls him to follow him. And so he questions what the hell he is doing, and Ragnar says that if he is not going, he will go with him. And so Ren asks what happened to him, asked if he took an arrow to the head, but he says that if he does not want to take an arrow, he should look forward. And so the protagonist is killing everyone, while the two follow him, and he says that they opened the way in a similar way before, and he meets Mitsuruya once again, and he does so, approaching him, saying that it is very good to see him, calling him to fight, and then Mitch asks if his meeting came to him, and he asks if there is a problem, asking if it is the first time that someone confesses to him, saying that he went there because it was love at first sight, and in that Mitch says that his squad are the Grey Dogs, the persistent lovers, saying that it is the first time that someone comes after him, and then he asks if he was upset, but Mitch says that he was not even a little bit falling for him, and the protagonist thinks that entering the state of concentration in which he can only feel the sword once more will not be so easy, and he ends up dying again, and so Mitch says that he lost very easily, and says he doesn't know what he believed to come at him like that, and the protagonist says that his attitude was wrong, saying that it can't be intentional, saying that he needs to be involved in the fight. And he keeps repeating this to discover that feeling, and on the 80th time when he goes at Mitch, he manages to come once more, saying that on the 28th, he learned to intentionally enter a state of concentration, and on the 48th, he goes back to Rania, who starts to entice the mothers, and so, while his sword comes up, trying to make that cut on the side of the protagonist's neck, he manages to simply deflect Rania's sword, and this certainly makes him scratch his head. He wonders how he deflected it, using concentration on one point, and the protagonist thinks it's pure concentration, and means to completely control his body and sword, and his strength and technique have developed to a point where he can no longer compare them. Before he is repeating that today, and at that Rania calls him, asking where he is going, so he says he is going to meet with Commander Plato, and says it is time to overcome that today. Then I don't know if I am tripping, but this scene of the protagonist looks a lot like Gojo saying he is going to win, and at that he goes to the ferry, and she is surprised that he wants to see her, asking what was wrong. Then he talks about spells, saying he remembered seeing them during the reconnaissance, and she doesn't quite understand. And he says that Aspen's soldiers were calling a strange man a sorcerer, so she tells him to elaborate, and he says he told her everything she needed to win the battle. And so, when the ringer arrives, everyone goes to the ground and uses their shields, and he says he just hopes his commanders are competent, and says that what he needs to do now is go to Mithy. He really goes to overcome that guy. And when Mithy sees him, he gets pissed off, and the protagonist calls him by name. And he is surprised that he knows his identity, and the protagonist says that he wanted to fight him from the beginning, saying that he will defeat him, going all out. But Mithy also gives the protagonist a lot of trouble, but he manages to defend himself much better from his attacks, and Mithy is surprised that he has improved so much, giving him trouble, making him sweat, and while they exchange attacks, Mithy asks if he was hiding his abilities. And the protagonist says that apparently he was, and Mithy asks in Crid's name, and he reveals it, then goes back to exchanging attacks with him, and Mithy says that he will remember that name. But the protagonist says that he doesn't need to, because if he forgets, he will remind him himself, and so the protagonist enters the mode of concentrating on a single point, making everything around him gray. He says that his balance is changed to his right foot, and he is preparing to cut diagonally, but he manages to dodge it easily, saying that the technique he learned from today was the experience he gained from repetitions, and all of this culminated so that he can see his movements. While Mithy tries to attack him, the protagonist manages to make a cut on his neck, but Mithy also manages to do the same protagonist, and Mithy is surprised that he was hit, so he starts to get more desperate, asking what's going on, because he thought he could defeat him with a few moves, but he's having difficulty against that shit, and thinks he can't accept this, because his fair and fluid sword techniques are made to parry, and he needs an accurate attack, and says that his supreme technique that he learned for this type of situation is an attack that starts from below, an attack that cuts everything in a huge arc, the rotating cut. But Crid thinks to himself that he can see the technique from which he died so many times, all because he could not see where and when it started. But this time he can see it, then begins to smile totally sadistically, giving there to that sword, then he throws it away, and so Mithy does not believe that he not only saw it, but managed to parry it. And it is said about the Hurias, one of the three main houses that rule over the kingdom of Aspen, and the Huria house represents the brute force of the kingdom and recruits all those who show talent with the sword. And Mithy says he was also recruited by a house regional for this purpose, and after adopting the name Huria, he proved himself along with his skills and faced two adult knights at only 15 years old, and defeated a city's champion swordsman at 18. And so he says that he was strong enough to be the champion of an entire city at 22, and became one of the three strongest fighters of the Grey Dogs just with his skill, and there were few who matched his talents, and he wonders why people train until their legs can't take it anymore, and why swing a sword until your hand bleeds, especially when it only takes a few attacks to win. And he says that he was satisfied with the present and was confident in his skill, saying that this was a mistake on his part. And just at that moment, the protagonist not only deflects the attack, but launches a counterattack, hitting Mithy's chest. And so, when he is stuck with his chest there, the protagonist quickly withdraws his sword, and Mithy feels the pain of that attack, spitting blood, and Encrid seems quite happy with this result. And then Mithy says that he underestimated him, because he thought that the attack would definitely hit him. And so he says that he is not as good as him in strength or technique, and at this the protagonist says that he is right, but he won. And so Mithy starts to get angry, because if he had tried harder instead of being complacent, it would have been different. And the protagonist says that it was fun, but at this point, another man arrives wanting to protect Mithy, and throws the protagonist away with a sword. And so they ask him if he is okay, and Laura tells him to take Mithy to a safe place. And the protagonist turns around saying that he did not imagine that the only man would cause so much mess, saying that he will not have a peaceful death. Then the protagonist says that he cannot forget that he is surrounded by enemies, thinking that he needs to break the flag and guarantee his respite, and thinks that he is facing another wall, and says that that is the wall he has to overcome today. And so everyone shoots at him, but the protagonist keeps moving forward, thinking that he can't dodge all the attacks, and will receive them and keep moving forward. Then Laura says that he wouldn't dare to move forward, and throws his sword in the direction of the protagonist. And he begins to feel that after just one attack, his sword is breaking, saying that his sword technique is extremely heavy, and he is thrown back, thinking that to win that battle, he will have to die many times. But he remembers that the objective now is another, and he has to destroy the flag. And so he throws one of the daggers at the cloth of it, saying that the medium of the spell will stop working, even with the slightest damage. And so he almost hits it, saying that if he aims at the flag, the dagger will only go straight through. And at that moment Laura notices what he is doing and almost hits him. However, the protagonist thinks he has to aim at the connection between the flag and the conductor, and so he actually manages to make the cloth come off the flag, and then all the snow begins to fall apart. And the fairy says she informed the commander that there was a spell and asked for resources to fight, but they did nothing, and she thinks her kingdom is rotten, and they sent a potato to command the front lines, saying that at this rate they will be decimated. But then she realizes that all the snow is disappearing, and the enemy soldiers do not understand anything, so they ask what happened to the flag. But she starts killing them all, and says that the enemies were taken completely by surprise by the disappearance of the snow. And now is her chance to change the pace of the battle, and she orders all the men to counterattack, so they all leave, and she thinks that things are more favorable now that the snow has dissipated. But she questions who destroyed the spell, wondering if it was that squad leader. And the protagonist at that exact moment is in the worst situation of his life, full of thorns on his body, and thinks that he screwed up, because after destroying the flag, he thought that he would meet Ren or Rania again if he had retreated to the Allied lines, but he wonders where they are. And at that same moment, Ren is surrounded by several men, and he asks them to bring him sorcerers, otherwise they will all die. And Rania is also surrounded. Meanwhile, some of the allies are watching, and he asks everyone to wait, and wonders what the hell is this, wondering if he wants to be executed. Meanwhile, the protagonist is also in a very bad situation, with the men asking if he thinks he will survive, telling them to give up. But then, that puma from that time appears, and he notices that that's the puma he saw in the fields, so they talk about that beast and try to hit him. But he keeps jumping from soldier to soldier, stopping them all, and then stops in front of the protagonist defending him. But he tells her that it's better for him to go away, because that guy there is different, and he keeps looking at the protagonist with a totally frightening look. But then they touch the protagonist's shoulder, telling him to go back, and Vengeance says he's going to save him, going after the blonde. But then he's thrown away with a single attack, and notices that he's very strong, so the protagonist questions if he didn't say he was going to save him. But then Vengeance gets up and orders his gang to shoot them all, but the blonde stops. All the attacks come in his direction, and Vengeance asks what that guy is, calling him a monster. So the puma tries to go after him, but ends up getting a hell of a beating, being thrown away. And then the protagonist starts to enter focus mode on the single point, thinking he can see, but he notices that he can't deflect that sword with his strength. So then he simply says that he needs to let it flow, just like Mitch did. So he manages to do that, being hit by very little in his shoulder. Then the blonde realizes what is happening, and notices that that is Mitch's technique. The protagonist, with a totally bloodthirsty look, thinks it worked, being excited. So Vengeance helps him trying to attack the blonde, but he manages to get out of the way. So several soldiers start to join, and seeing that things are getting very tumultuous, he decides to simply give up the battle, saying that he will not forget the protagonist, and Anchorage tells him to be at ease, and so he orders all his troops to retreat. And with that, Vengeance runs towards Anchorage, talking about his shoulder, saying that he is without bandages and they need to go back. But then Anchorage says that they also need to take the Puma, but in this he tells them to worry about himself, and he ends up picking up the Puma and carrying it in his arms. Then Anchorage shouts to the 3rd platoon, telling them to go to the rear, because they are going to retreat, and in this he asks Anchorage not to close his eyes, saying that he is losing a lot of blood, and so he begins to lose consciousness. Then Karen says that he got what he wanted again, thinking that bastard is very persistent, wondering what motivates him. And while he is in this meeting with the boatman, the war continues while Vengeance takes him back. Dude, what a cool friendship. So much Vengeance as Puma as protagonista. Then, sometime later, when he opens his eyes again, he hears everyone talking. While some are worried, others are arguing, and that giant is praying, and the protagonist wonders what is happening, because that thing in his hand is the Puma that is sleeping with him as if it were a kitten. So Ren asks if he has already woken up, because this time he thought he had really died, and the giant says again that God answered his prayers. So the protagonist questions what is happening, and Jackson asks if he is okay, giving him some water, saying that he lost a lot of blood, and Zoyoto says that fortunately the doctor said that he will not have any lasting effects, and the goddess of luck must be by his side. While he drinks water, some ends up falling on the Puma, and he starts to move, and the protagonist thinks that he must have fainted during the removal. So Jackson says that since he woke up he is going to go with it, while Ragnar goes to sleep a little more, and the protagonist thinks he's had another day, and Ren stares at him, and the protagonist questions what he's staring at, asking if he wants to pet the Puma, but he says he's not interested in the beast, but asks how Anchorage knew it was a spell, and Prota says he won't believe him if he tells him about repetitions, so he'll have to lie, but he refuses to do so, because Ren has always been loyal to him, and he needs to repay his kindness, and he says he was friends with someone like him, a colonizer, and he had only suspected based on what he heard from him, so he thinks that this was perfect, because he didn't lie to him, and he actually heard it from a colonizer, Ren himself, so he says that if he doesn't want to tell him that's fine, but he just tells him not to get interested in spells, and Prota thinks that despite his appearance, he really does understand things quickly, but he also remembers asking Ren what he was doing during the battle, and he says he went after the guy who he found the flag, but he didn't like it very much, so he sent his head flying, and the protagonist remembers that he didn't see the wizard, and it was probably because Ren took care of him. Meanwhile, Zoyoto tries to touch the Puma, but it almost bites him, and the protagonist asks him to be careful, but Zoyoto says that he won't resist being without 10,000 krona, and he says that he heard from Henry that because of that little guy's blue eyes, they call them the Panther of the Lake, and they should store the energy of the earth inside them, and each of their claws is worth 10,000 krona, and their claws always grow back. And the protagonist thinks that a single bronze coin is worth 1 krona, and 10,000 must be worth a gold coin, thinking that it is worth more than his payment. And he says that after he fainted, they dominated the battlefield with ease, since the fog had dissipated, but the battle itself was inconclusive, and since then they haven't marched or ventured out. And the defense he made, he wonders if he could do it again if he tried, but he thinks he's not sure, and even after some time Jackson tells him to stop moving so much, but he says he's not exaggerating, because he can move a little. But Rania says that the most he can do now is stretch, and it's better for him to go back to sleep, and Ren asks if he's trying to spread his laziness to the protagonist, telling him to get out of the way, and so he starts trying to grab his sword, and the protagonist remembers that he has a question related to it, saying that he was able to use a technique he had never practiced before, and he hadn't done anything like that, asking if it's normal. So Ren says that this is normal, there's nothing special, and when using the heart of the beast, he can see what the enemy is doing, then he would be able to see how he is swinging the sword, and how he uses his strength. And Rania says that it must have been easier since he learned the basics, and says that he also managed to use the concentrate on a single point, so he would certainly have seen even more, and says that even so he must have been lucky, saying that at his level, this would only be possible after hundreds of real battles, and the protagonist thinks that it really is like that, because that day that passed was not just one day for him, it was hundreds of days of unimaginable difficulties he made sure through his hard work, not just by memorizing patterns in the days that repeated themselves, and he says that no matter how pathetic he is, he can get stronger. And so he talks to the two who are like water and oil asking for a duel, and Ren says that they call him a crazy man, but that guy is even more, and Rania says that it is rare for him to agree with that. But questions where he wants to go in those conditions, saying that with his body in that state, duels are out of the question, and so the fairy goes there, asking if he was the one who broke the spell. And he says he imagined that the commander would start asking questions soon, but asks why the commander herself is doing this. And he answers that it was him, and says that he saw it while he was on patrol, and also knew a little about it before. Then she says that there were 5 replicas, asking how he discovered the real one. So he says that he guessed, and she just accepts it, saying that it's okay. But then he questions if that's all she came to ask, and she says that she also came to see his face, saying that she thinks that fate brought them together. So he questions himself about fate, asking what she's talking about, and starts to get all silly, asking what the secret is, and Rania questions if he had that kind of ability, but he says that it's not quite like that, telling them to be quiet, and Zoyota appears, saying that it would be great if he opened a bar with him, saying that it will make things favorable, but the protagonist denies it, and tells him to shut up his mouth, and he wonders why she is this way with him, because she is his boss's boss, and this is uncomfortable. But then Zoyota also says that there is news, saying that the Squire of the Order of Knights is there, and the protagonist feasts his eyes on this information, thinking about the Order of Knights of Crimson Cloaks, saying that the battalion he is part of is called the Cypros Division, and its name is in honor of a knight, and the Cypros is part of the Order of Knights of Crimson Cloaks, and they are extremely skilled knights, and this is true throughout the continent, and that is why the Order of Knights has many more people besides knights, squires, servants, and students of knights, and when the squire is approved by his knight, he becomes a knight, and above them are the knights, those who have surpassed humanity, and Proto says that squires rarely fight in battle, but rather their knight, so this squire is about to become a knight, and so he calls everyone to battle, and Zoyota says that maybe they were waiting for the knight, and now they are leaving, and Ren says that it is better for him to rest for now, but Proto thinks that he wants to see him, and Ren looks back, saying that you can see that he wants to come with them, and he thinks that he probably won't have anything to do. Then protagonist thinks that it is the ideal that he kept as a dream, a small piece of that dream. And he looks for that manhwa before your eyes as protagonist knight keeps going in front of that bunch of people with bows in their hands. The last thing he does for sure is farting, and with that rain of spears coming towards him, he just bends down, pulling his sword, preparing to run, and the protagonist thinks he used determination in his legs. And so he advances at a completely absurd speed, doing at least some 100 meters in half a second, getting close to the enemy army, and just with the sword swing he lifts at least 20 people, and the protagonist can hardly believe what he is doing, is looking. Okay, I said this one didn't have the power, but I think I am going to start rethinking because this isn't normal. It's not normal. And all the knight's allies wonder what that is because he keeps doing it. A clean one just by swinging his sword, and everyone wants to retreat, and the enemy commander orders them to stop him. But his head disappears without him even noticing, and so the knight steps on the horse's head while protagonist remains astonished at what is happening, seeing, and Ren says that the guy is not bad at all, and it's no wonder he's called an expert of war. And Ragnar thinks that at that level he thinks he could do it, while Jackson says that the enemy has at least 5 opportunities to stop him, and the enemy commander is one incompetent. Look, I'm starting to think that the protagonist group is a little absurd because they're treating it as if it were nothing. Then the other one continues praying, and while Yahello says that this will end without them having to do anything, and the protagonist is left wondering what Squire's sword style, and says that it is not fair sword art, saying that it also has elements of heavy and fluid sword art. So he thinks that fair sword art, it is a fair and intrinsic technique, and it draws the opponent into your movements, and the art of the heavy sword is a powerful and colossal sword technique, and it utilizes the strength to cut through everything and dominate the opponent, and the art of the disoriented sword. It is a confusing sword technique, and it deceives and corners the opponent, and the sword technique of Veil is based on that technique, and he says that the art of the fluid sword is a technique fast that overcomes its enemy with speed, and the last one is a sword technique soft and gentle, and she deflects enemy attacks and counterattacks, and he thinks that sword art heavy and fluid sword art are opposites. But he can see both in that guy, so he thinks they may have different characteristics. But all these techniques started in one place, and he thinks that the important thing is to understand what they all have in common at 5 and brandish the sword as if it were alive. And so he closes his eyes and begins to concentrate, and Hane and Rania look at him smiling and start talking about the leader of the squad is stuck to overcome something, ordering not to let them disturb him, while this Ankrid thinks that nothing changes despite his understanding, because understanding is not nothing, and he goes back to that place where he saw a much bigger wall, saying that there is the penalty to show him how much higher he has to climb. So he starts thinking he will reach the top. While all that battle is going on, he remains still and continues meditating until his army wins. And he says that war is coming at the end, and the next winters and springs will be full. Which is said that the Principality of Aspen is controlled by 3 main families, and the one sitting on the sovereign throne from Aspen, and he starts talking about how those bastards broke the good manners agreement of not bringing any knight. And the powerful Ruriel remains together with him, while Adsu AM administrator keep reading everything he has to say. They say they used the frog general as an excuse, and the frogs demanded a response from knights, so there is no much to do. He starts talking that damned frog general ended up going ahead without orders. Then they say that the frog species normally does whatever it wants, and they'll probably find some excuse anyway, and say that it wouldn't have happened if the spell had worked, and the sovereign says that the gray dogs will pay for this. And the blonde says that this will not end well for them. In the meantime, Proto says that after a long war the Aspen forces returned, and they to return for the border guard. The remote fortress of the city, and with its proximity to Aspen, the city is heavily militarized, with 1 in 5 people being a soldier, and one of leaders begin by thanking the many heroes in the ear they speak who led this war towards the victory, and says that he will now reward the common soldiers who proved their courage and loyalty. He calls Anchorage from the 4th Squadron, saying he will be rewarded for destroying the vile spell of the Aspen, saying that he rewards him, and everyone is shocked that the useless squad leader was called, asking how that idiot broke the spell. And they say that guy is really weak, saying that this is impossible, wondering if he's not just stealing credits from his squad by saying that he must have licked the commander's ass. But another says that maybe he can be good into something else. But then a Mecha appears telling them to shut up, and Andrew says he doesn't is someone he can talk to like that, and so Henry thinks that Anchorage is much more than then he receives a sum of money, and Zoilo immediately asks what he is going to do. Would be drinks or women, asking if he would like any recommendations, and he says he wants a good shop, asking for the best blacksmith in town. So they are shocked that he will spend all that money buying a sword, and Zoilo says that the sword of common use is not that bad, and it also says that there are several swords fallen on the field battle, and only the ones he took already serve as supplies for the squadron for the rest of life. Then he says that to become a knight he needs to prove his strength, and Zoilo, being mean as he is, keeps asking why he needs something so expensive. And the protagonist says he's going to take the soldier promotion exam, and he thinks that his time as a low-level soldier is over. And with the protagonist saying Thetis going to take the promotion exam, Zoilo finds it strange, because he thought he wouldn't be interested in it. However, Ingrid says that she can't stay in the same place forever, and Zoilo says that it makes sense, saying that they will organize things then. And he says that in Aurelia, there is a ranking system for soldiers to increase morale. Very high rank, medium rank, low rank, and very low rank, and those who are stronger than the resistance scales are designated as special, and the person receives different treatment according to his rank. And he thinks that to be promoted to a rank, you need to duel with 3 soldiers of the rank you aim for, and then win. And for the soldiers who will witness it, it's a fun sport involving betting, and so Zoilo invents the medieval tiger, and says that those who want to bet it's now or never, asking if anyone will bet on the leader of the Anchorage squad. And one of the soldiers goes to the protagonist, saying that Liz, who is in the low rank, will try to jump straight to the medium, saying that he won a prize for his squad's actions, but says that he's letting it go to his head. And so the protagonist realizes that he's the first, thinking that he's skilled even among the medium ranks, and he sells out the famous group of mercenaries. Meanwhile, over there with Zoilo, they notice that someone actually bet in favor of the loser squad leader, asking who the idiot was, and so Zoilo says that they can't guess the outcome until it's over. Meanwhile, the protagonist thinks that until now, he has only become the strongest by dying over and over again, but there is no risk of death in that fight, so he only has one chance, so he must look forward and not let his guard down, combining his pathetic ability with the limitations of the golden job, saying that most of the people there, he wouldn't even have the chance to face them in the past, but he thinks that he must not hesitate, fighting as if his life depended on it. Then that cocky guy goes after the protagonist, calling him an idiot and saying that there he goes. And the protagonist thinks about using the defense he learned in the last battle, saying that if he can perform it and create an opening, then everything will be fine. And he throws his sword in the direction of that stuck-up guy, and throws his sword away, disarming him with a single attack, and the blow is so strong that apparently his fingers break. And the protagonist is in doubt about this, while the guy starts screaming, while complaining about his fingers, and that the protagonist can't believe what he's seen, and ends up stabbing the guy in the chin with the dagger of his sword, so he falls to the ground stinking, and Anchorage doesn't know what's going on, wondering why he's so weak. And then everyone notices that the leader of the losing squad won, and Zoilo himself doesn't know what's going on, and one of the guys goes to complain to him, saying that he was the one who bet on the guy, saying that he knew how strong he was, but Zoilo says no, wondering if he was that good, saying that he just didn't want the bets on him to be empty, but the guy himself says that he needs to have a little more faith in his leader. And then the protagonist wonders if he let his guard down, because even if he was, he wonders if all duels end so quickly, he shouldn't be that weak, since he's of medium rank. But he thinks that he just needs to see what happens next. Then the other one arrives, telling him not to get so full of himself, saying that he was just lucky, and says that this time he will be his opponent, carrying a spear, and so Anchorage thinks he is part of the heavy infantry. the strongest of his battalion, and says that is distracting you by moving the tip of his spear, and he'll try to surprise you with a frontal attack, but then the protagonist simply rips the tip of his spear off with great ease. While you're still in doubt about what's happening, wondering if he really attacked from that position, asking if that was a trade, thinking that he must have something else in mind, but from the look on his face, that's all it was, and that's all he had, wondering it. This is serious, asking if it's his turn to attack. Then with just one more attack, he takes down another mid-level guy, and everyone is surprised by this, saying that it wasn't a coincidence because he won twice, and someone of very low rank defeated to mid-rankers. And then Zoido starts shouting, asking if anyone else wants to duel him, and everyone notices that a lot of people have gathered, thinking that it's embarrassing to lose to him. Then that insufferable squad leader calls everyone in. Idiot, saying that everyone will be scared after having belittled him. But his friend next to him, he asks if he wasn't the one who treated him the most with contempt. But he tells his friend to shut up, saying he has no idea what he's talking about. Meanwhile, that rich kid who was with him on the mission thinks that after losing the last time, he trained with Mac every day and wants to ask for a rematch with him. But then Mac asks him not to do that, and he has doubts about it, and Mac says that he got much stronger, and he thinks that not even he could defeat Ingrid now. So the rich kid quickly sits down knowing his place. And then the barbarian goes to another guy, and he notices that it's that crazy guy. So he asks if he wasn't the one who was talking about how he had licked the commander's ass, asking if he was scared, but he says he's not scared, getting up and going to face Ingrid. But the protagonist thinks that it was so common for him to have difficulty until now that he hadn't noticed, and the pervert who stabbed him in the first one today, who faced him, and the killer in that today is the following. Recently, Mitchell Rurier, and he says that even the member of the squad he trains daily, saying that he has only had difficulties so far, and his old teacher told him to never underestimate his opponent. And in that the guy who comes close to the protagonist asks if he is rambling before the fight, but he says no, and the protagonist thinks that is who thought. That advice was irrelevant to him, because he never imagined that he would be superior to another person in a fight. However, that opponent says that he is most likely rambling, asking who is that guy. And so, Ingrid looks at him smiling, saying that he has become strong enough. So he says that it is just interesting, and he thinks that he has become strong to dominate his opponent, going after the guy and putting him down with just his sword. And he says that in the air he respects strength, being called the Kingdom of Knights, while he totally dominates the fight by putting his sword on that guy. His sword starts to break, and he gets scared. Then Ingrid says that right there and now he simply wins that battle with an exorbitant strength, stopping the sword in front of his opponent's face, making him faint with fear. While he falls to the ground, the protagonist thinks he just proved himself at that moment, and everyone is in disbelief with what they're seeing, and they realize that he was the one who broke the spell, the one who destroyed the flag, and they notice that he was not just taking advantage of his squad's achievements, saying that it was himself. And so Angel stands up, calling the protagonist break spells. Then he wonders what that idiot is doing, and he tells everyone to speak up to, because if it weren't for him, at least half of everyone there would be dead. And so everyone calls the protagonist the Spellbreaker, giving him the battle name, and he thinks that maybe it's not that bad. And so Zoido goes to him, saying that he is a mid-rank now, but he says that it is too early to celebrate, because he still has to reach a higher rank. And so Zoido is surprised that he wants to continue forward, that while they talk, the man asks them to stand up, saying that that is interesting, going down to the protagonist, and they notice that that is an eagle badge, and he is part of the border guard, those who serve directly to the crown, and that this is an elite squad made up of people of high rank and above, asking why the border butcher is there. Then the protagonist looks at him while he talks to the squad leader, asking why he doesn't duel with him too. He's my friend. Apparently he comes out of the pot and falls into the frying pan, right? And with that, Ren thinks that this is going to be difficult, and the protagonist thinks that the border guards are equivalent to the gray dogs of Aspen, and that means that he can be as strong as Ruri is, and he wonders what would happen if he fought someone like him without dying, and starts to get curious about it, asking him to go for it. And the butcher gets excited about that guy, because he's not scared at all, even going against someone from the special forces like him, and thinks that after watching he became more interesting than he imagined, and so he pulls out his sword. And everyone tells the protagonist not to let him get too cocky just because he's from the special forces, telling him to show his true strength, saying that this is the true battle of kings. And so they stand face to face, and the butcher mentally calls them idiots, questioning if they don't know that they are also the infantry, saying that they are thinking too much of themselves after their last victory, going after the protagonist, however, saying that will make them more humble. And so, while he attacks, the protagonist enters that zone, managing to defend the attack beautifully without being hit. And so the butcher thinks that that concentration is enormous, and in the smallest movements, saying that this is a surprise. So he grabs the protagonist by the collar, saying that now he is going to the ground, but then Ingrid grabs his arm, raising his sword, and almost sticking it in the butcher's head, making him think that this is death, but then he retreats, while Ingrid sticks his sword in the ground. and retreating backwards, he gains momentum to attack once more, but then Ingrid, while still fully concentrated, grabs his sword with his bare hands, and takes advantage of the momentum to land a knee on the butcher's stomach, making him fall backwards, but he goes after Ingrid once more, who takes a dagger to his chest and prepares to continue the fight, but then the fairy arrives there, stopping the two, who are startled by that action, and she says that's enough, saying that in a little while, they would end up killing each other. And seeing her there, the protagonist doesn't have a lot to say, and Jackson already had the dagger to the butcher's neck, and not only him, but the entire protagonist group was ready to finish him off with a beating. My friends, this is starting to look like Black Clover to me. Anyone who saw the scene I'm talking about knows what I'm talking about, and I'm completely goosebumps. Han says he's really lucky, but the butcher says it's a duel, telling him not to get so excited, telling him to do it again, and he'll end up with another hole in his body. However, the protagonist thinks he almost hit him when he lost sight of his movements, but if he had gone all the way, maybe he would have come out victorious. Everyone starts to think that the protagonist fights well, wondering if he's really the same guy as before. So the butcher puts away his sword, saying he didn't expect it, but he can't help but recognize him, saying his name is Torres, platoon commander of the border guards, extending his hand to the protagonist, and he says he's the 4th leader of the 4th company of the 4th platoon. Anchorage, and everyone in the audience is shocked that that guy is a commander of platoon, because that means he just fought against a special rank soldier. That is, he is practically a high rank soldier, and that means everyone there must respect Anchorage, because he is very brave, and everyone starts to cheer him, and Torres says he likes his reaction to the crowd, saying he hopes they see each other soon. High rank soldier, Anchorage, so he thinks that with that, he is one step closer, and so, already in the afternoon, a man goes to the protagonist, calling him to his company, and that is the commander of the 1st company, heavy armor infantry, Turtles, Graham, and he says that that is the 3rd recruitment request in a row from the 2nd and 3rd companies, wondering if it is because of his rank or his role in breaking spells. And so a man says that his company, heavy infantry, is the base element of this battalion, and he must know how important this offer is, and the protagonist says that as soon as he accepts, it would mean that he would be in the non-elite of the army, and it is a great offer, but he apologizes to Graham, and he questions why, saying that if it's about the 4th company commander, he'll have a word with her, but Anchorage says that's not it. But Graham says that he doesn't seem bothered, but leaves it at that, but tells the boy to know that he still wants him. Then he asks if he wants him to send him the rank at least, but he says that he spitefully rejects that crazy guy. Then he says that he survived the last battle, thanks to the boy, so he'll leave it at that. And at that, Zoid is surprised that it's the 1st company this time, asking if he wants him to pack his things, but the protagonist says he won't. Then Zoid asks why he is rejecting everyone, because at that moment he would be treated well and it would not matter where he went. But in that he becomes thoughtful and almost says the reason, but Torres arrives there, talking to Anchorage, and everyone is surprised, and he goes straight to the point, asking him to join the border guards, and so he thinks that the border guards are under the direct command of the crown, and it is a better offer than the Turtles, and everyone there becomes thoughtful about this, and thinks that the squad leader could not even dream of this before, and even if he had rejected the others, he would be a fool to reject that offer. And so Torres says that he realized the moment they exchanged the first blow, that he wants a bigger fight, and if he joins to them, he will give him hellish training and insane challenges. And going to the border guards means realizing his full potential, reaching out to Anchorage, and so Ren, Rania, and everyone else prepare to accept the protagonist's decision. But then he says that if he is talking about endless hellish training, there would be no other place like the one he is in, and he says that what he wants is not to reach his full potential, but to surpass it. And everyone there is the best challenge he could have. Man, this world is so good, but it's so good that I'm reading it with emotion. I'm reading it as if I were tasting a good wine. The detail is that I don't drink, right? But that's okay. And so on another morning, Ren is freezing cold, saying that he wanted to be hitting someone with his axe, and he asks where the squad leader is going, telling him to bring him some hot stones. And he says that since the battle is over, he has become completely useless, and Odin says that it will be warmer if he exercises, saying that how about they train? But Ren tells him to put down the blanket, or he will kill him, and Odin asks the protagonist if he wants to train with him, because the exercise will loosen his frozen muscles. He says that he needs to go to work now, and when he gets back, he will train. And then, Ren starts shouting to the protagonist asking for his hot stones, asking him not to forget, and he says he's already heard them. So the protagonist thinks he's cooled down the sound a little, and out of nowhere, since it's already winter. Then in the market, he says that the purpose of the border guard is to battle, but with the lack of battles, they patrol the streets to protect the city, and he goes to meet to other soldiers, and one of them is Jack, and the other is Boa, and he says that the three of them will work with the team that day, and the protagonist, seeing the two, wonders if they were part of the escort mission, and says he's heard those names somewhere, and they start joking, saying that they're working with the famous spellbreaker, saying that it's a great honor, and they say they heard that he was promoted to high rank too, and they think he went straight from the lowest rank all at once, saying that it's incredible, but the protagonist says he was lucky. But Jack says he would see their comfort in high-ranking soldiers, asking why they don't duel when they get back. So he says he never turns down a duel, and Jack gets excited saying that's a promise. While they continue with their work and wonder why they have to work in such weather, and they say that winter seems to be colder than normal, and the protagonist wonders why they're so close to him, since it's not like he's so big that he can block the wind, and so everyone tells them to come and take a look, saying that they have dried fruit. While they walk along the path, a staggering man walks towards the protagonist until he pretends to fall, and the protagonist tries to touch him asking if he's okay, but then a dagger is pulled out and stuck in his chest, and he wonders what's going on as he starts to fall dead there. And so Jack puts something in his mouth while the cake holds him, saying that this is a big deal, saying that he's drinking in the morning, asking if he's okay. And so he noticed that they are hiding you from the crowd and noticed that they are working together, and the man asks if he's surprised, while looking at the protagonist with a totally horrible face, while saying that a persistent lover never forgets his target, and the protagonist realizes that that's the half-fairy, an assassin sent from Aspen for having broken the spell, and the assassin cuts the protagonist diagonally as he falls stinking, and Jack says that the mission was a success, saying that they should return to Roten, and so one of them looks up and sees someone there at the lookout post, and the protagonist thinks about Jack, Bull, and Roten, saying that he remembered now. And they were wounded soldiers from the mission off reconnaissance, according to Cray, and Zoyoto says that all those in the recon squad were badly hurt, and the protagonist thinks that they have found an excuse to make contact with Aspen. As he dies, he thinks that it was a for against one, and so, when he falls all stinking and bleeding, a woman notices and starts screaming, and he says that this will be interesting, waking up that day, and so he says good morning to Ren, and he questions what happened to him, but the protagonist says that it is nothing, and he just wanted to start that day with energy, and as he leaves, he goes to Odin, who is taking his cold shower in the cold, so he asks if he spoke to him, and the protagonist asks if he had said that he knew of a training method to warm up the body, and Odin says that it is a full body workout. It is essential to maintain strength in this cold winter. It allows you to be prepared in all situations, and so the protagonist asks him to teach, and he thinks that he saw the assassin take out the dagger, but he couldn't react, he couldn't respond because his body wasn't prepared, so Odin tells him to take it, saying that he needs to keep that position, so he crouches down almost sitting on his own leg, putting both his hands forward and stretching one of them. And he says that he should have realized the moment he saw Jack and Bio getting so close to him, and he says that he's going to finish off those two first, but then he thinks he won't, saying that he'll end up losing a half-fairy if he rushes, and Odin says that his muscles will be sad if he can't even keep himself in a position like that. Then the protagonist says that his muscles are already screaming, and the protagonist thinks that if they are within his reach to chase them, he will be able to, and he will meet Jack and Bio once more, so he says that he will take them all down at once. While he goes to meet the two, he goes without a cape, and Jack questions if he doesn't look ugly, and the protagonist says that he was training just now little, and Bio says that he didn't get his reputation for nothing, while Jack continues talking about the weather getting close to the protagonist. So he thinks that his body is prepared thanks to Odin, and thinks that it's now that it's going to happen, and he sees from afar that half-fairy approaching him, and quickly punches each of them, hitting Jack, but not managing to catch Bio, so he wonders if he noticed, and the protagonist meanwhile continues looking at the half-fairy, wondering if he's going to run away or attack, thinking that whatever it is, he needs to take care of those two soon. And so he quickly draws his sword, but then the half-fairy makes a move, and in that he hears a strange sound and wonders what that is. However, a dagger enters his chest, and he realizes that it was a throwing knife, and he notices that at that distance, through that crowd he hit him, thinking that the guy is good, and so he says that a persistent lover never forgets his target again. While Ingrid falls, he says that by the time he realized, she had already pierced his heart, and that is a dagger faster than sound. While he falls, the woman screams again, and he says that he needs to face the cans at long and short range at the same time, thinking that now, how should he prepare for this? Then the protagonist says that when he is close, the half-fairy stabs, and when it's far away, he throws the dagger and says that it is not difficult to understand. And this wall is relatively simple, so at that moment he is still training with Odin, and he says that he wants to kill someone. Then Odin asks if that was a threat, and he says no, saying that he is the one who will die. And at that Ragnar asks what they are doing, asking if he is training resistance to torture. Then Ring questions if it is that difficult. He says that this is how it is done, being in the middle. But at that moment Jackson talks to the squad leader, talking about the next turn, but then when he sees all 5 crazy people are in some kind of supernatural tune with their craziness, and Ren says that he just has to stretch hard, while Ragnar says that if he can't even do that, he will need to train his flexibility too. And Odin talks about his lazy partners, saying that this territory is theirs, then says that they can get out, and Jackson, seeing that, almost doesn't believe this shit, and asks him who that guy is, because they are just training, and the protagonist thinks he needs to find a way to block the dagger he's going to throw, and says that its accuracy and speed aren't the same as other daggers. But while he's drawing that on the ground, Jackson arrives and asks if that's a whistling dagger, and the protagonist asks if that's what it's called, and Jackson says it's because of the sound it makes when it's thrown, and if used well, the target will never know what hit them, so it's best to stay away from those things. So the protagonist thinks he'll remember about it, saying that no matter how good he is at throwing, he wonders what he could do if he blocks at the right time, and so he punches them both again and Bio dodges again, and in that, he thinks he noticed. But the protagonist grabs him and puts him in front of him, thinking he'll find a way to stop those idiots from using him as a shield to protect themselves from the dagger. But in that moment, he ends up hearing the sound and is hit before he can put Bio in front. But in the same way, Bio is also hit by something in his back, and it turns out that even Jack, who was getting up, is killed. And the protagonist thinks that he threw 3 at the same time, and so that half fairy smiles while saying his sentence. And the protagonist realizes that he will kill his own allies if they get in the way, or he never thought of them as an ally. And so the half fairy goes to him, saying that that was admirable. But the persistent lover never forgets his target. While looking at the protagonist, then the protagonist says that this is good, and so the half fairy questions if he is joking on the verge of death, saying that he is very strange, taking that dagger and sticking it even more, and the protagonist says that he admits, saying that he underestimated the whole situation, and so he cuts him, killing him, and he says that that wall is still a wall. So Karen in the 5th of Hell notices that the protagonist is enjoying this, telling him to laugh while he can, because the despair that awaits at the end of joy is the reason for this being a curse. Worse than now that I thought that the biggest wall he can face will be death by natural causes. Imagine him dying in his sleep, waking up and dying at the end of the day every day. He won't have anything to do and will stay in this loop forever. And so the protagonist comes back waking up in his bed once again, thinking about what Karen said, saying that no, this is not a curse, but a blessing. And he goes to Jackson asking him to tell him about the whistling dagger, and he questions where the captain got it from, but Anchorage asks if that would help him in the explanation, so he gives up, saying that they are multiple thin blades compressed into just one, and that is what makes the whistling sound when it is thrown. At some point, it was called a dagger and can only be heard, and it is very difficult to follow it with the human eye, so he questions what he would do if he wanted to see and dodge it. But Jackson says that he cannot, but he questions what he would do if he needed to. So Jackson asks if he needs to. Then protagonist reveals that he does need to, so he thinks he is doing it again, asking how he even heard about it, and he says that there is no point in finding a dagger that has already been thrown, and he needs to observe the thrower's hand, saying that the path it will take is decided the moment it is thrown, and there is a way to hide the way you throw it, but it is not difficult to notice when you know what it is. And he asks Jackson if he thinks he can learn this technique, but he says not the way he throws it. And the protagonist notices that they all continue to tease him while talking discreetly, and Jackson asks if he wants him to teach him how to throw daggers. Then he notices that he has arrived at the exact point, being surprised that he offered to teach him first, asking why, but he says that the protagonist can refuse if he is not very confident. But Anchorage says he will learn, and after a while he returns to that same scene, walking with Jack and Bo, and he remembers what Jackson said, saying that the moment he throws it, he must relax his whole body, and then focus as the blade leaves his hand, and watch him dodge. It is the same thing, and in that close to, where he always punches Jack and Bo in the face, he ends up cutting Jack's neck, and Bo is surprised by this, and he also kills him, and that same woman who screams when the protagonist is dying, screams calling him a murderer. Then the murderer appears, and the protagonist remembers that he must observe his opponent, and he sees the MILF's hand coming out from under his hobby, with that dagger in his hand, and he thinks that he must change from relaxed to focused, thinking that he can avoid dying right away, protect himself from his heart, thinking that he must observe the tip of his hand. However, when he hears the noise, that dagger was already stuck in his arm, and he feels a lot of pain looking at that. But then he is hit in the heart, thinking that it was very fast, and it was for a mere second, but he managed to see, speaking here of that mere second, a glow moved, and he managed to observe, saying that he is sure. So as the guy gets close to him, he even tries to say his catchphrase, but the protagonist says he knows, that he never forgets his target, and Milfada asks how he knew. The protagonist says that just a few more times then he will succeed, looking at Milfada's face, saying that he will see himself soon. Then he says that he will know all his tricks. In yet another regression, he thinks he has to be as fast as he can, quickly stalking Jack and killing Bo next, and as they kill these two, they scream that there is a murderer. And the protagonist enters the zone, saying that he doesn't, that's more the kind of person who dreams of being the best. And so he notices the dagger in the half-elf's hand, and he's throwing it using only one finger. And Angrid thinks he can have whatever he wants if he tries hard, and so, while the assassin throws it, Angrid manages to hold it in his arm, moving in front of him. Then the assassin holds another one on his finger, throwing it again, but the protagonist says he's going to attack from the front, so he thinks he's going to dodge to the side, but the assassin throws it again, and he realizes that it was a trick, so he gets hit and falls. He thinks thinks he can adapt according to his movements, and thinks that this weapon is so cool that he wants to have one too. And in another regression, he starts using a weapon like that, trying to hit an apple, and Jackson asks what he's doing, and the protagonist says he's practicing with the whistling dagger, but Jackson notices that it's not even a whistling dagger, and he says that soon he'll have one of his own true, smiling while spinning it on his finger. But then one of the parts of the dagger ends up breaking, and the blade passes very close to Jackson's ear, and he just stays quiet while the tension is really high. So the protagonist is already on the 8th day that he is returning, and so this time he manages to dodge the whistling dagger of that assassin and thinks that he will not fall for his tricks again. But then he is hit from behind and realizes that that guy was there for that, and on the 9th day today he ends up killing that guy who was up there. And my elf says that he looked away attacking the protagonist, and so he once again needs to return. And on another day today he manages to hit an apple that is in Jackson's hand, surprising him. Then when he looks to the side, the protagonist says that the arms and hands are to guide the dagger and the body should be used to throw it, asking Jackson what he is doing wrong, and he says that this must be the enough, asking where he learned to throw daggers, and so he says it was precisely with him. But Ingrid cannot reveal that, and says he saw a person throwing in a fight, so he tried to copy, and so he notices that he reached that level just by looking, wondering if he would be a genius or something like that. But then he asks if he has ever heard of the blade throwing technique, so he says it was created by a man named Georg, and he was an assassin, and that name was given because of his weapon, the whistling dagger, and he says that guy really wanted to create a silent dagger made with a thin-bladed knife, but it was too difficult to handle, which led to the whistle dagger that they know today. So the protagonist says he didn't know there was a story behind it, and Jackson questions about it because he thought he wanted one because of that, but he asks how so, and Jackson says it's because he dares a perfect posture for her. And so on the 10th day, when he meets with Jack and Boa, he says he's going to patrol somewhere else, and Jack asks how come, because they sent them to the market that day, saying they'll end up getting scolded, but he says he has a higher rank among everyone there, and he'll take responsibility by calling them, and Jack wonders what they should do, with Boa saying they should follow him for now. And so the protagonist thinks the market is the perfect place for assassins to set up a plan, and he doesn't need to fall into their games again, and so they ask Ankles, saying they think they should go back. But then he asks what Jack gained by betraying, asking if it would be the Krona, and they notice that they found out, saying that they are going to kill him. But the protagonist easily manages to kill both of them, and so he watches what is happening, with both that shooter and the assassin getting close to him, and they don't like the situation very much, and so he says that they are late, telling him to get inside. Then the assassin throws 3 of those daggers in the direction of the protagonist. Then he says that it doesn't matter as long as he sees his hands throwing, but then the other assassin is behind him. But the protagonist hits him with a dagger in the middle of the forehead with a beautiful throw, and so the assassin says that he looked away trying to hit the protagonist, but then he manages to stop it with his arm calmly, and when he looks at the assassin, he is more drunk than ever, so he asks who the hell he is, and the protagonist says that that guy doesn't need to know, taking that dagger that whistles as he moves it, and he takes the opportunity to ask the half-fairy how many of those he still has. Man, the psychopath knows how to be drunk, right man? That's absurd. And with the half-fairy noticing that he knows how to use that, he wonders if the protagonist is also a killer, and then answers Ingrid's question, saying that he has 2 more, and he says that it's jealousy, saying that he only has 1, and then he says that he still has the nerve to joke around, saying that the protagonist must be crazy. After all, he should have known that the target is the dead man as soon as he throws that, and the protagonist says that's good, saying that they'll only find out when they really fill up. And so he grabs both the sword and that dagger, and he says that he may have hidden his hands, but he can't hide his entire arm, and keeping direct vision with him and dodging is the key to dodging his daggers. And so as he grabs that dagger with his finger and starts spinning, he notices that there will be 2 at once, becoming more and more focused to the point of not even blinking. And so when the assassin throws it, he manages to dodge both at the same time, but then when he throws his, the assassin also dodges, and the protagonist can certainly see that he has more than 2, so he ends up taking another one that he had saved and throws it at the assassin, and so he almost gets hit, but manages to get out of the way. Then he says that he lied, calling him a wretch, but the protagonist says that he also lied, and with the assassin taking his sword, he questions if now is something that he has not seen until now, because he even knows that there is an unspoken rule that assassins can only use long-range attacks, and he thinks that that movement is strange. Then he also notices that he is coming quickly towards him. Noticing that it is a new attack, the assassin goes after the protagonist with everything, but Ingrid thinks that it does not matter, holding the assassin's hand very calmly, and he ends up realizing that he did very badly, getting a pissed off face, and the protagonist thinks that this is the end for him, throwing a sword at that horrible goblet, killing him beautifully. And he thinks that he had to go through 10 attempts, and he had to try to duel against him 10 times to be able to win, making a loop of fighting, losing, being stronger, and winning. And he says that this is incredible. While looking at the assassin fallen on the ground, then he sees that he had even more of those blades. and takes them all for himself. And after that he will doth report and asks if he was almost killed, and on top of that he managed to tell them all to flee from there. But the protagonist says no, saying that it was just a coincidence. And the fairy questions if this is a coincidence, saying that the coincidence is fighting against for people and having few injuries. He just says that the goddess of luck must be on his side. Then she gets a little puzzled while looking into his eyes and says that he is right, asking him to return to his post. So he agrees while leaving the place and says that he returned to Rain, but his axe almost hits the protagonist's face and he ends up noticing that he dodged a surprise attack. And he questions if by chance Rain is crazy because he almost killed him, and he says that now there is a murderer on his tail and says that he better always be alert. So he tells him to eat that, throwing the hot stone to Rain, and he is all happy. However, the protagonist notices that his hair is a little long and talks to Kraz, asking him to cut his hair, and he charges 10 coppers. But the protagonist says he will only give 5, but Zayoto plays the neither me nor you card, charging only 8 coppers. And so he goes to do his hair, and the protagonist says that now he is asking for more, asking if he can no longer get a discount. And Zayoto says that if he thinks it is bad, he will have to go look for a cut in the city, and he says he does not want to go there because they are all terrible. And so Zayoto, while cutting, notices that it is now very cold and snowing, and Rain, freezing to death, starts to say that it is shit powdered by the devil, and everyone agrees. But the order says that this is a test from God, and the protagonist wonders why everyone is there around him, and he starts to wonder how a murderer got past a border guard, saying that when Jack and Boy enrolled and returned, and also notices that there is someone working for them, and the protagonist questions if he knows where the 3 who died are, and Zayoto says that Jack was exiled after being caught stealing, and Boy released a noble, and so Rain says he was a nice guy. But Zayoto says that Rolton was a mercenary from a bankrupt merchant association, and they all joined last year and must have been in the same guild together. And the protagonist thinks about a guild that expelled its members a year ago, saying that there is one that comes to mind, saying that it is the Thieves Guild, the guild that lives up to its name. It only has shitty thieves, and a member of that guild must be the way in and out of that city, so it makes sense that they are from it. He asks Jackson if he knows anything about this guild, and he asks why he is questioning him, and he states that he thought he knew. And Jackson begins to notice that he has become very brazen, and says that after they rebuilt themselves, his contact within the guild disappeared, and he doesn't know anything anymore. And with that, Zayoto ends his cut, with Ren saying that it's much better than before, and so the protagonist can see his own eyes again, and says that it's starting to snow more now. And Jackson says that he'll be on guard in the city that night, and Ren starts to curse him, saying that he knows that he wants to shovel all that snow, telling him not to dare do that. Then the protagonist asks why they don't go on a mission, and says that if they agree, no one will need to shovel snow, and so Ren says that he'll go right now. And Jackson agrees that it's a good idea, saying that he's in, and so Zayoto says that he'll go too, and the protagonist realizes that even he hates shoveling snow. And in that he says he still needs to ask permission to the commander, but Rania notices that he hasn't done it yet, calling him slow, and Eldon asks him to go ask now. And he says that those guys are completely different from normal, and so he goes to the ferry, telling her that he suspects that the Thieves Guild is helping the assassins, and that's why he wants to ambush them, and he says that he went there to ask her permission to do so, and she continues watching him, looking deep into his eyes, and ends up noticing that he's definitely going to do all of this because he doesn't want to remove the snow, and he says no, being very serious, and ends up noticing that the woman is very intelligent. Man, I definitely didn't expect humor in this Manhwa. And already on the way to the mission, they ask where this Thieves Guild came from, and Zayoto asks if he's talking about the Gilfini Guild, asking if he has any information about them, and the protagonist says he doesn't, that's why they're there. And he talks to Jackson, saying that they're going away to the tavern, asking him to find out where they are, and Jackson asks how he's going to do that, and the protagonist simply tells him to give him his poles. Then Zayoto wonders what kind of order that is, and worst of all is that Jackson simply complies with the order, and Zayoto finds it strange, wondering if the stranger there is him. And already at Vanessa's Pumpkin Soup Tavern, everyone sits down to eat, and Zayoto questions if the Gilfini Guild is innocent, and he says that even if they are not involved with the assassins, they are still criminals, and it's time to deal with them. But Zayoto keeps thinking about it, asking a lot to wait, and she questions what he needs. Then the boy says something in her ear, leaving the protagonist curious, but then he also notices that Jackson is taking a long time, saying that even if they are talking about him, it's kind of strange that there is no sign yet. This makes him question if his orders were too vague, because he is feeling bad for him, and so Jackson, in turn, is on the roof above the houses, standing and observing, and he stays there for so long that he almost freezes, but over time he ends up noticing something, seeing suspicious people, and so he talks to Kras, asking if he knows that woman, and he says that she is lazy, her father is a shoemaker, and her dream is to open a tavern in the capital, and he ends up noticing noticing that Sayoto knows a lot of things, and he simply says that all the beautiful women will be his future clients. Meanwhile, Jackson returns to the protagonist, saying that he found their location, and they are surprised to see him riding in the snow. And he is also surprised because he received that shitty order while they were warm and eating comfortably. So the protagonist simply tells him to eat, but Jackson says that it is not necessary and asks what they are waiting for, telling them to go quickly. But Ren refuses, saying that it's too cold to go out, and Jackson asks if he wants him to bathe his body with his own blood, saying that he'll be warm right away. Then the protagonist says that he also wants to go now, but his mobility will be worse because of the snow, and they need to be careful, so they'll go when it stops snowing. But when looking outside, he realizes that it certainly won't stop, and realizes that there won't be any other way, telling them to go now. But Sayoto starts to question his previous order, and the protagonist says that they will be careful enough now. And so as they walk with Ren shaking all over, they end up passing by a man who appears to be a beggar, but he still pulls out a dagger trying to kill the protagonist. But Ren takes off his entire cloak, going after those guys without giving them much of a chance, killing them quickly, hitting one in the head with the axe and catching the other after punching him. And he asks Sayoto if they are his friends, and he says that they must be from the Giffen Guild. And Jackson in turn finds the hiding place where they were sitting, and says that they were most likely the guards, but he wonders if it is locked. And so Odin asks for permission, saying that he will knock to see if anyone answers, and simply prepares a big punch, breaking the thing with only his hands, calling them to come in. And so Ren asks if he knows the meaning of knocking on the door, but the protagonist says that at least the door opened, and Ren then questions what they are going to ask them first. Place, and the protagonist says he'll see about that later, and they'll suppress them with their power first. And so as they enter, the people inside that little door are questioning if the squad leader is there, and they say that's what they heard, and reporting that they couldn't make any progress will be sad. And so their leader thinks that they should be able to manage with everyone who's inside, and they keep wondering if everything's okay, since his squad mates are also coming. But then, the leader questions who cares, but I'm absolutely sure that changes when Odin simply breaks down the door with just a kick, giving it a tap-tap, and he realizes that shit went wrong. And Ren says he's going to kill everyone, but the protagonist starts saying that all those who didn't kill the weak, and all those who prefer to be arrested rather than die, should drop their weapons and pass through that line, and he states that whoever doesn't do this will die. But then Ren asks if they won't kill them all first, but the protagonist says he changed his mind, and wonders if he wasn't too cool now. Crazy guy looks like a kid who went to PCK, bro, just 8th grade syndrome. And so the leader of those bandits says that the protagonist is an idiot, asking if he thinks he can give them orders, and Odin says that what seems like their judgment is very wrong, saying that they won't listen if they don't use brute force. So he says that they will start forcing them to listen, asking who is the strongest among them, and the leader says that this will be funny, saying that the one behind him is his strongest swordsman, Wyvern, asking him to fight the protagonist, and so he says yes, and wonders if he will be able to block his sword, since he has never been defeated during his life, and goes all out against the protagonist, full of swagger, attacking and screaming. But the protagonist simply deflects his sword, throwing it away, and then sticks the sword in his shoulder, noticing that guy was using Valen's mercenary fencing, striking while talking, saying that he suffered from this before. But then the cocky leader starts to sweat, saying that if that one is the strongest, he doesn't even need to see the rest. And with him falling on the ground, he says that this is the last chance, telling them to surrender, or else they will die. And so everyone behind the protagonist starts to notice that he is trying to act like a badass now. Man, the face of the protagonist squad is really absurd, and with that totally embarrassing scene there, the enemies really drop their weapons, and the first of them surrenders, and so the leader calls him coward, trying to hit the guy. But then the protagonist throws that howling dagger at his head, killing the guy right there. And seeing that scene, Ren starts to stew inside, because for a second he just thought the protagonist was really cool, saying that this is shit. And then Eldon says that he was really cool, while Sayoto thinks the same thing. And Jackson notices that it wasn't bad at all, while Ragnar also stews. And the protagonist in turn is also really thinking that this must have been really cool, and so they all surrender, asking him not to kill them. And Ren questions him now, saying that it would be better to kill him right away than to have to deal with him later. But then they start to beg for their lives, saying that there are people with sick mothers around there. But then the protagonist says that this doesn't justify their crimes, but he says that if he has to kill someone, he should kill him. And a single Gilfin, he questions if he is Gilfin of the Guild Gilfin, questioning if the one who died wasn't the boss. Yes, him. And he says no, saying that that guy was the boss. But then he questions if that wasn't Gilfin, but he says no, that one over there is Gilfin. The protagonist doesn't understand anything. And Sayoto says that they name guilds after random people on purpose, and if they start to be persecuted by the law, they blame that person and run away. And the protagonist, bald, says that that bastard, actually his boss, was a terrible person, but the rest of them aren't, so if he really has to kill someone, he should kill him instead. But then everyone tells Gilfin not to do it, because Gilfin is very kind, saying that it was Gilfin who took care of his sick mother, saying that they will take care of him if he hurts them. Then they start asking to be killed instead of Gilfin, and Ren asks if he is really going to kill them after all this, saying no, he chose to because he is a demon heartless. But the protagonist says that he was the one who had suggested killing them. Then Gilfin talks about the guild's fortune, saying that he will give them everything if they let them live. And behind the protagonist, Sayuto starts to smile. And so Gilfin says that most of the fortune isn't that safe, but they need to find the key that the shitty dead man hid. But with Odin there, that's certainly not a problem, because he gently moves the door, pulling out all the screws. And the fortune has just been released to all of them, and Gilfin notices that it looks like they don't need it, and the protagonist tells them all to go ahead. And Ren is all happy that there's heat healing around there, and so they go picking up several swords and several things. And the protagonist also finds something he wants, noticing that it was a flexible but resistant heat armor, saying that it's not bad at all, saying that he will keep it. Then Sayuto talks to the squad leader, asking the protagonist to take over the guild, but then he asks if he's asking him to become a thief, and he says yes, but one that doesn't kill, and says that even if they wipe out this guild, in less than a month, another one would appear to take its place. And thinking about it, they're just going to use that guy as a puppet to lead that guild. And so the protagonist thinks that this all seems very convenient, asking if it was at that time, and he questions if Sayuto said anything to that girl, saying that they're there for some reason, and he asks if he noticed, but says that anyway they took them all at once, and says that if he lets him, he'll give him a payment in krona every month, and he'll also gather information. And the protagonist thinks that he doesn't particularly want krona, but money wouldn't be bad. And he says he allows it, and Sayuto gets all cocky-tacky to Gilfin, saying that from now on, they are the guild of thieves who don't kill, and they will take out the bad apples and send them to prison, while slowly working to reform the organization. But in this, Gilfin says that if they don't disband, it's possible that they will all end up dead. But then he asks why, and Gilfin says that just like he said, the boss who died worked for Aspen and received from them, and he says that a frog comes every spring and fall to check on the guild. And if they realize what happened, that frog monster will kill them all. But Sayuto says that this isn't really a problem, because they have their monsters that are even worse. So Ren asks if he wants to repeat that, and the protagonist says that if they already got what they wanted, they will go back. But then Ren looks at him seriously, asking if he thinks they finished removing the snow. So the protagonist realizes that it's better to wait a little longer there, and Ragnar starts to think that they have some tasks unfinished around there, and whatever they are, they want to reflect and preach the word of God a little more. While Jackson says that he has something he needs to do now, so he'll come back tomorrow morning. And the protagonist says that he had no idea they were so busy, and everyone sleeps peacefully there around the campfire. And returning to the camp, he reports to the ferry about the return of all the squad members, saying that they located and destroyed the Thieves Guild. And the ferry asks if he had fun while skipping the task of removing the snow, and he says that he has no idea what she's talking about, and notices that she knows too much, and that she changes the subject, saying that she heard that he doesn't refuse a duel, and he says that he does normally. So she calls him to practice, and he says that of course, but he wonders if that would be a duel and not a punishment, because he thought she was angry, and so she almost throws him away, running her sword through his leg, and he falls hard to the ground. Then she tells him to stand up, and he grabs the sword, but ends up falling again, and he wonders what this is, because her sword has always been so thin, and it's almost like a whip, and she keeps telling him to stand up, while he can't do anything without his sword. So he falls on his back, while she thinks she's already heard him reacting instantly, almost as if he knows the future. But now it seems like he's blind, saying that he really doesn't know who he is as a person. But it's still true that he broke the spell and killed for assassins. Then she says that she is again, saying that she'd be watching, and he notices that it was because of the snow, thinking that this is pathetic, because even though he trained non-stop with the sword, he never did anything, only with his hand, and now he realized what he's missing, something that he needs to use his body and limbs, and he thinks they are martial arts, remembering Odin the Brave. And look at the shape of the animal, wow, and it can be worn in clothes, huh? And in that, he goes as far as Odin, which is training, lifting a tree trunk, and he says that one of the most basic things in martial arts is a trained body, and he says this while throwing that gigantic trunk on the ground. And the protagonist looks at it in disbelief, while Henser is asking who threw that tree out of nowhere. And so, Odin says that he has a training method, but he questions about that tree. And Odin says that it demands the extreme from his body, and he says that this method is called the isolation method, saying that it will be painful, and he can consider himself a dead man. So the protagonist thinks that this is his specialty. So, Odin makes him carry a gigantic stone on his back while he does the step, and he thinks he's going to die. And Odin says that the fundamental principle of the isolation technique is overload, and he says that your muscles get stronger when they're torn to pieces. And so, the protagonist almost dies crushed by that, and he tells him to stay like that for 10 seconds, saying that he can do it, and says that he knows the protagonist's limits better than he does himself. But then the protagonist asks how he would know that, and Odin remains there by his side, and Odin asks if he doesn't already regret having done that before, saying that he needs to improve his body much more before he really starts his martial arts training, and if he had started earlier, everything would have moved forward. But the protagonist says that he has no time for regrets, saying that the past is past, and his focus is on the present, and if it weren't, he would never have gotten through his first today, and so he asks him to teach him while he's in that position. And so Odin questions how can someone be so diligent, saying that his ethics are uncheckable, and says that he respects him, then smiles, saying that now they will go to the next step, saying that he will return to the position of 4. And so, while he is holding 3 more stones of that on his back, and so the cat starts to get scared, while the protagonist screams. And Theoden tells him to hold on tight, saying that he can do it. Then he makes him hold the stones in his hands while keeping them extended, and he suffers a lot with that training, and the panther starts to observe that. And at night he arrives dead at the accommodation, falling at the door. Then Ren asks if there is someone messing with him, questioning why he always comes back so exhausted, and the protagonist, trembling like Arverdi, says that he was training normally. And with that, the panther goes to him to lie down with the protagonist, and Ren asks if he is going to stay with her, asking why he doesn't just give her a name, and he thinks about it, saying that she is warm, so he will call her Hottie. But Panther doesn't like that shit at all, and he invents another name, saying that since she has blue eyes, she would be Ngwinhathul. But Panther apparently doesn't like that so much, and Ren questions if he hates her, saying that those names are practically animal cruelty, and the protagonist is devastated because Ngwinhathul should be cute, and he says that he will have to think a little more about the name, especially if she is going to stay. And so he lies down, starting to sleep, and in his dream, he appears in a beautiful blue field, wondering what that is. Then he sees the Aurora Borealis, wondering if it is a dream, saying that he is not seeing the boatman, but thinks that probably that place is not really his vibe. And when he looks back, he sees someone there, and then that woman looks directly into his eyes and talks about Stir, saying that his name is this. And so, when he wakes up, he notices something strange, because there is a woman sleeping with him, and apparently that woman was the panther. And the protagonist says goodnight to her while continuing to hug her, and she gets all silly while he hugs her. Seriously, I'm starting to think this is haunting me, man. I'm starting to think this is haunting me. There's no animal that doesn't turn into a girl. So the next morning, when he gets ready to leave, Ren asks if he's going again. He says he's going to train. He asks if the protagonist isn't hurt from yesterday, and he says that in fact, his body is very light. Esther says she's sure he is. After all, she used magic on him, and says she needs him to free herself from her curse. So Ren asks if he met the priest last year or something. He says no, and in fact he dreamed about a woman. But Ren says he didn't imagine he would be the kind of guy who would have that kind of dream, asking what kind of woman it was. Then he remembers of every detail of her, saying that she was beautiful. And so Esther just lowers her head, saying that at least his eyes are not a problem, and it is natural for wizards to endlessly explore magic and mysticism. On her journey for knowledge, she ended up being cursed and turned into a beast, and her powers were sealed. While she was walking through the fields one day, attracted by the smell of a curse, she found that man, and since then she has been receiving, and already with Odin, he says that it is unbelievable, because normally it takes a whole week for a broken body to recover, but he is already stronger than yesterday, and in this one he continues to train very calmly. But when he turns his eyes to Panther, he calls her Blue Blackie again, but she gets very angry talking about that idiot. However, he calls her Esther, asking since when she started watching, and she says that the world of magic is affected by the power of names, and if she is imprudently called by another name, her powers will weaken even more. And she used the little power she had left to tell him his name, but she ended up making a mistake while doing so. But thank God he is very tense. And he also thinks that he is certainly under a curse, but it is not complete yet, but it is more powerful than his curse, a powerful curse that slowly devours the curses around it. And if she stays by his side, at some point, she will recover her powers. And so, as he continues training with Odin, he already starts to put a little more strength, enough to not be thrown far by Odin. But then he tries to knee the protagonist, who manages to get out of the way, but in this he goes straight to jujitsu, and manages to put his back on the ground. And so he says that for martial artists, your body needs to be ready, just like the sword for a swordsman, and all of this is useless if he is not fast. And he says that the protagonist is still slow as a turtle, but his body is definitely changing, saying that the protagonist really does not know when he existed. And so he says that May's passed in the blink of an eye, and new green fields are appearing in place of the snow, and he spent his days busy with training, so he trains with both Odin and Ren, almost hitting him. And so he says that the protagonist has improved. and they can finally fight like men, getting even more excited. And so in the afternoon after eating, he talks to Ragnar, calling him to train to make up for the meal, and he says he's still eating. But after training, the protagonist is on the floor with Ragnar, saying that his adaptability is still flawed, but his fundamentals are perfect now, and he could do this with muscle memory, even while sleeping, saying that he will need to repeat this countless times, and it will be difficult. But in this subject, the protagonist is already an expert, and at night he says that training with his squad is very good, but real experiences would be very good too. But he hears a noise, and Jackson attacks out of nowhere, but the protagonist manages to grab his dagger, and he says that he will not die in an ambush anymore, saying that he has really improved. And in this, Yahello says that they should go outside if they are going to train, because they are raising dust, and so he says that he arrived early, asking if he shouldn't be earning money, but apparently he has his plan to stay rich, because when the panther gets up, he starts wanting to find some cloth she left, saying that it's worth 10,000 kronas. And the protagonist doesn't know if he's predisposed or hardworking until someone knocks on the door, and it's that elf. So she tells the squad leader to go with her, but he says that there's no more snow, and she tells him to stop joking around, saying that she has a new mission, and he should get it from the mercenary soldier board, and he thinks about it, saying that it's a directive that comes along with the soldier ranking system, and it's a directive that allows people in the city to hire soldiers as mercenaries, and he says that it's cheaper than real mercenaries, and there are better trained people, and they're more polite, and that's why it's very popular, and he wanted to test it, and that's great. While the guard thinks that his shift is finally over, he ends up getting a fright, seeing Commander Fod Wonkard, and he asks her how many she's going to need, and she says that there will be 3 in total, asking him to bring a member of the squad with him, and says that she herself will be the 3rd, so he is surprised, asking if she is really going to do that, asking why, and then he notices that those two are often together, so it is suspicious, and hears that those two dueled each other too, asking if there is something going on between them, saying that maybe they are dating. But in the meantime, she asks what is that ugly face, asking if he finds it uncomfortable to go on a mission with her, and at that moment, the gossiper who is nearby finds gold with those words, and so asks if they heard that, because the company commander breaks his spells, apparently they are together, and they were sure that something was going on. They were together even before joining the army, and everyone starts to make up a lot of gossip, even saying that the two already have children. And the next morning, while the protagonist trains, they start talking about him, asking if he managed to catch a fairy with that face, saying that they have their respect for him. But some of them say that they even make a good couple, and the protagonist almost doesn't believe what he's hearing. And when he returns to his platoon, Ren starts to make fun of him, saying that the daddy has arrived, asking how many months he has, because he heard that the baby is going to be born, and so he says that Ren heard wrong, and it's all misunderstood, and everything is nothing more than a rumor. But Yudo tells him not to is shy, because sooner or later they would find out, but the protagonist keeps denying it, and so Ragnar says that it is good, telling him to stay with her, and then she will train him. Then Odin says that he will pray for his future, but he questions how so, because he feels like they are making a fool of him. And Ren asks when the meeting will be, because it will be weird having him stand by, but the protagonist asks if he is talking about the mission, saying that Ren is not going, and he is surprised by this, asking who is going then, and he says that it will be Jackson, who is already ready. And Ren does not take this very well, asking if it will be that damn cat instead of him, asking if by chance they took an axe to his head, and he says that he would be the first to do that to the commissioner if he got pissed. So he does not go, and Jackson asks if he is taking him, because he thinks he will not cause problems, and he says that he often takes on missions too, and thought he would be a good help. Then he asks her to give him some advice, telling him not to share his heart too much with a woman, because he will end up getting hurt in the end. Wow. The beast pulled the red one from the Matrix. Then the protagonist very seriously says he doesn't need that advice. Then the 3 of them get together, and he asks when the commissioner will arrive, and she says it will be soon, and he thinks that she probably hasn't heard the rumors yet, thinking it will be weird. But then she talks to Ingrid, asking if they did something to make people think they have children together, so he seriously says no, while Jackson starts to laugh, and he questions if that was a laugh, and he says he has no idea what he is talking about. But the protagonist says he heard the laugh, but the fairy asks him again if her questions make him uncomfortable, and he says no. Then she asks if that makes him happy, and he says no. Yes, maybe. And she asks what he liked, and he doesn't have much to say, and if he asks why she is asking him these things. But then the commissioner ends up arriving while he is in the bad blanket, and she starts to say that he arrived just when it was getting fun, and the protagonist is faced with this woman asking how his fun is, wondering if that was a joke with that expression. And so it is said that the mission was to protect the son of a rich merchant, and in the process of deciding which of the 2 heirs of the trading company, Hog and Fried, will become the next owner, they were hired to ensure that they do not hurt each other, and the protagonist claims to have thought that the heir was a greedy frog, but in fact it is a very beautiful girl, and and she says that her name is Leona, heiress of the company, and says that it is a pleasure to meet them. 3 out of 3. Look, there was an animal that became a girl. He is gathering a lot of women around him, and apparently the protagonist is getting really strong. This is becoming a recurring thing. As they walk with the caravan, a maid goes to talk to Leona, and the protagonist thinks that no one has said anything since they first met, and the little communication they have is done through her maid, and the maid says that they will get a room at the first inn and wait for the other heirs. And the protagonist says that they really want to go there as an escort and nothing more, and he remembers Odin talking about age, body posture, positioning, gaze. All of this is valuable information, and he says that understanding the enemy's strategy can be considered a skill, and so he thinks that he should observe and analyze, thinking that the guard in front of him is the left-handed one. And her space is heavy, and she is with heavy weaponry, thinking that her sword tells him that she is quite strong, and none of them seem to be as strong as a special rank, and that analysis has some flaws, but he thinks that will do for now. And at that, Jackson talks to him, saying that if they are bored, how about a game? And he says that they will identify sounds, and Jackson starts talking about the paper bag being crumpled, with the protagonist talking about a woman in front of a food stall, and Jackson continues recognizing a hammer sound, with the protagonist seeing a blacksmith. Then he notices a tongue clicking, and says that he took a while, saying that it is coming from a man near the shoe store. And the protagonist thinks that the objective of this game is to locate and identify the source of the sounds. And it is harder than it seems, so the left-handed knight tells him that they will get an upstairs room, and says that they can stay there, and the fairy says that she finds what they are doing interesting, and says that she wants to do it too. And the protagonist thinks, I'm going to say, that fairies are much more sensitive compared to humans, and they continue to recognize all the sounds around them. However, Jackson and the fairy are much more sensitive than the protagonist, and he claims that they can't even participate. However, as they continue talking, he thinks that the problem is that it doesn't seem like a game anymore, and so they say that there is someone after Jackson, but he manages to kill Isley along with the fairy, who also defends herself. And he says that he suspected an ambush, and she claims that it was that too, and they notice that they are assassins. However, the protagonist manages to kill some of them easily, and he says that the commissioner is the priority. However, as he goes up the stairs to go to her, a man throws some daggers in the direction of the protagonist, but Jackson calmly defends himself, and the fairy continues killing them very ferociously, and the assassins begin to wonder why they are so strong. But his friend tells him not to worry, as they are in greater numbers, but Jackson begins to dilute their numbers quite easily, and the fairy, seeing that, thinks that the members of the protagonist squad are much stronger than himself, but they all listen to him and trust him, wondering who helped create this, thinking it's interesting, and continues killing them all easily. While the protagonist goes up and goes after the commissioner, he says that after finding the assassin who went after Krang, and recently the half-fairy assassin, attacks like those are not a problem for him. He questions himself where he thinks he is going, while the man tries to stab them by surprise. And the protagonist remembers that Odin said he is too slow, but he can already react, giving the guy a huge blessing by throwing him away, and he says that his movements are completely different now. And in that, while he defeats that man, that girl flies out of Leona's room, and inside another assassin tries to kill both the girl and the maid, giving glory to Aspen, but the maid stands in front to give her life to her mistress, and so the protagonist says that he is too close for the whistling daggers, and he cannot guarantee that he will stop, wondering if he could reach him if he tried. So he thinks that a way to get closer quickly is one that he has seen before, thinking about that night. Protagonist, who accelerated in an unbelievable way, and he says that imitating perfectly is impossible at his level, but if he can replicate just a little in her, he will be able to do something. And he really accelerates in such a way as to get to the two girls before the assassin. So with this movement, he manages to put himself in front of the attack, protecting both, and his cover is cut and a cloak underneath it is revealed, and he thinks that the impact of the blade hurts, but he was not hurt thanks to Gilfine's leather armor. And he asks the assassin why they don't talk downstairs, and so he grabs him and throws him out the window, and falling down there, the assassin almost dies. And the protagonist thinks that it's good that he managed to cushion the fall with his body. Besides, there are no more enemies from the second floor, and that guy over there, he must have hurt himself in the fall, thinking that he is brave, and the man takes out two swords, calling the protagonist crazy, asking if he is a border guard, but he says no, and the man says he doesn't see why he wouldn't be able to defeat him. And the protagonist thinks that the two swords in his hand are of different sizes, but he didn't lose his balance, beginning to suppose that he dares the art of the fluid sword, asking how he should respond to that. And so the man says that he will first kill him and then destroy that woman, but Anchorage asks him if anyone has ever told him he talks too much, calling him out. And as the assassin leaves, the protagonist thinks it's his first real fight in a while, and he seems to be strong enough, wondering what he should try first. As he watches watches the assassin approaching, he notices that he is using two sword styles from tandem, basically a duet of Valheim. And so, when the man tries to hit him, the protagonist manages to dodge beautifully, but then with another sword. The man continues to attack him, but he keeps dodging, so he tries to hit the protagonist's foot, but he manages to jump back. While the assassin gains momentum to attack the protagonist with a thrust, he manages to dodge by going behind him. Then the assassin is totally shocked by the speed of Anchorage appearing behind him, and he wonders if he dodged everything, especially this random guy. And so the protagonist says he is impressed, because he couldn't learn this because of his lack of talent. He thinks that with his speed and precision, he seems to be as good as the dagger pervert. And the guy with the beard asks what he is talking about, going after the protagonist again, but then he activates his zone and can see all that action on camera. Slowly, he realizes something, noticing that that is the path of his attack, seeing where he is going to do and what he is going to attack. Then the protagonist simply moves his sword in the exact path to hit his neck. He says that he tried to hit his heart, but he still has a lot to improve, thinking that he needs to practice with Ragnar or maybe Jackson. So when he falls, everyone starts to retreat, and the protagonist thinks he needs to get them all. But Jackson says that their fight drew a lot of attention. However, he says that those guys are running away, and he says that they are even while he stands still, and Ingrid asks if he is not going after them. But Jackson says that they were not hired to chase criminals. They ran away, so their commissioner must be safe now. And the protagonist realizes that then he wants to focus only on the mission. And so the fairy tells the protagonist that he did not do badly at all. Then he asks if she is okay, and she just looks at him, kind of seriously, and asks if he is worried about his beloved, and says that she will not make it sleep with those butterflies in his stomach. And the protagonist notices that she is making fun of him, and Leona asks if the two are dating, and he says no. But then the fairy asks if all that was a joke to him, and starts to wonder what the problem with these people is. So Leona asks his name. He says Sarenkros, so she thanks him for protecting her, saying that she will pay him properly in the future. But he says that he doesn't need to, since it was all part of his mission, so she finds this even weirder. And later that night it is said that the few that they managed to capture were sent to the army, and they were sent reinforcements in case of a second attack. He questions who those assassins were, since some of them were quite skilled, so they weren't there just to rob them, and he thinks that they have to assume that they were sent by the other heirs. And so Leona goes downstairs, noticing that the protagonist woke up very early. He says that this is his lathe, so she talks to the soldier, asking him to come with her, saying that he will give him the opportunity to join her personal forces, and she thinks that his company Rockford leaves a little to be desired, and his main partnerships include the Shepherds of the Savagery of the Lands of the Beast, and the Black Choir Guild, which is famous for hunting dragons, besides the Glacial Guardians, who are defenders of the permafrost. And she says that in addition, she has the Rockford map, which shows them the main routes and specialties of those areas, so she says that it is valuable enough to allow whoever sells it to live without any worries and with any privilege they want for the rest of their life. And she says that all of this is too much to leave with the idiot children of the previous owner. And she states that she needs to protect and expand this organization, and she needs people with talent for that, people with enough talent to save her from imminent death. Besides this personality that does not look for additional rewards, a position in her association is something that everyone wants, and he is probably no different. And she talks to him, saying that she will give him everything he wants, asking him to come with her and join her forces, but he says that he will have to refuse, and she notices that he did not even hesitate asking why. However, Jackson appears, saying that it is rude to keep asking after having been rejected, and the fairy also appears immediately, saying that she agrees, saying that it is very inappropriate. And so Leona says that they are right, saying that the other heirs of the association will arrive at noon, and she needs to prepare for that. While they go down, Jackson says that he managed to seduce a rich heiress too, saying that complicated women are probably his type, but he says no, so he says that he needs to stop going around seducing these women. But the protagonist says that he did nothing, and the elf, who does not change her poker face, thinks that he has a lover, saying that she is going to cry, and the protagonist can't take it anymore, apologizing, saying that he thinks she is not his type anymore. And so Jackson notices that he responded, and she is also surprised, and everyone outside asks if he heard that, because he just tried to seduce another woman while he was with the commander, saying that he is a bastard, and he starts to notice the shit he got himself into, and she ends up laughing at the situation. Yes, you are very screwed. You are very screwed, and I understand you completely. And so, some time later, Yahello comes talking to him, asking if he slept with the flight attendant after just one night, and everyone is gossiping that he managed to get a rich heiress now, noting that he is not only a spell breaker, but also a heartbreaker, and he has nothing to say, and asks Yahello if he went there to make fun too, but he says that in fact, he is about the Gylfi Guild. saying that he needs to be aware of things, and the protagonist thinks this is good, as he needs Zaito to do something for him too, saying that those who escaped, he needs to capture them and find out what they are plotting. And so it is talked about Reno's Rock Fried, the previous owner of the Merchant Association, and was an admirable man with a sharp mind for business, and he considered his adopted daughter Leona to be his successor due to her wit and intellect, but he could not simply leave his own son aside. So without a clear successor to lead the Merchant Association, he passed away, and so the assassin tells Leona's brother that unfortunately the assassination was a failure, and he should have left it to them as it was a missed opportunity. And Polid Rock Fried begins to get apprehensive, while the men say that they will find a way, asking if their agreement still stands, and Polid says that of course, saying that Jegian says that she will reward him greatly if she inherits everything. However, that second the man in the carriage doesn't seem to believe much in this, so when they finally arrive at that tavern, Jackson and the protagonist look at all of them, and he starts complaining about the dust, saying that it's typical of Leona to call him there, and the protagonist notices that the guy next to him is strong, and so they end up exchanging glances, and the guy just ignores him, while Polid yells at Jackson, telling him to call Leona, and so he thinks that he chose well to bring Jackson, because if he were the king things wouldn't end well, because he would take an axe to the boy's head and split it in two. And Jackson, in turn, doesn't seem to be the calmest person in the world either, almost taking his dagger out of his back, and Miss Protagonist quickly goes to hold that maniac's hand, while the fat man continues to tell Red to go get him, telling him to go quickly, but then Leona tells him to stop yelling, saying that it's rude on his part, so she says that he's the one who's late, but that disgusting kid doesn't take it very well, that saying that she should give some education to her bodyguards, but then Leona slaps him in the face, and the protagonist P starts talking about his violence, asking if no one he knows is normal, and Jackson feels that it is with him, so he asks if she is crazy, and she says that he is the crazy one there, saying that he is messing with the mercenary soldier from the border guard, asking if he wants to rot in prison for the rest of his life. Then he starts to lower the ball, saying that he did not know that, and the man behind him makes him get back on track by just coughing, and he completely changes his mindset, saying that it was not him, saying that she is trying to blame him. Besides that, he asks how dare she, like her family, yell at him, but she claims to know that she was adopted, but he can barely analyze the trade routes and can't even calculate the finances properly, and the useless No starts to sweat coldly, saying that this is a job for his servants, but he says that he wouldn't even be wasting his time like this if it weren't for the will, and saying that the successor would be chosen after a discussion would be too much. And so the protagonist notices that the previous owner must have been very kind, because no matter how you look at it, Leona seems to be the best choice to be the successor, and he wanted to give his son one last chance probably, and she says that the only argument he has to justify being the successor is that he is a blood relative. But then he asks what kind of reason would be more important than that, but she says that no matter how much she looks, that chubby guy doesn't look anything like him, and she talks about the ignorance of the horrible guy, asking who he got that from, and Leona is a little angrier than I thought. So the kid starts to curse her and prepares to pull out his sword, but Ingrid takes action. However, that guard who seems to be the badass is also prepared in case something happens, and so he just stops in front of Leona while everyone arms themselves, and in that the protagonist looks deep into Pepe's eyes. So he thinks that the posture of that man there indicates that he dares the art of the fluid sword, and he is asking how fast he will be, if he is questioning if he will be faster than the king's axe or faster than a whistling dagger. So he wants him to come so he can show his technique. While the man prepares to draw his sword, the protagonist goes happily smiling, wanting to face him, but then they ask him to stop it, with the border guards saying that they serve directly to the king, and he states that they will consider them traitors if they do not put away their swords immediately. And at that, Pepe calms down, and the protagonist realizes that there will be nothing he can do. But at that, Jackson looks at him, remembering what he had said, that no one he knows is normal. Then he sees the damn hypocrisy, saying that the protagonist is the weirdest one there. And at that, the crown guard says that the hired killers were foreigners, so they are taking over this case, and they confess that they were paid by a mercantile association. And he states with yawn that he certainly did not hire them because of that succession dispute, asking if he is right, and just by the kid's reaction you can already gather a lot of things. But his bodyguard, who is probably the kid's portable brain, asks if the confession mentioned anything about a specific merchant association, saying he doesn't think that's enough evidence for them to blame. And at that, Constantine Zeno comments that he talks a lot, asking if he really thinks the border guard is that stupid. But while they talk, Leona asks to make an offer, saying that they'll find more evidence to identify the real culprits, asking why he doesn't arrest the two of them until they find those responsible. But at that, insufferable Ricky says he didn't agree to that. But the protagonist finds something strange, asking if the victim is asking to be arrested. But Constantine Zeno says that everyone they arrested arrested was a small fry who didn't know anything, and they just kept repeating what their boss told them. But Leona says that there are still people to be questioned. There are some who fled the scene, and one of them may have been the boss with details. So, why don't they try to find them? Then Consine Zeno asks if even so they wouldn't be able to find out what is behind this, so she thinks that this would be a problem for the border guard, because in any case it would not be wise to continue discussing the subject of succession with the border guards, so they will return to their city, on the condition that everyone returns if they call them, but the protagonist thinks that they will not be protected if they leave the city, and the guards which of Lenathi won't be able to face the police ones, and he thinks that it's mainly that guy with the slasher, because she dies as soon as she leaves the protection of the border guards, and she knows it well, asking what she has in mind. Then Leona says that it's a commodity, and doesn't ask for anything without adequate compensation, saying that she give it to whoever catches those who escape, pulling out something that really catches Jackson's attention, and she says that it's the fourth work in the Carmen collection, and it's Carmen's style, a really beautiful dagger, and she tells them to go get it, and so Jackson talks to the protagonist, asking to leave this one with him. Then he notices that he's too motivated, but he wonders what that dagger is, and Pepide, seeing Carmen's stiletto, asks if she's going crazy, asking if she has any idea how much that thing is worth, and she says that the stiletto is hers, so she can do whatever she wants, and the protagonist questions if that thing is that amazing, and he says he was surprised that he doesn't know him, saying that it was made by the legendary weapons forger Carmen, and she was a slave, and Carmen worked as an assassin in search of revenge, and used 7 weapons that she herself created, and the fourth of them is the stiletto. Then says that there are people who would sacrifice other people's lives for that weapon, and Grey Dog and Tom Conquadra say that everyone present there was in the custody of the border guards, and no one leaves that in. Then Jackson tells him not to worry about the stiletto, because he sent Cray to get it, so soon they should know more about it. And Pepide thinks that this is crazy, while that guard keeps looking at the protagonist P. Then they cross glances, and he ends up turning around and leaving. And already at night, Pepide wonders what will happen if they end up reaching them, but then they say that they can't do anything against the border guard at the moment, and asks him to be patient, saying that if the two of them don't get there with a consensus on who will be the successor, then it is in the hands of the investors, and they say that they will take advantage of this moment. And he says that everything will be fine, because he has already sent a letter, saying that he would reward them if they chose him as successor, and if only half of them agree, he wins. But while they are talking, that guard looks outside, and sees the protagonist training there under the moonlight, and at that the Grey Dog goes to him, asking if he is still doing that boring training, and Torres asks if he doesn't think that this is a golden opportunity to rest a little, and he says that he would think so too, if his time were the same. But he says that time has a different value between those who are geniuses and those who are not, and the things that they learn in a week, he needs a month, or maybe a year, and says that's why he can't waste his time. But in reality, he thinks he doesn't want to waste it, saying that he's going to use each day to create a solid foundation for his future. And at that, one of the guys who are with Torres asks if he's weird or if they're lazy, and Torres doesn't quite understand, talking to Ingrid, telling him to relax about getting stronger, saying that he's already pretty strong in his opinion, and says that they only tied because he didn't expect anything from him, but questions about now, and so Hess starts to smile, and they go to fight, taking the wooden sword, with Ingrid stopping the sword near his neck. But Torres, if he had a real sword, he would have ripped off the protagonist's head, and they say that with this one, he won 7 times, and they are all happy. But the protagonist asks to go again, and then Torres asks if he doesn't get tired, saying that with this one it was already 11 times, and then the other asks to go in their place, so they say that. They also want to go, asking to be able to fight with the protagonist, and in that Peppy notices that something is happening down there, asking what the barbarians are doing late at night, and in that one of them manages to throw the protagonist with his back to the ground in one go, and so the guy with the rapier becomes more and more interested in what is happening down there, and the protagonist asks what was that, asking if he can do it again, and the guy says that he really is very crazy, while the guy with the rapier notes that his pride is not hurt when he loses, or rather, it is as if he were a child who has just found something new to play with. Other than that, blatant hostility, even though he knows he's much stronger than him, makes him really think that guy is someone unique. But even so, he thinks that Ingrid falls for the same trick at least 3 or 4 times, saying that he really has no talent fighting, but then over time, he ends up winning and doing the same thing, with everyone noticing that it's his first counterattack in 5 attacks, asking who's next, and so the fairy starts to complain about him, saying that he goes around conquering everyone, saying that he's an evil man, and with that speech Leona assumes that they are really dating, but she says they aren't, and she says it was a joke, but she says that they are married, making the situation even worse, and Leona is shocked by this, while the fairy says that they didn't have a ceremony, but she thinks they're going to have a child, so everything gets worse, while the protagonist hears that, saying that this is distracting him, and he really wants her to go back inside soon. But while this friendly chat is going on, the rapier guy arrives apologizing, asking if they would mind if he joined them. Then Ingrid points out that crazy guy. And Torres looks at that crazy guy's face asking what his deal is, and so he becomes more and more interested in Ingrid, saying that his talent is not something to be praised, and yet he has that desire to teach him, saying that he can't hold back anymore. But then one of Torres' guards says that he is not with them, telling him to sit still and be quiet, but the protagonist says no, saying that he was waiting for that, making the rapier guy smile. Meanwhile, Jax watches everything from above, noticing that that guy, even if he is only using a wooden stick, he is still dangerous, and thinks he better be prepared as he draws his dagger. And so, standing face to face with his opponent, Ingrid feels the tension that is running through his body, saying that it is as if he is in the war again, being face to face with him. And when he receives that thrust, he thinks he can clearly see the path using his zone, and says that he recognizes the path of his attack, thinking that there is a small feint mixed in, but he is aiming at his neck, and he needs to block his line and extend his, but then he doesn't even realize, because he ends up dead before he can see anything. And so he says that he read his attack well, but says that the protagonist is slow, and he thinks about the fluid sword, the one that is the fastest among all the others. Then he says that it is much faster than he imagined, and he thought he had become much stronger, but he didn't, and that thing in front of him is inconceivably far away and very frighteningly high. But he looks at his opponent and starts to laugh, asking to go one more time, and he says that his attitude is exceptional, and they continue like that. While everyone goes to sleep, they are still like that, and the uniform he watches him, while he thinks that anyone who has ever held a sword knows what it's like to encounter someone you can't defeat, and he keeps falling every time, and that opponent says that he showed him an unreachable distance between them. But he asks why he doesn't give up, and so the protagonist gets up once more, and Jackson thinks that Ingrid's reaction speed is too slow to be able to see and dodge everything, and that way he'll never overcome that wall. So he says that he needs to teach him something about his speed, and at that the opponent says that's fine, saying that they're going to sleep a little. But Ingrid is still talking about how incredible he is, saying that fluid sword art of his, he'll learn it one day, and so he just laughs at the protagonist, thinking that he's even more impressed with him, thinking that it's a shame, because if he had just a little more talent he'd be good. And so the next morning, Zoido arrives talking to Torres, saying that they captured the fugitive mercenaries, bringing them all beaten up, and the protagonist thinks he did a good job, while he says he just went to find some hidden people, and Leona says they are probably members of the protagonist's squad, thanking him, and Torres asks that guy who he hired, asking who the person is, and at that the Gordonho gets totally frustrated, and he says it was Aspen. Then they say it was a merchant from Aspen's association, and they wanted to expand into the conflict zones, saying that more than that, he doesn't know specifically, saying he swears, and he says he only received a letter and the money. Besides, he was promised more payment even after he completed it, so Pep had started to break, and Leona manages to understand that now it's up to the border guard. So Torres says that for some reason, she seems satisfied with that result, asking if she wasn't expecting that ugly bastard to be behind this, and she says that of course she was, enough to offer her precious stiletto as a reward, and he ends up understanding a side of her, saying that finishing off those guys is his job, and he talks to all of Rock and Freddy there, saying that they're free to go. As they continue, Jackson is already with the stylus in his hand. Then the protagonist tells him not to take that one out in public, and he manages to understand. And in that he questions if he is really that happy, because sometimes he seems like a child. But Zoyo next to him starts talking nonsense, asking him not to fall in love with Leona, and the protagonist says he won't, but Zoyo says she is scary. And so the protagonist asks if he is there listening. Then he questions if it isn't weird, because no matter how he sees it, those guys were hired by Plead, but he asks about Icepit, saying that he had a little problem when he met those guys, because another one arrived at the place, and he goes to talk directly to Kreis, calling him the head of the Giffen Guild. But they correct him by calling him Kreis from Squad for 144, and says that he is a servant of Leona, and Zoyo says that they already had some clues about where they were and knew everything about the Giffen Guild, and he says that they also wanted to pay the army to let those mercenaries go, and told them to do whatever they wanted, but Prota keeps wondering why, wondering if Leona will be at any disadvantage if they find out that Polid is behind all this. So Leona talks to him, saying that it is a relief to know that Polid was not behind all this, and says that he would have left a bad record about the exploits of the former leader, and he notes that it was all out of loyalty, while she thinks that he is not interested in that kind of thing. But he also questions if everything will be okay, since she will not be able to receive his protection outside the border, and if the politician decides to attack again, it will be shit. But she smiled quite maliciously, saying that she is already taking care of them, and so in front of them, a huge battalion is waiting, and then the man standing there says that he is the commander of the guards of the Rock Rock Fried Merchant Association Corporation, Mats, and wow. Man, I'm giving you a street, look at that. And he says that she is relieved to escort the new leader, Leona Rockfried, who was unanimously chosen to be the next leader by the interested parties. And so the entire platoon kneels in front of her, and the protagonist says that she stayed there on purpose for 2 days, and got the votes with the shareholders in the meantime, loyalty, decisive action, and information, saying that she is truly a scary woman. Then she turns to the anchorage, saying that asking again would be insulting, so she will not ask him to accompany her again. But in this she extends her hand to him, saying that he has the gift of making people root for him, and she hopes that they can help each other in the future as friends. And the protagonist this time is a little more friendly, taking her hand and agreeing with this. And in this Pepid asks what Mats is doing, asking if he does not know or co-fathered his father and went with him. Even so, he betrays him. But then he tells Pepid to stop dishonoring his name, calling him shit, and the kid really is that. So there's nothing to say, getting shocked. And those 2 missionaries notice that this was a failure, while the other says no, saying that they got something out of it, saying that now they know that the new leader of the Hawkford Empire is very smart. But he thinks to himself that there's also something more to the existence of that peculiar soldier, and remembering the night before, the harpy guy was talking to Ankred, warning him to put down his sword, saying that he admires his effort and strength, but he doesn't have the talent to face him, saying that it's painful and shameful to see that. So the protagonist thinks that no one has told him this for a long time, but he says they had never listened in the past and managed to get there anyway. Then he notices that the boy is laughing, and in that he simply turns to leave. Then a while later, the protagonist in his platoon talks to Rank, but he tells him not to say his name, saying that he will choose the wretched fox anyway. But in that he says that he wants to train and needs him. So Rank gets all silly, and if he really needs him, getting happy, then he thinks that what he needs to learn the art of the fluid sword first is decision making to find the most efficient line. Then while Rank attacks him, he starts to see the movement that Rank will probably do. Then he thinks that he needs an explosive movement that flows through his body efficiently. Then he manages to make a cut on Rank's neck. He is so scared by it that he almost doesn't believe it, and Rank also finds it super strange, while the protagonist thinks he is faster than Rank. He talks about repeated fundamentals, fluid flexibility, strength, and muscles, and all of this combined to create that effect. And Rank says that he surprised him, saying that he must have discovered how to swing his sword faster, getting much more excited, saying that he will also be faster. And the protagonist doesn't quite understand what he's talking about, but he feels it on his skin, receiving a huge beating from Rank, and with that he almost can't take the beating. Rank continues to attack him even more ferociously, and Angrid notices that his axe has always been fast, but it's even faster with Rank even more ferociously, and so they begin an even more electric duel, and in that he says that he still has a long way to go. And while he practices swinging his sword in the afternoon, he ends up hearing Jackson attacking him and manages to defend against his attack, and he thinks that both his eyes and ears are fine, saying that he doesn't need to train them anymore. So the protagonist asks what he's talking about, asking if he came there just to say that, and he says that for now yes. So he doesn't quite understand and thinks that's why Rank calls him a fox wretched. But when he lets his guard down, Jackson ends up managing to hurt him, but only mentally. And he says that that is the murderous intent, saying that it is what comes from a person who intends to kill another, and says that if he cannot predict the attack using his vision and hearing, he will have to detect that intent. And this ability allows him to detect something that surpasses the 5 senses, the 6th sense, and says that he will teach him this. And that will be his thanks for that stiletto. And with that, Ankrod notices that there is always more to learn, and I'm starting to notice how absurd this Jackson is, and so he says that he will begin, while noting that an endless amount of fun awaits him. And so Jackson says that his senses are based on his instincts, and he can't rely on his perception, and his perception uses his 5 senses, and he says that his sense of direction, his ability to move, the way predators hunt their prey, all of this is part of his instincts, and if he fights repeatedly with all of his instincts at maximum, he will be able to detect evil intentions as well. So he realizes that there is something on his side, but Jackson says that he won't be able to do it so easily at first, but if he keeps training, his 6th sense will surely awaken. And at night, Haim says that he looks a little different and asks him if it really is because he thinks he gained some muscles. But Haim says that it's not that. Then Odin says that he's smiling more than before, while Ragnar says that he doesn't think that's it either. And Zoryoto just opens his mouth and starts talking nonsense, says that he is even crazier than normal, and everyone there agrees, saying that is exactly it. And he says that he is the only normal one among those lunatics, saying that they must think so. But Jackson asks when he will realize that he is much crazier than all of them, and when they lie down to sleep, the panther goes to the protagonist's bed, and Haim asks if she is going to sleep again, asking if he smells like food or something, and she thinks that he pushed his body to the limit again, lying next to him, thinking that he trains until he almost dies every day. He would have died a long time ago if it weren't for his magic, and says that if this man ends up dying, she will never be able to break his curse. But then she notices something there next to him, seeing his clothes, and when she touches it, it seems that magic is imbued in it, and he says that it is as if he was repeating today, saying that he will train again and again, and you'll never get tired of it. And even during the night, Heim and Odin are with him while he does that training with the stone, and he thinks that knowing that it will make him stronger is already reward enough, and he continues training and meditating, even in the middle of the night, and ends up noticing Jackson as he passes by, and this continues to become more and more frequent, with him watching Jackson every time, and in this all the parts that are outside begin to notice something, and Heim tells him to forget what. He said that he seemed different, saying that he hasn't changed even a little bit, and Odin says that it's strange, saying that he really improved a lot in one day, and Ragnar says that he also felt that, and had thought he was a genius, but thinks he isn't. And so Jackson says that if he doesn't improve with all this training, it will go bad, and Heim says that it's nothing better than a real experience, but the asps have been very quiet for a while, and say that if he is summoned to hunt beast or something like that, he can improve. And with that, protagonist goes to look for something in the mission morale, and thinks that the four are pressuring him to have more real experiences, and it's as if they want him to test himself, and he says no, saying that even he knows that he's not improving at all. And while he's looking at the morale, someone talks to protagonist, saying that if he didn't find anything to his liking, he should do that for him, and he notices that that mission is to investigate a shoemaker's basement, and protagonist questions if a reconnaissance team shouldn't handle that, and Carolato says that one team won't be enough because according to the shoemaker, he thinks there's an undead creature in the basement, and with that the protagonist gets a little interested, saying that it's impossible for something like that to be in the city, saying that he must have heard a rat or something, saying that right now he needs more experience, so that would be bad. But then Carolato talks to the spellbreaker, saying that he must have already imagined it, but no one wants to accept that. And the shoemaker has a short temper, but he's a good man, so he says that his wife disappeared recently too, and he must be in a bad way, asking him to just take a quick look. So he says no, apologizing, saying that he won't accept that kind of request, but he ends up accepting, and when he gets there, a girl talks to him, telling him to go to the basement, saying that he's digging the floor. And the protagonist says he heard he had a short fuse, and when he gets there, he says that's it, showing a hole to the protagonist, saying that he dug the ground, and that was there. He notices that it's a tunnel in the middle of the city, and says that it couldn't have been a rat as they enter that tunnel. He says that it seems to have been made by someone and is quite big, and he thinks that there might even be monsters there. As he goes inside, he sees several forked tunnels, and thinks that there are 6 separate paths, and that there was made to be a maze. Then the man tells him to listen to that sound, that strange sound, saying that there really must be an undead down there. And the protagonist tells him to wait, tells him not to go out like that, saying that he's going ahead, asking him to stay back there. But when he touches the ground, a bright light happens, and he notices that it's heating up, and then a huge flame comes towards him, licking both him and that shoemaker. And he wakes up again in his bed, along with the panther who is sleeping as if it were really his wife, and he says that's how he realized it was heating up. He burned instantly, and he couldn't take a single step, saying that it was definitely magic, and he thinks about common sense while facing wizards. Meanwhile, Heim talks to him, saying that they were talking yesterday, saying that he thinks he needs more experience, but then the protagonist thinks that when facing a wizard, he should run away, because you'll be lucky if you die when facing a wizard in combat, and if you survive, your fate will be much worse. And this advice applies to the traps created by wizards. And he thinks about the magic trap, wondering what he can do against it, and what skill he can train to overcome it, while he continues thinking, looking at the missions. That same mission will stop him, and he thinks that he needs to be an expert in magic, or the support of a higher rank, and he says that it's not like the other walls that he could face head-on, thinking that Commander Fahad would listen to his request. And before that hot-headed man goes there alone, he thinks he should do something, but then he heads towards that house, arriving there, breaking down the door and scaring the girl, asking where her father is. She says he's in the basement, and he runs down there, but the old man had already thrown himself inside, so when he arrives, it's almost too late. While he asks the old man to stop, that flame licks him completely. With the protagonist together, he wakes up there with Crony again, thinking he needs to find a faster way, and he needs to turn him first and tell him to stay away, and Death thinks it may have been just for a moment, but he must have felt the pain of his flesh being melted and his entire body turning to ash, and still he asks if he plans to go in that direction of those flames, and the protagonist says that it was really like Crony said, and the pain was like millions of needles passing through his entire body in a single instant, but he says that it would hurt even more for him if he did nothing and watched an innocent man die, and that's how a knight acts. As he wakes up the next morning, he simply leaves and says that he's going to save an annoying old shoemaker. Then Ren questions if there's some monster with leather boots or something, and he goes straight to the shoemaker's house, saying that he can stop him from digging and make him ignore it, but he can't leave something so dangerous like that without doing anything. and he says he's going alone, asking the shoemaker not to follow him, but he says no, saying that this is his house. He can't let him go there alone, but the protagonist insists, and he ends up saying that it's okay. And he thinks about finding the magic expert, but he wonders how long that will take, also wondering if that person would even accept his request. So as he goes, he thinks that it's a mysterious trap that he has no information about, and someone is about to die while exploring it. He says that this applies even to him and his squad, and he needs to find out as much information as possible. So he thinks that one of those there must be clean, and the only way to find out is to just walk straight into them, and he thinks that using his return is the easiest way. But he thinks that there must be a better way to do this, a clue that he could use. But then he thinks that if he can find something that tells him where the trap is, that might make more sense. He wonders how many times he's died and what he felt with each attempt. And when he thought he had already lost, he wonders when was that? When he felt a blade piercing his throat, or when the opponent disarmed him of his sword, or also when he felt the murderous intent of his opponent. And so he remembers Jackson saying that it is something that wants nothing more than his death, and he remembers that murderous intent with the magic being activated in front of him, and with that he ends up realizing before that axe comes towards him, but dies anyway. And when he returns, he thinks he just felt it, and as he continues repeating it over and over again, he suffers more and more with several traps in the middle of the path, dying in all of them. So he thinks that he certainly felt the murderous intent of the traps. In detail that he says this while he is being cut in half. I certainly think that this crazy guy has already been to Bela and Nelson completely. His mind is all broken. Look at the clown's mind how it is. It's raining a lot here in Rio de Janeiro, so if there's any noise in the background, or if this video doesn't come out on Friday, it's because of the rain, and I'm probably still alive. And so once again, returning to that hole, he thinks that the wall of that day is to detect the murderous intent in the traps. And as he goes, he thinks that he just shouldn't go in, but he also feels inverted if he should go in and out until he can feel right. And so he goes on, saying that he hasn't gone that way yet, and there he doesn't feel anything, wondering if that's the right path. But as he takes a few steps, he gets lost, but thinks that's where the blades came from, and goes to the path of the blades once more, and he starts to think that he couldn't notice anything, and only remembered what was going to happen. And so the shoemaker asks why he's going back and forth, asking if he wants to get water off his knee, but the protagonist reminds him that he asked him to stay up there, and he claims that he hasn't gone that way before, and says that he'll keep going until he detects it. But as he continues like this, night falls, and so the shoemaker asks what he's doing up so late without eating, and he says that he'll come back tomorrow morning, asking him not to go down there, as there are traps everywhere. So the man asks him for help to take care of that, as he can barely sleep, afraid of losing his daughter, and the protagonist then questions if he doesn't have any clues that indicate what happened to his missing wife. He says that lately, a lot of people have disappeared, so they are not paying much attention to it, and says that if he sees a dark-haired woman with freckles wearing that wedding ring, he should let her know, and the protagonist says he will do so. So that night, sleeping with the panther, he begins to meditate until he thinks he has found Jackson, but ends up looking in the completely wrong direction, and he asks if he is like this just because he is going out with that man with leather boots, saying that he is worth giving up and going to sleep. And the protagonist says that's stopping to think. This is the first time he has finished a repeated OA without dying. He wonders what will happen if the day goes by like this, wondering if he will advance to tomorrow. But then he realizes that there is only one way to find out. However, during the night, Karen apparently acts, and the next morning, he says the same thing again from the other day, and he notices that he has returned to the previous day, wondering what will happen if he does not sleep. But the next morning, he ends up falling asleep and wakes up in bed. So he thinks that Blinkton appeared there, and he sees the entire script being played, and thinks that he probably can't get through that day without defeating the wall. But he thinks that he has no problems, because he has no intention of facing tomorrow without overcoming it in any way. And so 20 days pass, and he says that this is different from a simple fear, telling him to just feel the imminent death. And as he continues following that same path, 40 days pass and going to 50, 60, and more days, reaching 70. But then at a certain point, rotten hands start coming out of the ground grabbing the protagonist, but then he lets himself be taken, and some time later, he realizes that he has achieved something. And while Jackson tries to kill him, he manages to get out of the way, and seeing that he managed to dodge his murderous intention, Jackson is shocked that he managed to do it in such a short time. But it was 70 days in all, and he prepares himself once again, arming himself to the teeth and reconquering if he goes to Warren Zapatero's house. And he says he won't go back until he kills at least 10 boots, and Renho feels like he's joking, while the panther watches him. And the protagonist thinks there are 6 paths, and only one leads to an exit without traps, but he claims that that's what he thought, and he thinks that whoever made that tunnel is a real weirdo, and there are traps on all 6 paths, and to begin with, there was never a safe path, and all the paths, whether with hands, with the blade, with fire, and all the other evils that can kill him. He thinks it's going to be shit, but he notices that there's also a way, saying that he just needs to not step on the traps, and he thinks that on the first path, he'll end up being instantly charred if he steps wrong. So he starts trying to step on other places, being charred every time, but in this he manages to take some millimetrically calculated steps, and he takes steps one at a time, testing, dying, and taking other steps one after the other. And so he simply focuses and records the path he took, while he dies, starts again, dies, starts again, in search of awakening his 6th sense, and so he remembers all the steps he has already taken, and making his way to the end of those traps until that at the end of that path he finds the other room and thinks that once again he has overcome a wall. But in that, an undead goes after him. However, the protagonist manages to quickly decapitate it, just feeling the murderous intent, and he thanks that dead man, but several others come close to him, and he thinks that that is a great gift, and in that those undead continue going after the protagonist, and he thinks that Hongu's claws have a potent poison that can even cause very serious wounds, and he says that normally it takes several soldiers to face a single go. However, he is getting stronger and stronger, killing them easily, thinking that this has nothing to do with him now. And he goes after it, decapitating and killing everyone who was in his way. Then he starts to pant, and he thinks that after all that, he fought too well, and he starts to wish that his squad mates who were thinking it was bad had seen that. But in that, a dog, deer, a totally grotesque animal goes after the protagonist, and he thinks that it is not a demonic wolf, and is most likely mixed with other beasts, wondering what the hell it is, wondering if there are more of them out there. However, in the meantime, the panther is looking for the protagonist, and thinks that that guy was especially weird that day, wondering why he was so well armed, going to just a shoe store, and thinks that he, being as reckless as he is, if he dies, it would be a problem for her. So she thinks about that energy that is coming from inside, and notices that smell of a spell, so she prepares to go in there and get him. In the meantime, the protagonist is killing a bunch of monsters in that place. While he kills all those things, he thinks how weak he is. It seems like he will stop at any moment, but then he hears a noise and wonders if it is another evil creature or the one who dug that thing. But then he sees something totally bizarre with pieces of people hanging like they were freshly washed clothes, and looking at that grotesque scene everywhere. He says that he has been in the field of he's been fighting for a long time, so normal corpses don't make him feel disgusted, but that's definitely messing with it. But then he hears someone talking, saying that he just wants to be in peace, asking to be killed. But when the protagonist notices up there, he sees the shoemaker's ring in that person's hand, and he remembers the shoemaker's words that when he saw a woman with brown hair and also freckles carrying a ring like his in her hands, he should warn her. And with that, the protagonist gets very angry, and then a man appears saying that someone told him that there would be more healthy ingredients, and says he doesn't know how the protagonist got there, but says that this is perfect because with it, you will be able to create a friend for Bamillo, that thing that is behind him. And the protagonist asks if the corpses there were all killed by him, and he says yes, because if it wasn't him, who else would have done it? And he says that those hanging are just failures, saying that the one behind him, Bamillo, is a work of art, and he says that the protagonist is too, saying that he will convert him into something incredible. And the protagonist thinks he is a wizard, and remembers someone telling him to just run away, and I fights a wizard and dies, which is lucky, but if he survives, something horrible will happen to him. However, the protagonist doesn't care much about that. He grabs his sword with a lot of hatred in his heart, saying that even if it cost him tens of thousands of lives, he will kill him. So he pulls out his howling dagger and throws it at the wizard. However, he obviously uses magic to cover himself with a barrier. However, the protagonist finishes the job by getting close to him, trying to hit him, but ends up stopping at the barrier and is thrown away by the wizard. However, even with that, he doesn't fall. At that moment, the panther behind him ends up arriving and thinks that it was to be expected that it is a wizard. She thinks that even though the power she has accumulated is still weak, if she uses it all, someone like him will die. However, the wizard ends up casting a spell that hits the protagonist, bouncing off it. He almost gets hit head on and thinks that he can't see or hear it, but he can feel his killing moment. The wizard is surprised and says he dodged, and the protagonist goes for it, activating his zone, and the wizard starts aiming in several directions to be able to hit the protagonist. He remembers once asking his squad mates something about how to hit a wizard, and Ren says that he should shoot with everything first and kill him, and using this tactic, he almost gets hit. As for Jackson, he says that he should first kill him when he's not looking, and as for Odin, he says that he should get as close as possible. So he does all of this, and Ragnar says that if he's alive, if he cuts him, he'll definitely die, and with that, the wizard becomes more and more frightened seeing the protagonist get close to him with that gigantic killer hour. And the protagonist thinks about that invisible shield that surrounds the wizard, saying that if he can't break it with the dagger or the Avani, he says that he'll break it with force and cut with everything. But while the protagonist is in the air, the wizard uses a spell, sending it to him, cross, and that magic ends up coming out of the ground and aiming at the protagonist's chest. And both the panther and him don't have much to do, but she is calmer thinking that he will win, and that magic that she put on his armor reflects the magic of the wizard. And with that, his shield is broken, and the wizard can't even believe that he is using a magical barrier, and with that, the protagonist manages to cut him, dividing him in half. And that death was certainly not enough for what he did, but part of the anger that Angry was feeling at that moment was undone in that sword blow. My friends, this is Totalis Cinema. Unfortunately, we don't have any more chapters. I took this last one from Spanish. I hunted because I wanted to see the ending, and I brought it to you. Don't worry, I'll bring you the next part in 10 chapters. Don't worry, there will be a video tomorrow and the same on Sunday. See you there. I'm gone.